Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D and WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku Had Electric Power. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku was excited, for later that day his mother would be taking him to see a doctor to learn what his quirk was. Every kid in his class already had their quirks and Izuku just loved seeing them. His best friend Katsuki Bakugo could fire out an explosion from his nitroglycerin like sweat. Bakugo was already talking about how he was going to be a top hero. Izuku hoped he got a cool quirk like that so he could fight alongside his best friend. He was so excited. So for the past few days, Izuku had been trying to use his mother's telekinesis quirk and his father's flame breath quirk. Yet he didn't show signs of being able to use either of their quirks. Despite this, Izuku was still excited. He couldn't wait until he learned what quirk he had so he could begin training to become a hero. He was sitting in the last period of kindergarten class. His feet were swinging under his chair waiting for the bell to ring so he could dash to meet his mom out in the car. "All right, class," the teacher said, struggling to keep the kids' attention for the last few minutes of class, which was a common struggle on Fridays, even with high schoolers. "I know it's almost the weekend, but it is important that you pay attention until the bell rings. RIIINNNGGG." Izuku didn't have time to hear the teacher cursing the bell, as he jumped up, grabbed his stuff and ran out the door. He rushed down the hallway, heading straight for the forward door, ready to learn what his quirk was. As he rounded the last corner, he spotted his mom waiting for him past the front door. Once he reached the front door, he pushed it open and ran into her outstretched arms. "How's my little baby?" Inko said, cuddling her only son, her pride and joy and the most important thing to her in her life. Inko rubbed her son's hair, ruffling it up. "How is school?" "I'm good. I'm so excited to learn what my quirk is," Izuku said, jumping up and down as Inko walked him to the car. The entire ride Izuku was bouncing in his seat, yet Inko could only smile whenever she looked at him through the rearview mirror. She had done this since her only son had been trying to use a quirk and every time failed to do so. As Izuku's doctor's appointment got closer, she was increasing worry that Izuku might be quirkless. Eventually, they arrived at the doctor's office. After several tests and a blood draw, the two greenheads found themselves in a room waiting in a basic doctor's room. Izuku was reading a book, while Inko twirled her hair between her fingers. She had been to the doctor enough times to know that if a doctor was taking this longer, it could only mean bad news. Inko said a silent prayer to whatever god was listening that her son did for a quirk and it would be perfect to make him a hero. She had a friend in high school that had been quirkless, and with the discrimination her friend had, Inko won't wish that on her worst enemy. Izuku was a kind soul and Inko didn't want the world to destroy it. As Inko finished this silent prayer, a small knock came from the door. Inko released a breath she didn't know she had been holding. As she watched the door open, a short doctor walked in, carrying a weird device Inko thought she recognized from the engineering class her husband took. "Hello, Mrs. Sutaku. How have you been on this wonderful day?" the doctor asked in a calming voice as if he was able to deliver some bad news. "Anxious to say the least. My son, Izuku, has been so excited the past few days to learn what his quirk is. He's been trying to use my telekinesis and my husband's flame breath." Inko had become worried after seeing their Izuku didn't have either of their quirks. "I assume with not much luck," the doctor guessed, and Inko shook her head. He could see the worry on Inko's face. He had seen it on a lot of parents when their children didn't show obvious signs of having a quirk. "Well, Mrs. Sutaku, after looking at the test, it was clear that Izuku didn't inherit either your or your husband's quirk." "Is he quirkless?" Inko asked, her mind just forcing the question out. She needed to know. After not seeing either quirk demonstrated by her son, she had begun to fear the worst. "He is not. He does have a quirk, however, it is not heritage. It in itself is completely unique to him." The sentence caused Izuku to look up from his book. "Izuku, I want you to understand something. Our mind runs off static impulses. It's what allows our brains to send signals to different parts of our bodies." Izuku listened attentively to the doctor as he continued to explain. "However, too much of this static electricity can cause nerve damage. However, by running a blood test, we saw that not only is your body holding a high amount of static electricity, it is also producing it. Is that dangerous for him?" Inko asked. The doctor's words were folding upon themselves. She was getting confused. The doctor held out a hand, while he grabbed the strange device. "This is a multimeter, which is used to measure voltage, current, and resistance. It's been modified to handle high amounts produced by lightning quirk. Izuku, could you hold these two metal poles?" Izuku nodded as he reached forwards and grabbed the two metal prongs the doctor held out. After turning on the machine and checking a few things, the doctor turned the device to Inko and Izuku. "Normally a person's body cannot withstand 42 voltage with a current of 0.1 ampere for 2 seconds. That sounds low," Izuku said. He understood a bit about electricity from the paper his father wrote for his degree. It surprisingly is. That is why electricity is so dangerous. However, this device reads the Izuku body currently holds 105 volts with a current of 10 amperes. Yet at the same time, Izuku is as healthy as can be. To answer your earlier question, Izuku's quirk, which I've come to call static cell, appears to allow him to hold a large amount of electricity within his body. Will I be able to fire off the electricity? Izuku and Inko asked at the same time. Izuku imagined himself as a powerful hero, being able to take out multiple villains with a single attack. Inko was imagining all the potential fire hazards Izuku could cause. The doctor smirked as they asked their question at the same time. He pulled out his cell phone. Izuku, I would like you to concentrate on this cell phone and try to shoot a bolt of lighting. Izuku nodded and turned his full attention to the cell phone. His face narrowed to show the amount of focus he had. After a few seconds, nothing happened. While it is common for people with electricity-based quirks to be able to discharge it as lighting, it seems Izuku will not. However, when most electricity-based quirks form, they are only about to produce about 10 volts. It appears at the cost of being unable to discharge. Izuku's body is able to produce more electricity. The doctor placed the phone in Izuku's outstretched hand, so the wireless charging port was up. So unless you have a material that is superconductive, the static electricity in your body will never have a chance to leave your body. The doctor turned the phone over so the wireless charging port was touching Izuku's skin. However, if you can use a material such as this phone charger port, the electricity will slowly flow between your body and the material. Izuku looked at his hand and saw a small spark of green electricity jump occasionally between his hand and the phone. The phone screen lit up, showing that it was charging. Izuku stopped paying attention as Inko continued to ask the doctor questions about Izuku's mutant quirk. In the end, the doctor stated, "Your son is perfectly healthy and I see no change that needs to occur to keep him healthy." Inko thanked the doctor and Izuku handed back the doctor his phone. As the mother and child left, the doctor turned his phone back on and saw that unlike before, his phone had a full battery. The doctor laughed at the comedy provided by that thought. "So I still can be a hero," was the first thing Izuku said he got home. Inko had begun to worry about Izuku and him slipping into depression when he didn't say anything the entire car ride home. He was normally a talkative and chirpy kid, so his current attitude didn't look good. Inko frowned at Izuku's comment. While in itself was great, the tone Izuku used didn't sound hopeful. Inko knew she needed to help her son. "That's great, Izuku. You will be one of the great heroes in the world." Inko hugged her son. Izuku smiled a bit because of his mother's comment. "Yeah, I can be the world's greatest hero. That just means I'll have to work extra because of my quirk. Yeah, I can be a hero." Inko opened the front door to their apartment and allowed Izuku to walk in. "Hey Zuzu, can you go to your room? I need to talk with your father," Inko said, a smile on her face. Izuku smiled back and ran to his room. He was curious about what his parents were going to talk about, so he left the door open. "So whose did he get?" Izuku heard his father ask. He hadn't been able to go to the doctor's appointment due to work. He had just barely arrived home before his wife and son did. Neither. Izuku heard a few books hit the floor. Izuku couldn't tell whether it was out of anger or surprise. But he knew his father had knocked the books over. He's not quirkless. He has his own unique quirk. The doctor called it static cell. Izuku's body is able to produce a high amount of electricity. However, to balance it out, he can fire it off as lightning. So, he's basically a battery. Izuku heard his father laugh. It was a kind laugh that came out as if Izuku's father had heard a funny joke. It warmed Izuku's heart a bit. Inko said, tears coming to the edge of her eyes. "Hisashi, I'm serious." Inko had tears forming in her eyes. Izuku still wants to become a hero. But his quirk isn't like the others. I don't see how he could use it to fight or protect himself. What if he becomes a hero but can't control his quirk? He can seriously get hurt. Familiar with his wife's waterworks, even before they got married, Hisashi was ready. He stood up and wrapped his crying wife in a big hug and kissed her forehead. "Hey, Inko, it's going to be fine. I still have contact with some old friends of mine. I'm sure I can get their help with this issue. If my son wants to become a hero, then I'll find a solution. Izuku has a kind heart and wants to help people, so I'm going to make sure that I can help him become that kind of hero. I will create a way for our son to become a hero." Over the weekend, Izuku tried to experiment with his quirk. He tried complex things like turning on and off electronics from a distance to more simple things like recharging dead batteries. Yet nothing worked. But Izuku didn't get discouraged. He kept his hopes high. But then the weekend was over and he went back to school. As homeroom started, Izuku was called to the front of the classroom. He was asked to demonstrate his quirk. Though after a few moments, Izuku couldn't think of anything. Then he recalled how the doctor had shown how he was able to recharge a phone. Izuku turned and looked at his teacher and asked for her phone. She gave a confused thought, but withdrew her phone and handed it to Izuku. Izuku turned it on and saw it was low on power, perfect to show off his quirk. He held up the phone as if presenting it at an expo, then pressed his fingers into the back of the wireless charger. After a few seconds, the phone turned on, showing that it was charged. More than that, the phone was charging quickly and within a few seconds reached 100%. Izuku then quickly withdrew his phone from the back of the phone, then handed it back to his teacher. She looked over the phone and saw it was fully charged. "Oh, I must have forgotten to plug it in last night. So you can control electricity," Izuku's best friend Bakugo said. "Yeah, can you shoot out electricity?" a kid asked. Izuku shook his head. "The doctor states that I won't be able to naturally produce lightning, though my quirk is more powerful than most electric-based quirks." Bakugo laughed. "What's the point of having a powerful quirk if you can't use it? You're just a large battery then." The rest of the class began laughing along with Bakugo. "You have such a useless quirk. I would rather be quirkless, then you would have an excuse for being so useless. There is no way you can become a hero with a quirk you can't use." Izuku looked over the class as they began to laugh. Izuku thought about what the doctor had said. He was able to produce more electricity than most electric-based quirks ever could. Yet there was no way for him to discharge his quirk, so maybe Bakugo was right. If he couldn't use it, then he wouldn't be able to become a hero. Izuku let out a small sigh as his head and shoulders dropped. He somberly walked back to his desk and sat down. He put his arms on the desk and used them to cover the majority of his face as he looked up at the board. "Thank you for that demonstration of your quirk, Izuku," the teacher said, making no note of the harassment from the other kids. Izuku didn't pay attention to the rest of the class, just sat wallowing in his own self-pity. He sat alone at lunch, not listening to anyone talk about him. He only listened in class, not answering any of the questions. Once the bell had rung, Izuku quietly got his materials in his backpack, and then quickly walked out of the school. He said nothing as Inko drove him home and he headed directly for his room. He sat on his bed, his All Might blanket covering him. He was crying when a knock came on the door. "Are you feeling all right, Izuku?" his mom asked. "Why is my quirk so useless?" Izuku cried from under his blanket. Inko took in a sharp breath. It was clear his quirk demonstration hadn't ended on a good note. Inko slowly opened the door to see her son sitting on his bed with the blinds closed. It was a complete 180 from how he normally acted. School must have been really harsh. "Izuku, honey, your quirk is not useless. It's powerful and I'm sure that one day you'll achieve great things with it. Your quirk might not be as straightforward as others, but I'm sure you'll find a way to use it." Look at Whiplash. Inko knew he wasn't exactly the best hero to use for an example, but he was the first one she thought of. His quirk doesn't allow him to shoot out lightning, but he uses equipment to defeat villains. And it did little to cheer up Izuku, as he just covered himself more with his covers. Inko took a small shallow breath as she walked over to Izuku's bed and sat down next to her son. Then as she began rubbing circles on his back, she said, "I have faith in your Izuku. You'll find a way to become a great hero." Inko continued to try and comfort her son until it was time for her to start dinner. Dinner brought a small smile to Izuku, but after the table was cleared up, he quickly disappeared back into his room. Izuku sat on his bed, with his door cracked so he could hear his mother and father talk. "So I take it that his demonstration didn't do so well," Hisashi said as he cleared the plates from the table and took them over to the sink. He began rinsing them off until he noticed the downtrodden look on Inko's face. "Kids really don't have any filter. They are even worse than alcoholics," Inko said, and Hisashi chuckled. Inko threw a damp towel at her husband. "Hisashi, I'm being serious. Izuku has only had his quirk for a bit and he's always thinking it's useless." Hisashi walked over to his wife and hugged her from behind. "Come on. Izuku is a smart kid and he's always talking about how much he wants to become a hero. I'm sure he'll find a way and you and I will always be there to help him out. I had some calls back from some of my old colleagues. They all have promise and they love a good challenge. It doesn't matter how long or how hard it is. I will help our son become a hero." At that point, Izuku got up and walked over to his door. He closed it and then walked back to his bed. Izuku slipped back under the cover and soon was falling asleep, with the hope that tomorrow was going to be better. Unfortunately, the next day was not that good. From the moment Izuku stepped into school to the moment Izuku left for home, he was constantly made fun of for his quote-unquote useless quirk. And that's how the following week, then a month, then 2 months went by. The only light Izuku had in his day-to-day life was when Hisashi was home in time for dinner. After dinner was cleaned up, Hisashi would bring Izuku into the master room and show him what he and his colleague had been working on. Yet even that didn't last long. As the years came and went, Hisashi was making it home for dinner less and less, and at some point, Izuku couldn't remember when, but Hisashi began coming home less and less. It became more and more common that Hisashi would only call home and inform Inko and Izuku of any progress he had made. Izuku would hang on to every word his father said, but soon those phone calls stopped, only leaving Izuku to wonder what had happened to his father, and with Izuku's fragile mind he couldn't help but think what everyone was saying was true. He had a powerful but useless quirk, one that Izuku would never be able to become a hero with. Was that why his father had abandoned Izuku and Inko, with all he had done to help Izuku become a hero? Had Hisashi learned the truth that everyone seemed to know, Izuku could never become a hero. And it seemed Inko saw Hisashi's act as abandonment too, as eventually she took down all the photos of Hisashi and switched back to her maiden name. Izuku couldn't help but think that was all because of his quirk. If only he had been born with a quirk he was actually about to use. Over the coming years, hearing less from his father and hearing more from his classmates, Izuku began to become depressed. He barely talked in class and would only give quick responses when called on, mainly keeping to himself, writing in his journals for future hero analysis. At home it wasn't any better. He would board himself in his room. He always claimed he was working on homework, but with his intelligence, he easily finished any assignment he was given. Through all this, Izuku tried to hold out hope that one day Hisashi would come home, but the only clue he was still alive was that Inko received monthly checks to take care of the bills. Until one day the check stopped and Inko received the worst noise of her life. Izuku had gone off to school, and Inko had spent her time cleaning the house. She had just finished the living room when a knock came from the door. Inko flickered the towel over her shoulder, then headed over to the front door. Inko opened the door and found a slender woman dressed in a gray suit. She held a briefcase in her hands and had an empathic look on her face. The woman locked eyes with Inko and asked, "Are you Inko Sutaku?" "Midoriya. I no longer go by my ex-husband's name," Inko said as she looked the formally dressed woman up and down. "Ex-husband?" the woman questioned, and Inko nodded. The legal firm was not informed that there was a divorce. "Not officially, but after Hisashi left me and my son I went back to my maiden name." "You said you were from a legal firm," Inko said. Hisashi and Inko's names were still both on the title to the house, car, and everything else. As Inko had officially filed for divorce, everything was still under the name Sutaku. "Yes, Mrs. Midoriya. I regret to inform you that a week ago Hisashi Sutaku was found dead. In his will, he left everything to you," the woman said. Inko froze as the woman's words connected in her mind. Hisashi was dead. She didn't care for him as much as she had when they were first married, and she didn't think of him as her husband anymore. Yet to suddenly hear that Hisashi was dead. Inko stumbled back and nearly fainted. Inko caught herself and managed to walk back to the couch and fell into it. The woman walked in and laid her briefcase on the coffee table. She opened it and pulled out a thick binding folder, laying it down on the coffee table. "Mrs. Midoriya, Hisashi Sutaku had a lot to his name. He had many patents under his name and a large sum of money to his name." The woman then opened the folder and began to read. "Being of sound mind and body, I, Hisashi Midoriya, leave the following. To my wife, Inko Hisashi Midoriya, the sole owner to the title of the house of 2145W. Stop." Inko then repeated herself in a stronger voice. "Stop. I don't care for Hisashi Sutaku or his money. He abandoned our son and left me to raise me by myself. I don't care what my ex-husband left me or my son. I won't accept anything of his. So just leave." The woman didn't seem fazed by Inko's outburst. "I understand, Mrs. Midoriya. However, Mr. Sutaku left a clause in his will that nothing is to happen to his possession, except for being passed into your hands. He even set aside a storage unit to be purchased to hold his possessions until you were ready to accept it. I don't care for anything of his," Inko said. The woman closed her briefcase as she nodded and stood up. She then walked to the still open front door and grabbed a box from the front porch. Among everything in Hisashi's possession, this was the only box that he stated needed to be given to you, even if it was by force, the woman said as she carried the box in and placed it on the coffee table. "I said I don't want anything from my ex-husband," Inko said as she stood up and went for the box. Yet she was stopped as the woman grabbed Inko's arm. In his will, Hisashi wrote that this box needed to be protected at all cost from everyone. He specifically included you on that list of people. However, he wrote that he regretted having to add your name. So as welfare legal firm, if you are suspected to be any danger to this box, we are allowed to take legal actions against you. I can assure you do not want that to happen." Inko huffed and said, "Fine, I'll keep his damn box safe." Inko was just going to hide it in the back of her closet where she didn't have to see or think about it. The woman nodded and began making her way back to the front door. As she walked through it, she stopped and looked back at Inko. "You might not want your ex-husband's stuff, but it's there for you. Keep the folder. When you want it, sign the papers and bring it to welfare legal firm. Until then, Hisashi Sutaku's assets will be waiting to be claimed." With that, the woman left and Inko was left by herself to look at the will and the box. Inko didn't know how long she stayed looking at the items, but eventually, Inko grabbed the folder and the box and carried them to her closet. She rammed the closet door open and shoved the box and folder into the back, behind her old wedding dress that she hadn't sold yet. As Inko began to close the closet, her eyes fell on her wedding dress. She no longer fit in, having gained some weight from all the stress of having to raise Izuku by herself. Now that Hisashi was dead, maybe it was Inko to throw herself back into the single life. Inko refocused on her wedding dress and then slammed the closet door shut. She had been forced to raise Izuku by herself. She didn't need anyone else's help. "Mom, I'm home," called out an 11-year-old Izuku in a voice Inko barely held. It must have been a hard day at school again. "How was your day, sweetie?" Inko called out, yet she already knew the answer. "Fine, I'm going to work on homework," Izuku said. Inko listened as Izuku climbed the steps and entered his room. As the door closed, Inko let out a breath she didn't realize she had. She had tried to uphold the lying promise that Hisashi had made, to support Izuku's dream of becoming a hero. Yet as a caring mother, Inko didn't want to see Izuku in danger all the time. And with how sideways Izuku's quirk was, Inko had no idea of how to help her son. Inko had seen her once cheerful and optimistic kid turn into a depressed and forgotten kid. Izuku tried to hide it, but Inko could see it in his eyes. The light became dimmer and dimmer every day, and Inko feared that one day it would go out, and then what would become of her son? Would he become a wayless wonder, just making his way through life with no hope for the future? Inko had always wished she could find a way to help her son. In her heart, she prayed that a miracle would bring Izuku some joy, that he would become the Izuku she remembered him by. On the other side, Izuku was doing the same, barely holding onto a small bit of hope that a miracle would happen. As he had gotten closer to finishing elementary, he had decided to take one last shot to see what hope he had in becoming a hero. He had made an account on a hero question and answer forum, made for those heroes that didn't keep a lot of limelight. He had posted his question in the general forum, though he had been vague to hopefully catch the interest of some of the heroes. It worked, as Izuku was in direct communication with some heroes who had electric-based quirks. Most of them were able to discharge their quirk and found it weird that Izuku couldn't. Yet as they couldn't be much help for Izuku's direct question, he thanked them for their time and help. Then he focused more on the heroes who had to use equipment with their quirks. While he was happy to have the chance to talk with many types of heroes, all of their conversations ended with them stating that the work and effort that they had to put in to become heroes, most days that effort wasn't worth it. They all stated Izuku had better luck in going into a different profession, one where he could use his quirk differently. Izuku couldn't believe his luck. He wanted to be a hero, a true hero. One that wants to save those around, not for fame or glory or the money, but for the wanting of helping others, to make it so that everyone could live with a smile, just as All Might did. Yet here he was, stuck with a powerful quirk but unable to use it to achieve his dream. As Izuku pulled up the message with one of the last two heroes he still talked to, Inko looked at him through his nearly closed day. Inko's eyes got watery at seeing how much of a husk her son had become. She had been there for him, even when he forced her away. Yet what could she do? She did not know anything about engineering. She was even a few credits short of getting a degree in business. She had dropped out to marry Hisashi and have Izuku. Inko turned back to the box the woman from the welfare legal firm had forced her to keep. Maybe that could have some answers. Inko made her way back to her room and walked over to her closet. She opened the door, then reached into the back and quietly withdrew the box. She carried it over to the bed, then pulled off the lid. After silently putting the lid on the bed, Inko began to look through the box. The box was filled with some blueprints that Inko couldn't make heads or tails of, so she set them off to the side. Turning her attention back to the box, Inko spotted a large textbook on the bottom. The kind of textbook one would usually see a college student carrying about and making notes in it. Inko pulled the textbook out of the box and set it on the bed. The cover read, An Introduction to Mechanical Engineering. Vol 2. Inko recognized the textbook as it was the one Hisashi had accidentally dropped on her foot when they first bumped into each other at college. Inko chuckled as she remembered how she had swore her lungs out at him, and only stopped when Hisashi offered to take her out for dinner to make for it. The only reason Inko agreed was because his textbook hadn't put her foot into a cast. Now it seemed even years later, Hisashi still hadn't gotten rid of his lucky textbook, lucky as it had introduced him to her. Inko shook that memory from her focus as she opened the book and saw Hisashi Sutaka written in stylized text under the section to whom the book belonged. Moving past that, Inko thumbed through the textbook, recognizing some of the notes she had seen from whenever she helped Hisashi study late into the night. She didn't understand them then and even less now, only enough to make conversation with her ex-husband. As Inko continued to thumb through the book, she wondered if she should give it to Izuku. Hisashi had promised that he would try his best to help Izuku become a hero. Yet as Inko thought about it more and more, she realized how crushing that would be to Izuku. Not only to learn that his father was dead, but that even his brilliant mind and life's work, in the end, had amounted to nothing. That would just tell Izuku how impossible it would be for Izuku to become a hero. So Inko slid the textbook back into the box and put the lid on it, telling herself that Izuku would never see the textbook and it would never see the life of day again. Izuku didn't need to know how much his father had lied to him. Yet it seemed that fate had other plans. At age 13, Izuku had completely removed himself from the social aspect of life. He had no want of being in the spotlight. Not that he needed help in any way. Even though he was extremely smart and always had the best test scores, He was brought up to the front of the class to be given praise. Was it because the teacher saw he didn't want it? Or was it because they didn't think he deserved it? Not that it matters, Izuku didn't want it anyway. That just meant by the age of 13 Izuku was a loner in all senses of the word, even going so far as to stop talking to the heroes on the Kanda form. This just gave Izuku more free time to spend at the local beach. The beach might be filled with trash, but it brought Izuku some comfort to surround himself with stuff that was even more useless than him, showing he wasn't at rock bottom yet, but he was close. Izuku had walked to the beach with the intent of wasting another afternoon there. It wasn't like he had anything else better to do. Once Izuku arrived, he walked through the pile of trash that had been swept up by the ocean current and added to by people illegally dumping there. He walked on the sand until he reached his usual pile, which had a broken couch he would lay on. Izuku carefully climbed the pile of trash, already knowing by heart what pieces were loose and what items had good handles. Izuku climbed until he was halfway up and found his broken couch waiting for him. Izuku lowered himself onto the broken couch and looked over the afternoon, almost evening sun. With a sigh, Izuku came back to a thought he had every time he came to the beach. He couldn't believe how far downhill his life had gone. His father had left him. He was a social outcast. His mother looked worse and worse every day, and all because he had a useless quirk. He had tried to power through, worked to prove everyone wrong, even God above, but it seemed he wasn't strong enough to make his dreams come true. Damn it, where is it? A voice called down from the ground. Confused as to why anyone else would be at the beach, Izuku stood up and looked around for who was speaking. Yet he couldn't find anyone. Where is that battery? The voice came from Izuku's right, so he turned and looked around. Izuku's eyes fell on a mop of pink dreadlocks, then led to the body of a young girl. Izuku's throat locked up to not allow a scream escape, as he hid behind his couch. What was a girl doing at the trash dump? Izuku looked over at his coach and down at the girl. She had pink dreadlocks and was wearing a pair of blue overalls through the straps and around her waist, with a stained black undershirt. Come on, it has to be somewhere around here. I didn't build this baby for nothing, the girl said as she turned around and Izuku saw a device in her hand. The girl then suddenly looks up at the pile and Izuku hides behind his couch. Damn it, all this trash is messing with the sensors. I think it's in this direction. The girl turned around but then stopped. No, it's saying it behind me. The girl smacked the device a few times but eventually turned back around. She looked up and down the pile again, then kicked it. I don't see anything that looks like a battery. The girl kicked the pile again, and this time the sound of wood breaking occurred as her foot went clean through the backside of a dresser. Well, a hot shower is going to feel nice after all this. The girl withdrew her foot and began walking away, but then stopped when the sound of metal breaking echoed through the beach. Izuku then felt the trash pile begin to shift around his feet. He barely had a chance to curse his life before the trash pile collapsed under him. Izuku landed on a washing machine and dented the side of it, as the rest of the pile fell to the ground around him. Izuku moaned as he picked his head up and looked around, only for his eyes to land on the girl, who was now holding the device in her hands like a weapon. Who are you? The device in the girl's hand beeped and she looked down at it. She then looked back at Izuku, then back at her device, then back at Izuku, then back at her device, then back at Izuku. And what have you done with my battery? I don't know anything about your battery, Izuku said as he began rubbing the back of his head. He was going to have a bruise there in the morning. I built this baby to pick up on electrical waves, to find me sources to power my new baby. What have you done with my battery? The girl said, though she took a step back. Then she lunged forward and tackled Izuku to the ground. She began stretching him with her nails and beating him with her device. Izuku managed to wrestle the girl off of him and throw sand in her eyes. Izuku quickly got to his feet and took off to get away from the girl before she had another chance to attack. He ran up to the sidewalk and leapt over the guardrail. He briefly stopped to make sure the girl wasn't following him before running back to his house. Izuku ran down the sidewalks and through the neighborhood, not stopping until she got home. Once inside, Izuku locked the front door. You're home early, Inko called from the kitchen. Are you hungry for dinner? Izuku said nothing as he sat down on the couch, watching the forward door. Inko noticed and asked, are you waiting for someone? More like watching out for someone, Izuku said, not taking his eyes off the front door. Inko looked at her son, more than a little concerned for his mental health. Maybe she should give him the book and give him something to work forward to. Maybe he could take after her ex-husband, become an engineer and build something that helped him become a hero, similar to the promise her ex-husband made all those years ago. Inko shook her head. Izuku would just be reminded of all the lies Hisashi had told him. Well, dinner is ready. Maybe you should eat on time for once, Inko said, placing onigiri rice on the table. Izuku reluctantly walked over to the tables, trying his best to keep the front door in view. However, Inko had already sat down, leaving the only chair with its back to the front door. Izuku sighed as he sat down and grabbed some rice. His stomach growled as he ate dinner, his mind soon forgetting the crazy girl from the beach. However, fate enjoys pulling a sick joke on the Midoriya family. 3 hours later, Izuku was watching the TV, a conference talking about the hero's recent activity when a knock came from the door. Izuku lowered the volume on the TV, while his mother got up to answer the door. "Hello, Ms. Midoriya. Sorry to disturb you, but are you familiar with this girl?" a police officer asked at the door. Izuku leaned back a bit and saw that it was the girl from the beach, with the sensor still in hand, though her hands were cuffed. The girl noticed him, resulting in her jumping forwards and yelling, "He's got my battery. He's got my battery." After pulling the girl back, the police officer looked further into the apartment and met eyes with Izuku. "Son, can you come to the door for me?" the police officer asked. Izuku sighed as he walked to the front door, trying not to stare at the girl. "This girl here claims you stole a battery from her." Izuku shook his head. He still had no idea why the girl was even looking for a battery. Inko chuckled a bit. "Is that why you're here? I'm sorry if you waste your time." The police officer sighed a bit. "I came because we got a call from your neighbor that this girl was stalking around the apartment, more specifically yours. When asked, she claimed your son stole some kind of battery from her. I'm simply now trying to figure out what's going on." "Officer, I can assure you that my son has stolen nothing in his life," Inko stated. "I understand. However, this is a case of civil dispute, and it would greatly help if you were willing to come down to the station and clear the air. You may also press charges for trespassing." The officer threw a stern look at the girl. However, she didn't seem to notice it as she continued to glare at Izuku. "There's no need for that. We'll come down to the station and help any way we can," Inko said, bowing. It was clear the officer wasn't fully sure how to handle the situation. It's not often something like this happens. The officer bowed slightly, without taking his hand off the girl's shoulder. "Thank you, it will help with the paperwork greatly." Inko returned the bow. As she grabbed her purse and car keys, "Izuku, grab your shoes, it looks like we are going on a trip." After a quick ride to the police station, Izuku and Inko were led to a side room where chairs were waiting for them. The opposite wall of the chairs was a one-way window that led to an interrogation room. After a few minutes of waiting, the police officer dragged the pink-haired girl into the room. He walked her over to one of the chairs and then attached the cuffs around her wrist to a chain that was attached to the ground. "Wait here," the police officer said, then disappeared through the door. As Izuku and Inko went back to waiting, Inko turned to Izuku and asked, "Honey, did you steal anything from that girl?" Izuku looked up at his mother and shook his head, showing he was just as confused as to what the girl wanted from him. "She just suddenly appeared at the beach. I think she was looking for some kind of battery. She had some kind of device that pointed itself at me, and then she started to claim that I had stolen a battery from her. I'm surprised she followed me home, all over a non-existent battery." Izuku looked through the one-way window and watched as the girl began pulling stuff from her pockets. Izuku was surprised she had managed to smuggle that much stuff through processing. From everything on the table, the girl began to fiddle with the material, acting as if she was building something. Izuku wasn't sure until a toy helicopter took form. Then the girl pulled an AA battery and inserted it into the helicopter. The blades began to spin and the toy helicopter looked as if it was going to achieve lift, but then the battery must have died as the blades stopped rotating. The girl huffed as she grabbed the helicopter and pulled out the battery. Izuku thought that was the end of that, but then the girl began pulling out more and more batteries, testing each of them, but none of them had enough power to get the helicopter fully into the air. As the girl tested the batteries, Izuku was amazed that the girl had been able to build a seemingly fully functional toy helicopter from scrap. The other issue was it had no power. With that thought, Izuku looked down at his hands. The girl claimed she was looking for a battery. Was it to power the helicopter or to power something else better? Izuku was drawn out of his thoughts as he heard something hit metal. He looked and saw the girl's face planted on the table in front of her, seeming out of frustration of her toy helicopter not being able to work. That confirmed Izuku thought that she had been looking for a power source. Izuku thought of the device the girl had. She claimed it had been built to detect electrical waves. Had it locked onto his quirk and led her to him? Izuku chuckled to himself under his breath and mumbled, "She was looking for a battery and instead found me." A knock came from the door Izuku and Inko had entered through. Then the police officer from before walked in and asked, "Are you comfortable?" "We are, officer. I'm just not sure why you had to put that little girl in an interrogation room," Inko said. She didn't personally know the girl, but seeing the girl in that kind of room made Inko a little nervous. The girl was young and didn't know any better. Well, in the eyes of the law, she is a criminal. She was found stalking and trespassing on private property. So it was either this or a holding cell, and until we get the whole story it's going to stay like this. The officer seemed a little amused and confused at the situation he was in. He knew when his co-workers heard about this, they would laugh. He always seemed to be the one to get these kinds of cases. Officer, I think this is simply a matter of misunderstanding each other, Izuku said without taking his eyes off the girl. She came to the beach looking for a battery, which she would use to power that device she has. The officer looked at the device the girl had discarded and looked a bit panicked as she had it. How she had gotten all that through processing. Hold on, was that the scanner from processing? At the beach, she had a sensor, one that she claimed was built to look for batteries that still had power in them. Her sensor must have picked up on my quirk and directed her to me. She must have thought I got to it first and stolen it. Getting over his concern about what else the girl had broken apart for pieces, the officer looked over the group of discarded batteries on the ground. It would make sense the girl was looking for new batteries if all the ones she had were dead. But why not just go to the local store? The officer looked at Izuku and said, "That's a good working theory." Shoot, it was better than any he had come up with. The best being that the girl was mentally deranged and needed to be admitted to a psych ward. But the best way to figure it out is to talk to her. "Do you mind if I talk to her first?" Izuku asked, still not looking away from the girl. The officer rubbed the back of his head. It was usually protocol that the stalker was not allowed to see their target. Yet the girl didn't seem to be dangerous. It's unusual, but she doesn't seem too dangerous. The officer had no idea of what to say, but he knew he wasn't going to send Izuku in. However, Izuku had taken the officer's words as him giving Izuku the okay to go in. So Izuku stood up and walked over to the door that led directly to the interrogation room. He opened the door and walked in. Before Izuku had a chance to close the door, the girl looked over at Izuku and said, "Thief." The girl glared at Izuku, but he was used to getting death glares from Kaken, so hers did nothing to Izuku as he calmly closed the door. He then turned and walked to the table and sat across from the girl. He looked her in the eyes and said, "I am not a thief. My name is Izuku Midoriya." The girl instinctively introduced herself as Mei Hatsum. "If you're not a thief, then where is my battery? Where did you hide it?" "Funny thing, there was never a battery. Did you manage to sneak in that sensor of yours?" Izuku asked, as it would be useful in explaining his point. Hatsum nodded as she reached into her overall pockets and pulled out the sensor. Izuku could only imagine the officer's reaction to how Hatsum had managed to sneak that in. Izuku gestured for the sensor, so Hatsum put it on the table and slid it across. Izuku then grabbed the sensor and looked it over. There were several buttons and dials on it. Luckily, Izuku found one that was labeled power. The screen turned on and Izuku saw several options. Not wanting to mess with anything, he selected the option that said, "Continue the previous session." The screen flashed green and 2 beeps went off. Then after a few seconds, a black arrow appeared and spun around. Around 10 seconds, the arrow turned green and pointed itself directly at Izuku. Izuku then slid the sensor back to Hatsum to look at. She looked at the arrow and saw it was still directly pointed at Izuku. "You have my battery on you. Give it to me." Hatsum tried to lunge at Izuku again but was stopped as the chains attached to her cuffs stopped her. Hatsum lost her balance and nearly biffed her chin on the table. "I told you there was no battery. Your device things were picking up my quirks. It was reading the bioelectricity within my body." Izuku said. "Prove it." "Prove then my baby was reading your quirk." Hatsum said. Izuku said as he thought of a way to show off his quirk. His phone was completely charged and there was no specialized multimeter able to read his quirk. Izuku's attention then fell on the toy helicopter. He reached forwards and grabbed it. He then inserted his left pinky into the battery slot as far as it would go. The next second, the helicopter blades began to quickly pick up speed, making the motor hum loudly, until the blades were going too fast and broke away from the helicopter, making Izuku and Hatsum duck from the sudden flying knives. As Izuku sat back up, he saw that Hatsum had a massive grin and stars in her eyes. "You're perfect. With you, I won't have to worry about ever running out of power for my babies again. I never thought I would see that quirk that would be able to power my babies." Hatsum launched herself again at Izuku, but this time she looked to be grabbing him instead of trying to hit him. Izuku quickly stood up from his chair, knocking it over as he stepped back. The door that led to the side room flew open and the officer stopped in with Inko behind him. "Midoriya, I think that's enough. Hatsum, your parents are here to pick you up." The officer then walked over to Hatsum and unchained her cuffs. He then put a hand on her shoulder and directed her out of the room. Izuku and Inko walked them to the front room of the station. 2 people with similar characteristics to Hatsum were waiting in the lounge. The moment they spotted Hatsum, they stood up. "Mom, Dad, I finally found something powerful enough to power my babies," Hatsum said, hopping over to her parents. Her father was wearing a similar outfit to her but had fewer grease stains over his overalls. Mrs. Hatsum looked more presentable, with a simple pair of jeans and a dark blue short-sleeved shirt. She obviously recently washed her hair, as it was done up in a ponytail, while her husband's hair was full of dirt and hung loose around his neck. What is she referring to?" Inko asked, turning Hatsum's attention to her. Hearing Mei referring to something as babies was a little concerning for Inko. Mei was only Izuku's age, so she shouldn't have kids of her own. Oh, sorry, that's what our little ball of energy refers to her invention as. Sorry if she caused you any issue, Mrs. Hatsum asked, placing a hand on May's shoulder. It was a habit that May had picked up from her father before his wife made him break it. Inko took a deep breath as she felt her worry begin to disappear. She hadn't made plans to press charges, if anything, with May stalking Izuku. Inko might be able to use that to scare Izuku out of his solitary life. Everything is fine. It was just a simple matter of misunderstanding. In the end, no real harm was done. So what did you find, my little girl? Mr. Hatsum asked, wrestling a hug out of his daughter. May tried to wiggle out of it but failed. May admitted defeat and suddenly pointed at Izuku with only her right hand, leaving her left hand by her side, revealing that only her left hand was still in cuffs. With greed in her eyes and voice, May simply said, Hi, Izuku asked, giving a small wave. He didn't like being around new people and being the center of attention. So the two adults looking at him were quite unnerving, especially when they were the parents of his new stalker. Mr. H. Satsum looked over Izuku, then threw a confused glance at his daughter. What do you mean? His quirk, May said, though that cause made her parents even more confused, leading them both to look to Izuku for an explanation of what their daughter could possibly be talking about. My quirk, Static Cell, allows my blood cells to generate a high amount of bioelectricity, turning me into a living battery, Izuku said, reminding himself he needed to come up with a better way to explain his quirk. That explains that. My little ball of energy is always making new projects, big projects, and they all require a high amount of electricity to run. Store-bought batteries just don't cut it. So she found you and thought she had to do whatever she could to use you. Mr. Hatsum laughed at his comment, while Mrs. Hatsum and Inko blushed. How about dinner tomorrow on us, to make up for the trouble our daughter has caused you? Mrs. Hatsum offered, holding her hand out towards Inko. There's no need for that. As I said, no harm was done, Inko said, shaking her head. Then let's just say it's more to ease our consciousness, Mrs. Hatsum offered, but Inko shook her head again. Then how about a new friendship, despite its strange beginning? My daughter knows about your son and his quirk. She's going to be looking for him again and again. That made Inko chuckle a bit as she thought about the offer. In the end, she accepted it with a handshake. Then as Mr. Hatsum led his daughter out to the car, Mrs. Hatsum handled the paperwork and finalized dinner plans with Inko. When all was settled, the family parted ways until tomorrow evening. Inko and Izuku drove to a grocery store where they found the Hatsums waiting for them. Across the street was an expensive Japanese barbecue restaurant that Mr. Hatsum led the group to. Upon entering, they were immediately led to a table and given time to look over the menus. Inko looked over her menu and noticed how high the prices were. Inko expressed her worry about not wanting to take advantage of Hatsum's generosity, but Mr. Hatsum said she didn't need to worry. We can handle any kind of bill. You see, our family business is making support equipment for pro heroes. It allows us to live a small bit of luxury, but nothing too major, Mr. Hatsum explained, and Izuku's eyes went wide. What heroes do you make equipment for? Izuku asked as his eyes turned into stars. Mostly the local heroes, Airjet and his kind, or up-and-coming pro heroes that can't afford the bills from the more expensive support company, Mr. Hatsum said with a chuckle. As he continued to answer Izuku's question, Mrs. Hatsum leaned over to Inko and said, You've got a little fanboy there. It's been his dream to be a dream since he got his quirk. He looks up to them more than the other kids. But with his quirk, he can't discharge any of his electricity like others can, so becoming a hero became less and less likely to happen. He would need some powerful equipment to use his quirk properly. Just look at his phone. He had to modify it, and its battery can withstand being charged by his quirk, Inko explained. Izuku is into engineering, Mrs. Hatsum asked. Inko shocked her head. Not heavily. He likes to take things apart and put them back together, but others seriously pass that. When he worked on his phone, he had some help from a gentleman in our neighborhood who did work as an engineer for the city. Oh, still the kid has all that electricity and no way to use it, Mrs. Hatsum said, then seemed to get lost in thought for a few seconds. She then looked at Izuku and then back at Inko. Would you say Izuku still wants to become a hero? He hasn't talked about it for years, but yes, I think he wants more than nothing to become a hero, Inko said. Then how would he be up for receiving some help from a local hero support company? Mrs. Hatsum asked. What do you have in mind? Inko asked, noticing a cheeky smirk on Mrs. Hatsum. A similar smile that her ex-husband always got when he had an idea that could either make him millions or blow right up in his face. Inko smiled a bit at that, but quickly shook her mind away from her ex-husband and refocused on Mrs. Hatsum. I know our families might have gotten off on an awkward foot, and I know you think this dinner makes up for it. However, I have an idea. One I would like to run by your son and see what he thinks of it. If he could come by the shop after school on Monday, I believe we would have something that would excite him. Mrs. Hatsum had already pulled out a business card. She put it on the table and slid it in front of Inko before tapping it twice. Inko looked over the business as she thought over Mrs. Hatsum's offer. It read Hatsum Industries, helping those that help others. Inko couldn't deny they had met in a bizarre way. However, the Hatsums seemed like genuinely good people. If they thought they could help Izuku, Inko would accept it, more so if they could help her with her idea of helping her son. I'll ask Izuku about it and see what he thinks. Inko accepted the business card and Mrs. Hatsum nodded and made no other comment about the situation for the rest of the night. The group enjoyed the rest of their dinner, afterwards departing. Inko did bring up Mrs. Hatsum's offer for the entire drive. Inko didn't bring it up until Izuku was ready for bed and already over his cover. She then knocked on his door and said, "Hey Zuzu, can I talk to you for a few seconds?" Confused about what his mother wanted to talk about, Izuku walked over and opened the door. "Yeah, Mom. What do you want to talk about?" Izuku asked as he looked down at his mom. She had a thoughtful look on her face, one that she only had in passing and one she thought Izuku never noticed before. Inko walked into the room and sat down on Izuku's bed, gesturing for him to join her. Once Izuku sat down, she continued, "I know this past few years have been hard, with your father not being home and stopping with the phone calls, and I know you still want to be a hero." Izuku was about to say something, but Inko stopped him. "We don't talk about your dream much anymore, but I know you still have. And I'm sorry that I haven't been able to help in any way, but..." Inko took a deep breath. "But during dinner, Mrs. Hatsum gave me an offer. She said that their company might have something that could help you with your quirk, something that could help you become a hero." Inko pulled the business card from her pocket and held it out to Izuku. Izuku took the card and looked it over. He hadn't fully given up on his dream of becoming a hero, but he came to terms that he never could. The Hatsums seemed like nice people, maybe a little weird, but they helped new pro heroes. So if they thought they could help Izuku, he should take the offer. But what if in the end, they couldn't help? That would just reaffirm just how impossible it was for Izuku to become a hero. Would he lose the last bit of hope he had? Was it worth taking that chance? Then again, if anyone could help Izuku, it seemed that the Hatsum were the best option. They helped all different kinds of heroes and would be best suited for helping Izuku. Izuku recalled something his father used to say: "It's better to try and live with the experience than always question what could have happened." With that thought, Izuku nodded his head. He would ask the Hatsum for help, and if in the end they couldn't, Izuku would just work twice as hard to keep his hopes up, that he would eventually find a way to become a hero. He would keep his dream until lock and key, knowing he would never be able to live with himself if he stopped trying. Izuku focused back on the business card before taking a deep breath and saying, "It can't hurt to see what they have." Inko nodded and stood up from the bed, showing the first genuine smile she had towards her son in years. Being about to hear the optimistic kid was still in him. He was still hoping out hope that he could be the best he could be. Inko took the business card and said, "I'll give them a call in the morning." Monday could not have gone any faster. From the moment Izuku woke up, he was counting the seconds until school was out. He had a small smile as he headed downstairs for breakfast, something that Inko didn't point out but was more than happy to see. Once breakfast was over, Izuku headed to school with a small hop in his step. He was more attentive in class than he had ever been, something that pissed Bakugo off to no end. But Izuku was so happy that even when Bakugo tried to get to him during lunch, Izuku never truly lost his smile, it just became more hidden. As soon as the final bell rang, Izuku quickly shoved all his stuff into his backpack. And he was out the door as he heard Bakugo yell, "Deku, get the F432K back here." Izuku had no plan of stopping as his walk increased into a slow jog. He had had a good weekend for once and possibly an even better evening coming up. He wasn't going to give Bakugo a chance to ruin that for him. To make sure that didn't happen, Izuku picked up the pace and was soon out in front of the school. He quickly spotted the family car and ran over to it. He slipped in the front side and Inko chuckled and asked, "Did you have a good day?" "Yes," Izuku said with a nod. Finally, the waiting he had been doing all day was nearly at an end. He was finally able to see if he would be able to become a hero. Inko nodded and drove away from the school, following the directions on her phone. Inko drove the car to the downtown part of Musutafu until she was directed into a parking lot. After finding a spot to park, the mother and son got out of the car and went to the building. There was a large sign on the side of the building that spelled Hatsumi Industries with a LED glow behind it. Before fully closing her door, Inko reached in and grabbed a textbook from under her seat. No matter how the day went, Inko knew she needed to give the textbook to Izuku. They walked across the parking lot and headed inside. The front lobby was small with only 2 couches and 4 chairs and a mounted waterfall off to the side. At the end of the lobby, a large desk with a red-haired woman sitting behind it. Inko and Izuku walked up to the desk and the woman asked, "Did you have an appointment?" I believe the name would be under Midoriya." They said to arrive whenever possible, Izuku said, unsure of what to say as no real plan had been made. So she was unsure if an official appointment had been made. The special guests. If you could take the elevator to floor 6, you'll find Mr. and Mrs. Hatsumi waiting for you, the receptionist said, gesturing to the elevator that was to her right. Inko and Izuku thanked the woman and then walked over to the elevator. After calling it down and riding it up to floor 6, the elevator dinged and the doors opened. Upon fully opening, Mr. Hatsum was revealed to be working with a pro hero while Mrs. Hatsum was standing off to the side by a table with a tablet in hand. As Inko and Izuku walked out of the elevator, Mr. Hatsumi noticed them and said, the Midoriya. Glad you could come. The hero scoffed and Mr. Hatsum turned his attention back to him. I'm sorry, Crimson Dynamo. We weren't expecting them so soon. Traffic must have been light. Crimson Dynamo huffed and looked at Izuku. He's your special guest. Crimson Dynamo was a tall and muscular man. As he stood up, he was easily comparable to All Might, but not as big. So to him, Izuku looked like a little twig that would snap under his foot. More like our daughters, Mrs. Hatsumi stated, writing something on the tablet, and then turning it off. She looked a little flustered but quickly hid that with a smile as she put the tablet on the table. Whatever, just make sure you fix my equipment as soon as possible. Crimson Dynamo stood up and walked to the elevator. He had to lean a bit to fit, then quickly closed the doors. The mother and son looked back at Hatsum's. He has a rough personality, but he's a good man at heart. Mr. Hatsumi waved off their concerned looks, got into a fight with some thugs, and they managed to bust some of his armor. Mr. Hatsum then dropped the piece of armor in his hand onto the table. More important is helping you out, young Midoriya. Mr. Hatsumi pulled out his own tablet and turned it on. I used some connections to get a hold of your quirk file. Perks of being in the hero business. Mr. Hatsum cleared his throat and then began reading Izuku's files. Izuku Midoriya, quirk, hyperstatic cell. His body processes the ability to generate a high amount of static bioelectricity. When first tested, his body was able to produce 105 volts of pure electricity. However, after further testing, it was found that he was unable to discharge, unlike many other electricity-based quirks. Like other electricity-based quirks, this number is expected to rise. However, as his primary reading was higher than the average, doctors were unable to predict how much Izuku's quirk would grow. Even mentioned that it would be hard to get a proper read as Izuku Midoriya's quirk does not work with standard equipment. The rest goes more into the depths of the science of how your body generates its bioelectricity, but we won't worry about that. We'll worry about the last line. The file stated devices struggle to withdraw the electricity from your body, as my mother told my wife that you have to modify your phone to siphon off your quirk. Izuku nodded, and Mr. Hatsum smiled. I think we have a workaround. You see, a problem with early technology was that there was no way to limit how voltage went in. If you put a 5-volt light bulb into a 10-volt socket, you're going to overload the bulb and cause it to break. Your quirk has a safety feature similar to those lines of thinking. It can sense that if it pushed too hard, it would break the bulb out. So a solution is to use a piece of equipment that can handle your quirks of electricity, while also being able to dampen its output so as not to overload other equipment. Mr. Hatsumi crouched out and grabbed a briefcase that was leaning against the table. He set it on the table and opened it. He pulled out a device that looked like a high-tech hockey puck, just bigger, and set it on the table. Izuku looked the device over and saw that it was silver and one of the flat faces was glass. This is a device my wife and I created to help lightning-based quirk users. However, with the palladium core we used, the thing was so powerful that it was too efficient. Imagine that. The cost was not worth it, so we mass-produced a weaker version of it that all worked just fine. But with the amount of bioelectricity you theorized to be able to produce, the palladium core might actually work. I believe this is the solution to your problem, young Midoriya. Mr. Hatsumi walked over and handed the device to Izuku. Sorry to say, but this particular device connects to your chest. You'll have to be shirtless for this bit. Izuku looked at the device, wondering whether it was worth it to go shirtless. Not letting his mind overthink it, he slipped off his shirt and held the device against his chest. The metal was cold against his chest. Luckily, it quickly warmed up as it adhered to his bare chest. The arc reactor flickered for a bit, then gave off a steady blue light as Izuku felt his quirk starting to siphon into the device. Moving past that feeling, Izuku looked down and saw he was as scrawny as ever. He barely had any kind of muscle on his body, causing him to feel a little self-conscious now about being shirtless. The elevator dinged, and a few seconds later Mei Hatsumi walked in. Hey Dad, hey Mom. This Pot said Midoriya and his mom were here. Mei Hatsumi's eyes flew on Izuku, more specifically the device on his chest. You already gave him the arc reactor. I want to be the one to give it to him. Sorry, baby girl, you were too slow to get home, but we're just about to test it out, Mrs. Hatsumi said. She pulled out a device, which Izuku recognized as a multimeter, a heavily modified multimeter. She walked over and attached the 2 clips to the base and top of the arc reactor. She turned on the device and said, "Just breathe normally, relax and let your quirk flow." Izuku nodded as he took a deep breath and relaxed the best he could. Mrs. Hatsum tapped a few buttons and then waited for it to get a reading. Once the reading appeared, she let out a small squeak. She quickly pressed a few buttons and got the same reading. This caused her to slowly turn the device to her father and let him look at the screen. Mr. Hatsumi walked over and took the device. He tapped the screen a few times, but something was causing him to be confused. "Young Midoriya, when you first got your quirk, you were able to produce 105 volts, though the doctors said it might be higher since your quirk didn't work with standard equipment, right?" Yes, Izuku recalled his first test. "Well, this is reading 300 million volts. That's nearly 3 gigajoules. That could easily power something big for 15 minutes, Mr. Hatsumi said, showing Izuku the device. There was a lot of information that Izuku didn't understand, but his eyes were drawn to the reading of 300 million volts. "Guess it's a good thing you can't accidentally discharge. You could easily kill a bunch of people." Mrs. Hatsumi quickly smacks her husband on the back of the head. "Don't scare the kid. Can I have him finally try some of my babies?" May asked, grabbing a briefcase off the table. She ran over and began to open it, without even much as an answer. Izuku looked down and saw that she was pulling out some kind of boot. "Only if young Midoriya is up for it?" Mrs. Hatsumi asked. She was the only social one of the trio and could understand Izuku's hesitation. They had just met and really didn't know each other. Izuku nodded. Over the weekend he had researched some of the heroes Mr. Hatsumi had listed during dinner. Seeing the different equipment those heroes used made Izuku curious about what the family had made. And if he was the only one that could power them, he would happily help them. It could be his first step towards becoming a hero. They dragged Izuku over to the side of the room and began having him try out the different inventions, using the arc reactor to power different devices. Also gave Mrs. Hatsumi the chance to get some data on how Izuku's quirk reacted to the arc reactor. While that went on, the 3 parents sat down. Inko had a large textbook on her lap and Mr. Hatsumi noticed, "Where did you get that?" "It's from my ex-husband. He went to college for mechanical engineering. I thought about having Izuku go that career path because he would have a chance to find a way to use his quirk. But it appears you solved that issue," Inko said as she put the textbook on the table. "Ex-husband?" Mr. Hatsumi asked, dodging a punch from his wife. "We divorced when Izuku was 6. He died a few years later, but Izuku still thinks he is working overseas. We're going to be running out of savings soon and I'll start looking for a job. This textbook and a box full of blueprints are the only things I have left right now," Inko said, looking down at the textbook and thinking of the box that was still hidden in her closet. Her thoughts then drifted to the will, but she still refused to sign that, believing she didn't need help from her ex-husband. Yet maybe she should have a look at the will and see what exactly Hasashi had left her. Well, young Midoriya could still go into mechanical engineering. We would be willing to teach him. He'll probably spend some time here, dragged here by our daughter, and we'll be happy to teach him. It will give him a chance to learn more about his quirk," Mrs. Hatsumi offered, looking at the starry-eye look on Izuku's face as he was slightly lifted off the ground. Inko looked over at her son, as he seemed to be hovering with some kind of boots and failing to keep his balance. "I think he would appreciate that very much. I would give him something to look towards." Mr. and Mrs. Hatsumi bowed slightly. Over the coming weeks, Izuku came over to Hatsum Industries after school and would help May test whatever new and improved invention she had. Then during the weekends, he was taught engineering by Mrs. and Mr. Hatsum. It was slow at the beginning, but then knowledge seemed to take hold and Izuku was quickly moving through the textbooks. He was quickly catching up to May's level of engineering, making it seem he had been studying since a young age. As Izuku's proficiency grew, the Hatsums would throw him a bone in the form of designing a new piece of equipment for a pro hero or repairing damaged equipment. As Izuku became more and more comfortable and confident in working on hero equipment, Mr. Hatsum purposely offered Izuku a job and made him a part-time employee of Hatsum Industries. Izuku was slow to accept the offer, though after being encouraged by Inko, he accepted the job. Inko encouraged Izuku to accept the job, as their savings were starting to show empty, and while Inko had submitted resumes to different jobs, she had only gotten a few calls back. Through all he had learned in getting a new job, Izuku's dream of becoming a hero just grew and grew. To better prepare for becoming a hero and to help work on invention, Izuku began to train. Not in any form of combat, but he bought himself a pair of weights and began running into the evening. When Izuku hit 12, he worked on the courage to ask the hero who came for repairs if they would spar with him. It took a bit, but as soon as the first hero agreed to it, Izuku was sparring against pro heroes right and left. In the beginning, Izuku spent most of his time on the mat, but slowly he started to gain some skill and he got tips from the hero on what to practice to become better. He mainly trained with Crimson Dynamo, Whiplash, and Captain Japan, as they were three that were always coming in for repairs. But he trained with any hero he could, especially when a special guest arrived. It was on a Friday evening. Izuku and Mei were in the room where heroes came to bring in their damaged equipment. They were working on their homework when the elevator dinged. Without looking up, Izuku said in autopilot, "Welcome to Hatsum Industries. If you would fill out the form on the counter, your hero name, the type of equipment that needs to be repaired, and if this is your first thing coming to Hatsum Industries, please also provide your usual support company." The sound of dense metal landing on the counter made Izuku look up. His eyes went wide as he recognized the pro hero. "What the hell are two middle schoolers doing here?" Mirko said as she looked Izuku in the eyes. "Sorry, Mirko," Izuku said as he stood up. He looked down at the equipment that had been placed on the counter. It was Mirko's boot, and they looked like they had been blown to pieces, which should have been impossible as they were made out of dense titanium. "I ask, what are two middle schoolers doing here?" Mirko asked. She had been recommended to Hatsum Industries as the local go-to place to get her boots fixed, as they worked faster and were reliable for a good price. But if they had middle schoolers, "This is Mei Hatsum. Her parents own the business, and I'm here doing a bit of an internship to get prepared for going to UA," Izuku said. Mirko looked Izuku up and down, then grinned. "A little runt like you think they can get into UA." Before Izuku could say anything, Mei scoffed and said, "He's held his own against a few pro heroes, Crimson Dynamo and Whiplash to name a few. Sorry kiddos, but there is a difference between pro heroes like those meatheads and me," Mirko said, as she crossed her arms and began tapping her foot. Mei looked up and Izuku shrugged his shoulders. Mirko is working her way to being in the top 20. That made Mirko smile. Izuku smiled back and then went back to the equipment. "So Ms. Mirko, what caused your equipment to get to this state?" "Was chasing out a villain with a speed quirk. He kept throwing stuff at me and wore my boots down. He managed to get away, but I'm going to track him down. I want to be at my best when I find him," Mirko said. "Well, with that, we'll mark your equipment down as top priority. With how damaged your equipment is, we'll see what we can recover and what we can repair. But from the look of it, your support company will have to build you a whole new set." "I don't have a support company," Mirko said. Izuku tilted his head to show his confusion. "Oh, every pro hero has a company that built their equipment. Then may I ask where you originally got these?" "Costume order. From what company gives me the best deals? Right now you are the most convinced, and others said you would give me a good price," Mirko said. "Well, that makes things easier and more complicated," Izuku said, trying to pick up one of the boots and having a look at them. Yet the boot was so heavy, Izuku couldn't understand how Mirko could fight in them. "Do you perhaps have the blueprint on you?" "On my laptop back at my apartment," Mirko said. "If you could send those in, we could have your equipment ready to go by Sunday," Izuku said, then pulled out a business from his wallet. "Just email the file to the email on the card and we'll begin working away on them." Mirko took the card and looked it over. "Fine." She then turned and walked back to the elevator. As soon as the door closed behind Mirko, Izuku collapsed into his chair. Keeping his cool around a top 30 pro hero took more out of Izuku than he thought. Mei looked over at Izuku and said, "You're not getting any sleep tonight, are you?" "Depends on when Mirko sends the files," Izuku said. With that, he went back to his homework and Mei joined him. They continued to work on their homework until it was time to head home. Yet before leaving, Izuku checked his work email and saw that Mirko had sent the files less than an hour after leaving Hatsum Industries. Mei looked over Izuku's shoulders as he opened the blueprints. They both began to analyze the blueprints to show what could be improved. Mei then walked over to the clock and clocked off, while Izuku closed his laptop and promptly turned and walked back to the elevator. Mei just shook her head as Izuku was not going to get paid for overtime. Not that he cared. No matter how often Izuku had a chance to work on a hero's equipment, he was also starstruck, meaning he was going to spend the night at Hatsum Industries working on Mirko equipment, and he did so all of Saturday. Evening, Izuku sent Mirko an email that her equipment was readying to be picked up Sunday morning. Sunday morning, Mirko woke up in her temporary apartment and quickly changed into her hero costume. She then angrily packed all of her stuff as she hadn't been able to find that villain that broke her equipment, and she was being called to a different city to help with a problem. She then dropped off all of her suitcases at the train station and then made her way to Hatsum Industries, where she was directed to the 6th floor. Upon arriving on the 6th floor, Mirko was greeted with an empty white room, save for a gray table with a metal chest on it and Izuku working a punching bag not too far away from the table. He was wearing a white sleeveless shirt and a pair of black Zuko pants. Mirko watched Izuku work on the punching bag as she walked up to him, noticing he had some tone to his arm, something she hadn't noticed under Izuku's baggy jacket. When Mirko was only a few feet away, she cleared her throat. That caught Izuku's attention, so he grabbed the bag with his gloved hands, stopping it. Then he pulled out his headphones, letting them hang around his neck by the cord that connected them. He then turned around and noticed Mirko. "Oh, Mirko." Izuku seemed to squeak, but then he cleared his throat. "Sorry I wasn't accepting you so soon. It's 9:38, Mirko said. Izuku tilted his head as he pulled out his phone and saw it was 9:38. Oh, guess I lost track of time. Your equipment is in the chest, Izuku said as he gestured to the chest. He and Mirko walked over to the chest, where Izuku grabbed a small towel and a water bottle. Thanks for sending in the blueprints, it helped speed up the process. Izuku then gestured to Mirko to open the metal chest. Mirko undid the 2 latches and then pulled open the lid. Inside, laying a purple pillow, were Mirko's new boots. What's with the showmanship? Mr. and Mrs. Hatsum started that, with the belief that each new piece of equipment deserves a show of respect. I do it because it's tradition, Izuku said as he whipped his brow with the towel and downed some water. Try them on. Mirko pulled out her new boots and slipped them onto her feet. She immediately noticed some changes. You changed them. Izuku flinched and said, sorry, I noticed that your boots were more designed for function rather than comfort, which I don't understand since you're running around in them all day. I'm close to calling it torture what your old boots did to your feet, so I reworked them a bit to provide some more comfort. Izuku then took a breath to stop himself. Mirko hopped up and down in place, and every time she landed she noticed her feet weren't feeling as much impact. Nice. I also added some bracers inside. Not only to add some extra power but to help redistribute any force your boots get from blocking attacks, Izuku said, then turned and gestured to his punching bag. Would you like to give them a try? Mirko nodded. Everything seemed fine, but she wasn't going to go into battle with equipment she didn't trust. She walked over to the punching bag and kicked it. She barely felt anything despite the fact she knew she had put some power behind that kick. Mirko then winded up her strongest kick and launched it at the punching bag. The chain holding the bag up immediately broke and the bag was sent flying, while Mirko only felt some of the impact. Great, now I have to pay for a new one. Izuku grumbled but then put on a smile. So what do you think? Damn runt. Now I understand why the heroes I talk to won't stop singing your praise. They won't shut up about how well Hatsum Industries did support equipment, Mirko said as she began hopping up and down again. The boot felt perfect. Thanks, Izuku said as he began to rub the back of his neck. You said you want to get into UA support department, I assume, Mirko said. Hero course actually. I'm here at Hatsum Industries to gain the skills to build the equipment that is going to help me get in, Izuku said. Oh, Mirko said. I know there is a bad stigma around pro heroes that rely too much on support equipment, but hey, at least I'm trying, Izuku said. Every time he told a new pro hero he trained with that he wanted to become a hero, they gave him words of encouragement, but when he mentioned how he had to rely on equipment so much, they backed off a bit. Well damn, if you can build equipment as good as these, I'm curious to see what you have in mind for yourself, Mirko said as she looked over her boots, noticed how polished the metal was. She almost wasn't looking forward to when they lost their shine. Nothing at the moment, Izuku said, then cleared his throat. Ms. Mirko, I was wondering. To help prepare to become a hero, I sometimes spar with other pro heroes whenever they come in to get their equipment fixed. I was wondering if I could have the chance to spar with you. Mirko bent over laughing, while Izuku stood there waiting. He was used to being laughed at by other kids his age. Sorry kid, but teaching like that isn't my style. I keep my lone rabbit style close to my chest. Oh, you don't have to teach me anything. It's just a spar to see how I handle myself against you. Like you said, there is a good difference between you and other pro heroes, Izuku said with a smile. Mirko thought about it for a second. If you fight me, the service fee will be free, Izuku added. Alright kid, you sold me. Sounds like how you see people. I don't have to be at the train station until the evening. You have until either that or when you tap out. Whatever comes first, and don't think I won't hold back because you're a kid, Mirko said. I would be disappointed if you did, Izuku said, as he tightened his glove and got into his natural fighting stance. Mirko laughed at that and launched her leg at Izuku. She was surprised when Izuku expertly took a step back and stopped just outside of Mirko's range. Mirko's foot surprisingly hit the ground first and she looked at Izuku. Izuku had a small smirk, one that Mirko was more than happy to try and knock off. So with a small yell, Mirko launched herself and unleashed a barrage of kicks at Izuku. As Izuku managed to dodge Mirko's attack, she noticed green lightning was jumping across Izuku's eyes. So that's how the hell you're able to dodge, Mirko said, then did a feint on her right, and when Izuku moved to dodge Mirko's left leg, Mirko turned the feint into an actual attack. Mirko's foot connected with Izuku's chest and he was sent rolling across the floor. Mirko was confused as Izuku should have been able to tell the feint was just a delayed attack. Why the hell didn't you dodge? You were reading my mind. What? Izuku said, then coughed a bit. I wasn't reading your mind. No, my quirk is electricity-based, but I can't discharge it, so I learned to use it in other ways. One I recently figured out was how to direct my quirk to mind and accelerate my thinking. Allows me to follow my opponent's movements better. Izuku then got back up to his feet, and as he walked back to Mirko he rolled his shoulder. I didn't tap out. Mirko nodded as Izuku got back to his fighting stance. Mirko went easy on Izuku, afraid to hurt him, but Izuku had made it clear he wasn't afraid to get hit. So Mirko kicked forward and Izuku easily dodged. Mirko huffed as she kicked her other leg, but again Izuku easily dodged as more green lighting jumped across his eyes. So Izuku could follow her movement, but he wasn't predicting, so he could still get tricked. So Mirko backhanded him with her raised foot and sent him bouncing against the ground. Mirko was sure Izuku would tap out from that one hit as she had put quite a bit of force behind it. Yet to her surprise, Izuku got to his knees and then to his feet. "I know how to take a hit. I've got an old childhood friend whose quirk hits harder than that. And I thought you said you weren't going to hold back. I've seen videos of your fights. You can hit harder than that." Mirko looked Izuku up and down. He wasn't the same scared nerd she had first met. It seemed getting into a fight had gotten him into a zone, something that Mirko knew all too well. She smirked and said, "If that's how you want it." Mirko then launched herself at Izuku, moving faster as Izuku's resilience was making her feel fired up. They continued to spar into the afternoon, and to Mirko's surprise, every time Izuku got hit he was quick to get back on his feet, until round 2 after Mirko kicked Izuku's cross out of the way. Her foot connected with Izuku's chest and launched him into the wall. He hit the wall and slid down to the ground. He then tapped his shoulder and took a deep breath. Mirko walked over to Izuku and held out her hand. "Damn runt, I don't think I've ever met a middle schooler as stubborn as you. You just getting up, even after I hit you hard. You've earned my respect, runt." Izuku smiled then chuckled as he took Mirko's hand and hauled him to his feet. "Enough respect to get your autograph." Izuku then magically pulled out his journal and held it out in front of him. "Please, I like to get the autograph of every pro hero I meet, and especially those I get to spar again." "Fine, you runt," Mirko said, as she took the journal and gave out one of the first few autographs she ever had in her years of being a pro hero. Mirko then tossed the journal back to Izuku, whose smile could light up the work. Izuku put the journals back and then brought out a flash drive from his pocket. "Here, the blueprint for your new boots, so you can get them from whatever company you order them from next," Izuku said. Mirko looked down at the flash drive and said, "Keep it." Mirko then turned from Izuku and walked to the elevator and called it up. As she stepped into the elevator, she turned and looked at Izuku. "I'll be calling you up when I need a new pair." Izuku smiled as the elevator closed and he slipped the flash drive back into his pocket. He then took a step towards the table to put the metal chest away, and his entire body screamed. "Oh, okay, maybe I'll leave that for tomorrow," Izuku said, then checked the time. He needed to get home and rest and relax for school. So leaving the metal chest on the table, Izuku headed home. As Izuku took a bus home, he dropped the harder person he created to get Mirko to agree to the fight. Now he couldn't help but smile. Once he got home, he took a hot bath, and after dinner, Izuku went to bed. Despite how much Izuku changed working at Hatsum Industries, at school he stuck with his socially awkward self. He continued not to talk to anyone, was always working on homework, and never drew attention to himself. Yet unknown to Izuku, people had begun to notice the change in Izuku. They noticed Izuku had begun to hold his head up a bit more, speak with a bit more confidence when he answered a question in class. Izuku even began to smile a bit throughout the day. They also noticed the change in Izuku's physique, as through his training at Hatsumi Industries, Izuku had begun to put some weight on. In the form of defining muscles, it began to make Izuku look like a bodybuilder. From some angles, they noticed that Izuku's chest gave off a little blue glow. However, it was hard to notice through Izuku's shirt, and it was impossible to see if he had a jacket zipped up. And out of everyone, Bakugo noticed the most, and it pissed him off. Bakugo hated the new Deku, the Deku who was supposed to be a rec nerd with a useless quirk. At first, he just thought he was seeing things, his mind playing tricks on him. However, as he watched Deku, he saw his suspicion be confirmed. Something had changed with the nerd, and Bakugo decided that he needed to find what was causing Deku to be such a pain in the ass. One day after school, Bakugo noticed Deku was no longer heading in the direction of his home after school. That was clear from the start, as their houses were in neighborhoods right next to each other. And as Bakugo went east, Deku would immediately turn and head west. Bakugo had asked the old hag if Aunt and Co had moved, but she hadn't heard anything. That just pissed Bakugo off, as Deku was going somewhere new. And whatever that place was, it was responsible for the change in the nerd's behavior. When Bakugo finally had enough, he decided to follow Deku. It was the Friday following Izuku's fight with Mirko, and Bakugo kept a close watch on Deku during the last period. As per usual, the nerd was quick to gather his things and leave the school building. Bakugo quickly gathered his material and walked out of the classroom. After telling 2 of his lackeys to get lost, Bakugo hurried to the front of the school. He immediately spotted Deku and began to follow him, while keeping his distance from Deku so the nerd didn't know he was being followed. Bakugo followed Deku as he left the residential area and walked through the commercial area. Bakugo almost lost Deku as they entered the business area of town, but managed to find the big fluff of green hair. While doing this, Bakugo's anger was rising the entire time. Not only was Deku training, but he was also training in secret and was willing to travel so far every day to do so. That could only mean one thing. Deku had finally grown a pair and was training to get into UA. Bakugo growled at that thought. As kids, they always talked about how they wanted to become a hero. Yet after Deku had his useless quirk, it was clear who of the two would become the next #1 hero. Bakugo was fine if Deku was depressed because that meant he knew the truth and wouldn't get in Bakugo's way. But now it seemed Deku had illusioned himself with the idea he could become a hero. That meant Deku was better than Bakugo, and Bakugo would never let that be the truth. As Deku walked across the street, Bakugo waited, then dashed after him. Deku walked across a parking lot and Bakugo hid behind a small brush. He walked as Deku walked into a building that had a large lead lid sign on the side. What was Deku doing at a building like this? Was Deku going behind Bakugo's back to undermine him, to make fun of him? Was Deku just pretending to be weak to one day shove it in Bakugo's face that he was better? No, if Deku somehow got into UA with his useless quirk, Bakugo would have to remind him of his place. That thought caused Bakugo to yell and run across a small parking lot. He ran after the useless nerd, but by the time Bakugo got close, Deku had already entered the building. He must have heard Bakugo's yell because he turned around. "Oh hello, Kaken. What are you doing here?" Izuku asked as he locked eyes with his childhood friend through the glass door. He wasn't expecting to see Bakugo here. The only reason would be if Bakugo followed him. Why had Bakugo followed him? "You damn nerd, what the hell do you think you're doing? Especially in a place like this," Bakugo yelled, demanding an answer. Small explosions went off in his hand. Bakugo was just waiting for the door to automatically open so he could cream Izuku. Yet the door never opened. Izuku looked to the right and the left, then back at Bakugo. "You mean Hatsumi Industries? I work here. I started a bit ago," Izuku explained in a confused tone. "What are you doing here? What idiot would hire a useless nerd like you, especially at the age of 13? Don't try to lie. You're training to try for the UA entrance exam. Why else would you disappear every day after school and suddenly have a better physique? I told you, I'm going to be the only one from our shitty school that gets into UA," Bakugo said, punching the door, which hurt since it was made out of reinforced bulletproof glass. "Training? Well, I won't say I've been training every day, really only when a hero comes in for repairs. Working out, usually. I didn't like that I was so scrawny looking, so I decided to start lifting weights. As for coming here, I do genuinely work here. Look." Izuku pulled out his wallet. After sifting through some cards, he pulled one out and held it against the door. Bakugo looked at the card. It was an employee ID card for Hatsumi Industries, and it had a photo of Izuku on it. As for trying to get into UA, I will say I gave up on that dream growing up, but now some stuff has changed, and now I think I might actually have a chance of getting in. Bakugo looked at Izuku and yelled. He held his hand against the door and lit off an explosion. The door shook a bit, but no crack appeared. Only burn marks were left behind. "Young man, Ms. Potter," Hatsumi Industries receptionist, suddenly appeared behind Izuku. "If you try to do that again, I will call the police and have you arrested. Not only for damage to our property but also for aggravated assault and illegal quirk usage. Surely UA will not allow someone with that record into their school." Bakugo growled, shot a death glare at Izuku, then shoved his hands into his pocket and walked away. "Classmate?" Ms. Potts asked as Izuku turned around. "Yeah, we were once friends, but that didn't last very long," Izuku said, as he and Ms. Potts started to walk back to her desk. "Well, if he comes back here, I'll make sure to send him packing." Ms. Potts frowned as she walked around her desk and sat down. Izuku smiled as he remembered Ms. Potts' quirk, Mag Field, which allows her to manipulate the magnetic fields within her eye line. Izuku suddenly had a thought. "Your quirk, that's why Kaken couldn't get through the door. You used your quirk to lock the door after I walked through it." Ms. Potts laughed. "You really are a clever one, but the front doors don't have that kind of lock. I heard Kaken's yelling, so I used a button under my desk to lock the door, but I'll tell your idea to the Hatsumis. They might even add some extra protection that only I can activate." Izuku smiled as he walked over to the elevator. As Izuku continued through middle school, he continued to train and practice with pro heroes any chance he could. If he wasn't doing homework or working on a repair order for Hatsumi Industries, Izuku was either lifting weights, doing cardio, or taking a jog. And he was pleased with the result he was getting. The only breaks Izuku took were on Saturday and Sunday, and if he didn't have any work to do, he was working on the design of what equipment he would use for UAS entrance exam. Yet even with only 6 months left until the entrance exam and the last home stretch of middle school almost upon Izuku, he had nothing. Actually, he had a lot, several different inventions. Many of them were his own version of support equipment used by other heroes, yet none of them felt right to Izuku. They all work and would be perfect, but there is an instinctual gut feeling that they weren't meant for Izuku to use. It was a sad afternoon with the day soon becoming evening, and Izuku was working in his bedroom. Long gone was his old computer and monitor upon an old desk, to better handle working at Hatsum Industries and support his own invention. Izuku had used his pay to upgrade to the best computer and monitor his money could buy along with a new wooden desk. Izuku was sitting in his chair looking at a repair order from Whiplash as the pro hero had yet again managed the whips within his whips. Izuku had tried several times to get Whiplash to agree to an upgrade, but everything the pro hero shot him down. Now as Izuku looked over the last order, he attempted to just do the upgrade and not tell Whiplash. A knock from his door pulled Izuku from his thoughts. Izuku turned from his monitor and looked towards his door to find Inko standing in the doorway holding a box in her arms. Izuku pushed his chair back and fully turned to face Inko. "Hey mom, what's in the box?" Inko forced a smile as she worked into her son's room and sat down on his bed, placing the box next to her. Inko then looked down at the floor. Then after a deep breath she looked up at her son. "Izuku, honey, what I'm about to say it might be hard for you. Your father has been dead for some time, since you were 11. Inko waited for Izuku to react, but he was frozen. The only movement was a small burst of green electricity behind his eyes. Once the green lightning started, Izuku said in a hollow breath, "Is that why you've been worried about paying the bills?" Inko took a sharp breath. "I noticed you throwing them away one day. Haven't missed you doing that since." Inko's eyes began to tear up just as Izuku's eyes did. She began nodding quickly and said, "Your father paid for everything through his job. He took care of all the payments, but since he's died, I've been having to dive into our savings, and we're going to be running out soon. I've been looking for a job but nothing has come through." Inko dropped her face in her hands and began to cry. Izuku was instantly by her side, hugging her. "I'm sure everything will work out, and thank you for telling me that my father is dead. He might have left us, but Izuku, he didn't just leave us, he abandoned us, left me to raise you by myself, making me stress every day where he was. The only communication from him was the check to pay for everything. He abandoned us, you, all over your quirk." Inko said in a broken voice. All the feelings she had been hiding from her son were now coming out. "Okay, he abandoned us, left you to raise me, but you've done a good job at being the best mother in the world. We might have had a rough time, but look at the past few months, they've been good. Sure, we might be low on money, but you're looking for a job and I'm sure someone out there will see how good a worker you are. Until then, let me help with that. My pay isn't high for Hatsum Industries, but I can help a bit," Izuku said as he felt his own eyes become watery, so he hugged his mother more tightly. "How did you become such a gentleman?" Inko asked. "I was raised by a good woman that beat it into my genes," Izuku said with a small chuckle that Inko joined him in through her tears. Then for a few minutes, mother and son embraced each other, reflecting on all the trails they had been through. All the times they had been there for each and the times they hadn't. Times when they should have grown closer together, but ended up further apart. For those few minutes, mother and son enjoyed embracing each other. Then Izuku's attention returned to the box that his mother had brought in. "What's in the box?" Inko wiped the tears from her eyes and cleared her throat as she grabbed the box. "You remember that textbook I gave you?" Izuku nodded as he pointed to the textbook resting on his nightstand. "Well, it wasn't the only thing your father left you." Inko set the box on her lap and pulled the lid off of it. Izuku stood up to look inside the box. He saw there were journals and rolled up blueprints. Izuku remembered the promise his father had given him when he was a kid. Did the blueprints play any part in that? Izuku grabbed one of the blueprints and however, sliding off the rubber bands, Izuku began to unroll the blueprint. It was soon too big to fit in Izuku's hands, so he laid it on the ground and used his shoes and hands to keep the blueprint from rolling back up. With the blueprint fully on display, Izuku looked it over. It was extremely detailed and Izuku recognized his father's handwriting from his textbook. Even the notes would have been written years apart, they all looked the same. It was easy to see what the blueprint was of. It's an exoskeleton. Izuku then thought about what the purpose of it was. To give me super strength to make me move at high speeds. Izuku tilted his head as his eyes landed on a note that was written next to the hands of the exoskeleton. "Hey mom, can you hand me the other blueprint from the box?" As Inko pulled out the other blueprint, Izuku grabbed the textbook from his nightstand to hold the first blueprint. Izuku stood up and Inko handed him the second blueprint. After undoing the rubber band, Izuku unrolled the blueprint and read the title of the blueprint, Repulsor Technology Mark 1, designed to give flight to those that can't on their own. Izuku moved the second blueprint to the side and looked down at the one on the floor. "Put them together and you have an exoskeleton that can fly." Izuku looked over the larger blueprint and his eyes fell on some writing along the line. "Though I may not be able to directly support my son, I believe I can find the knowledge to build a device that can help my son be the hero he always wanted to be. One of the last phone call I got from your father, he told me it was close to finishing the exoskeleton and was going to start working on a device that could use your quirk to power it. But he never built one. He could never solve the riddle of your quirk." Inko said. Izuku looked over the larger blueprint and noticed there wasn't a power source, but Izuku then dropped the smaller blueprint and shoved his hand down his shirt. He grabbed the arc reactor and pulled it off of his chest. Izuku quickly put the arc reactor in the chest area of the exoskeleton. He then stood up and looked it over. The slow glow of the arc reactor sat perfectly in the middle of the exoskeleton as if it was always meant to power it. That riddle was solved by the Hatsumes. I didn't think your father's blueprints would be of much use to you, but then the Hatsumes showed us their arc reactor. And after how well it works, I've known you've always wanted to be a hero, and I know I can't give you the tools to be one, but I give you these. With what you've learned from the Hatsumes, I believe your father's invention will work and you can become a hero. Inko started to cry and Izuku comforted her, but soon his own waterworks broke and he began to cry. Again emotion ran high as Izuku and Inko made a silent promise to themselves to always be there for the other. They continued to hug and cry until Inko said it was time to retire to bed. After brushing his teeth and getting ready, Izuku sat down on his bed and looked at the blueprints again. They were extremely precise, leaving no room to make minor adjustments. Obviously, his father had spent a long time revising these blueprints to get the best design. Izuku began to smile as he continued to look over the blueprint, getting a sense of how hard his father had worked to design these. Izuku quickly stood up and scooped the blueprints off the ground. They didn't deserve to be on the ground. Izuku looked all over his room, but with all his All Might posters, he didn't have any room to have the blueprints up. Sorry, All Might, Izuku said, as he quickly but carefully began to pull out the thumbtack. After rolling up the poster and slipping it into his closet, Izuku hung up the two blueprints. After making sure they were secure on the wall, Izuku took a step back. Now being about to take in the complexity of the design from a distance, Izuku knew he was going to need some help, and he knew a girl that would be willing to give some. Izuku grabbed his phone from his nightstand and called Mei. She immediately picked up. No, I didn't almost blow up my shop again. Izuku grinned as he seemed to have a sixth sense for whenever Mei blew something up. No, I'm not calling because I felt something. No, I was wondering. Mind clocking in some overtime helping me on a project. What do you have? Mei asked. Izuku could hear the excitement in her voice as Izuku was finally letting her help on one of his personal projects, though it would have to wait until the weekend was over. Monday after school, Izuku headed to Hatsume Industries and was not surprised to find Mei waiting for him. Izuku walked over to the metal table, set his backpack on the ground, and then pulled out the blueprints. Something my father left me, Izuku said as he unrolled the blueprints on the tables and used magnets to hold them open. Mei moved around the table and began looking them over. Izuku morality noticed Mei's eyes zooming around, in and out, absorbing all the details of the blueprints. After a whole minute, Mei let out a breath and said, "You said your father designed these?" Izuku nodded. Midoriya, this isn't just something new. This is groundbreaking, and using your quirk as the power source, we might just get them to work. Think we're up to the challenge? Izuku asked. Mei looked the blueprints over again and then looked at Izuku. Only one way to find out. With that, Izuku and Mei set out building Hisashi's designs. They decided to first tackle the gauntlets, as Izuku pointed out they would be best to have for the entrance exam, whatever it entailed. It was slow going in the beginning, turning the blueprints into 3D models and having the pieces cut out. Yet once all the metal pieces were cut out, Izuku began wielding them together while Mei began working on the wiring. Once the wireframe of the gauntlets was all together and wired, the two of them ran into a bit of a roadblock. Hisashi's design of the repulsor that sat in the palm of the hand didn't work. It took a bit to find the focus point of the repulsors was the issue, as they would either burn out or just explode entirely. But Izuku and Mei kept at it, testing every little change they could think of, starting up late to do so. Until 4 months before UAS entrance exam, they hit a breakthrough and got everything working. With everything seemingly now working, Izuku began video recording all the different tests. Hatsume Industries database accessed. Izuku Midoriya personal drive accessed. Password, video 1 accessed. Please press enter. Click. Today is Monday, October 9th, 2034. The time is 3:45 in the afternoon. Izuku said as he walked into the frame, checking his phone. He slid his phone into his pocket as he turned to face the camera. He was wearing his arc reactor, which had several wires traveling down his arms to a pair of wireframe gauntlets. In the palm of each gauntlet was a glowing disc. Mei's parents had been kind enough to clean and give him the 3rd floor of Hatsume's Industries for testing. Today is test number 1 of the repulsor gauntlets Mark 1. The objective of the day is to see whether these things actually work or not. On camera, we have dummy and on fire safety, Mei Hatsume. The camera swung slightly to show Mei holding a fire extinguisher, then moved back to Izuku. I'll be starting halfway back from the center. Izuku moved into position. He double-checked everything was connected, then flexed his finger. The arc reactor glowed for a bit, and then the repulsors hummed a bit, causing Izuku to smile. All right, we'll start with low power. 10% and see how that feels. I have stationary targets at 5 yards, 10 yards and 20 yards. The camera switches views to show the targets, red plates that were hanging from the ceiling from metal wires. After the last target was shown, the camera switched back to Izuku. I think you forgot to credit another inventor, Mei said as she crossed her arm. She might not be the most social person, but something she held close to her chest was giving the credit owed to people when they helped with a project. Oh yes, the designs were made by Hisashi Sutaku and built by myself and Mei Hatsume, Izuku said as he rolled his shoulders and loosened up his body to get ready for anything that could happen. This was new technology, and while Izuku had an idea of what they were to do, anything could happen. All right, remember, half mark from the back with 10% power. In 3.2.1, Izuku lifted both his hands and extended his fingers. He took a deep breath, then flexed his fingers. The arc reactor pulsed green, and green electricity traveled down the loose wires to the repulsors. Both hummed for a bit before both fired out an energy blast. Izuku tried to hold his ground, but the force behind the blast sent him flying back across the room. Izuku backflipped across the floor until his back hit the wall. He stayed attached to the wall for a bit, but then he groaned as he fell to the ground. Mei Hatsume ran over and started to spray Izuku with the fire extinguisher. Izuku waved his hands, yelling, "I'm not on fire," and not on fire. Though the cold was distracting him from the pain that coursed through his entire body, Mei released the trigger and Izuku stayed hidden behind a white cloud, until the white cloud disappeared and Izuku slowly got to his feet, his back popping as he straightened his back. He brushed the white foam off of himself as he started to shiver. All right, I think for the next test we should stay at 1%. Video 1 ended. After the success of the test, Izuku took a few days to rest up and heal from his landing, but then he and Mei drove back to working on the gauntlets. And now they knew the design worked. They wanted to perfect them. Late nights and all-nighters became more common, but were quickly cut off when their parents noticed how worn out they were during the day. Worried about their son and daughter's health, Inko along with Mr. and Mrs. Hatsume sat the two of them down and set some ground rules. Izuku and Mei begrudgingly accepted the rules, and knowing how strict their parents could be, made no attempts to bend the rules and see what they could get away with. Hatsume Industries database accessed. Izuku Midoriya personal drive accessed. Password, video 24 accessed. Please press enter. Click. Today is Friday, January 5th, 2035. So this is the first video of the new year, so Happy New Year. The current time is 5:31, and after a short break to celebrate the new year, Hatsume and I have worked tirelessly to improve my gauntlets. Today we will be testing Repulsor Mark V in this test number 3. After furthering testing, we found some minor flaws in our improved design in the area of power conversion and distribution. We discovered that during sustained usage, the couplings began to weaken and overheat, resulting in reduced overall power, and what power does get through it is lost almost immediately to heat, meaning we have redesigned the whole repulsor base. As always on camera we have dummy, and for a lack of a better replacement, Mei Hatsume is still on fire safety. Izuku walked into the frame. He was wearing a simple white t-shirt and a pair of jeans. Both were covered in grease stains and his hair was unkempt and messy. It hung down in front of his face and he had to brush it out of his eyes. He had a few circles under his eyes, showing a bit of exhaustion. As with every video, he had his gauntlets on and they were primed to be ready. Mei huffed off screen. At the end of every test, you have blasted me with CO2, which I always remind you and you always seem to forget is minus 73 degrees Celsius. It's cold, Izuku explained as he turned to look at Mei. He then turned to look directly at the camera, and let it be on the record that if you douse me again and I'm not on fire, I'm going to Mei Hatsume's house and destroying all of her inventions. No, don't hurt my babies. Mei winced off screen. Izuku saw that she was crossing her arms and pouting. To her, her inventions were her kids, something that Izuku didn't see and would have no problem breaking her toys, especially if it got the point across. Don't douse me when I'm not on fire and we won't have an issue, Izuku said, then moved into position. As always, I'll be starting a half mark back from the center. We'll start with 1% power, then move up to 2% power. Izuku walked into position and then connected the arc reactor to the repulsor. They slowly hummed to life. In 3.2.1, Izuku raised his right hand and fired off a shot, and the energy blast shattered the glass plan in front of Izuku. Izuku then spun around on his feet as he lifted his left hand and aimed it at another plane of glass. With a thought, Izuku's left gauntlets unleashed an energy blast and shattered the glass plane, moving up to 2%. Izuku turned to his left and held up both hands. Even between 1% and 2%, the power increase was obvious as Izuku was nearly caught off balance but managed to hold his ground, though his shoe squeaked a bit as he pushed back. Then to finish it off, a glass plane was lowered between Izuku and the camera. Izuku turned and unleashed an attack from his right arm. The energy blast rocketed through the air and connected with the glass plane only a meter from the camera. As the glass hit the floor, Izuku stood in the middle, his hand by his side as he let out a breath he didn't know he had. Years of studying and months of building all come to this. Izuku had built his father's design and they worked. Yes, Izuku cheered as he lifted both hands into the air as if he wanted a double high five. In his excitement, Izuku flexed his finger and his gauntlets went off. Izuku had to take several steps back to stay on his feet. As soon as he regained his balance, he suddenly turned around and pointed a repulsor off-screen. Though the camera moved slightly to show Mei creeping forward, an extinguisher in her hands, with the pin pulled in her hand ready to pull the trigger. You want me to destroy your babies? No. Mei lowered the nozzle. Good choice. Izuku lowered his hand. He looked around at the destroyed glass and realized each of them had been 4 inches thick. His attacks had broken them apart as if they were thin. Izuku looked down at his hand, just how powerful the repulsor was. Izuku was pulled from his thoughts as Mei suddenly rushed forward. The nozzle of the fire extinguisher raised and Mei pulled the trigger. Izuku quickly raised his right and fired at the cloud of CO2 rushing towards him. The attack met in the middle and then as if a smoke bomb went off, the room was filled with freezing cold CO2. Izuku coughed a bit and waved his hand in front of his face. He looked around but couldn't spot Mei. Your babies are dead, Mei Hatsune. You hear me? Dead. Then I'm coming after you. Then the fire extinguisher suddenly rolled into view. Izuku instantly aimed his gauntlets at it, but then he hit the elevator's open door. Mei was trying to escape. Izuku wasn't going to let that happen. He took off towards the noise, but he knew he wasn't going to make it in time. So Izuku held his hand behind him, and just as his old childhood friend, Izuku unleashed a burst from his hand that rocketed him forward. You're dead, Mei Hatsune. Run all you want, but I know where you live, Izuku yelled. Video 2 end. Log off. Click. Izuku couldn't believe it as he stood looking up at the front gate of UA. After months of late nights and building his gauntlets over and over, Izuku had arrived. He had gone to bed early the night before just to make sure he would wake up in enough time for UA's Hero Course entrance exam. It was the next step in fulfilling his dreams of becoming a hero, something he had to take hold of and never let go. Izuku shouldered his backpack as he stepped through and was officially on UA grounds. A warm feeling passed over him as though he had only been seriously working to get him the past 6 months, and had been working towards this his entire life. And for some reason, he wasn't as nervous as he thought he would be. He was confident in his equipment and all he had learned from relentlessly being beaten down onto the practice mat. Izuku's right ear was suddenly flicked. It also helped that Mei had decided to come in to provide moral support, despite UA's entrance exam for the support department not starting for another 2 hours. Come on, Mei said as he walked past Izuku and headed to the main building where the opening ceremony would happen. Izuku chuckled and was about to follow after her when a cold voice came from behind Izuku. Get out of the way, Deku. Bikago yelled from behind Izuku. And I thought I told you not to try and get in. Izuku was pulled from his calming mindset as Bakugo pushed past him, making sure his shoulder hit Izuku. Izuku stepped away from Bakugo and held his tongue. He had been preparing himself not just for the entrance exam, but also for the chance he would run into Bakugo. Izuku thought about saying that Bikago couldn't hold him back and he had every right to take the test, same as everyone else. But Izuku knew that could just get Bakugo all riled up, so he didn't say anything. Izuku waited to give some distance to Bakugo, but when Bakugo reached Mei, Izuku felt his hand reach up behind him and grabbed his back up. He watched as Bakugo looked at Mei, seeming to recognize her. Mei looked back, and though her eyes didn't narrow in anger, Izuku noticed her eyes were zooming in now Bakugo, allowing her to watch for any sudden movement. A habit Izuku had noticed early now but never asked Mei able. The two of them looked at each other for a minute, then as if she wasn't worth his time, Bakugo clicked his tongue and continued walking. Izuku exhaled as he was sure Mei was doing the same. He walked up to her and asked, Are you okay? Just fine. Get in there and prove him wrong. And the support exam will have started by the time you're done. Wait up for me, Mei said. Izuku nodded and opened the door and went inside. He followed the arrows that led him to a giant auditorium. Izuku pulled out his phone and opened the marked email that had his seat location. He began walking up the stairs and found that he had an aisle seat. Izuku slipped off his backpack, stored it under his seat, and then sat down. He only had to wait a few minutes before all the lights turned off and the opening ceremony began. HHHELLLOO. Izuku instantly recognized the voice from the podcast he always listened to when he got into a zone while he was working on a project. It was the voice hero, Present Mike. He walked onto the stage in his hero costume and continued with the ceremony. First up was the written portion, something that Izuku was never stressed about. Izuku had always been at the top of his class for grades. Even with all the time he spent building and working on projects, Izuku always made sure he found time to do homework and study for any test. Though with how easy he absorbed information, he didn't have to study for long. So after the written tests were handed out and the hour-and-a-half timer began counting down, Izuku looked at the first question and gained a small smirk after seeing how easy the question was. The following questions weren't much more difficult, and Izuku easily breezed his way through the test, though he wasn't above double-checking his work and his answers. But when the timer went off, Izuku was more than confident he had passed as he handed in his test. In exchange for his test, Izuku was given a card that had a letter on it, which Izuku figured was the exam area he was designated to. Izuku then returned to his seat and the introduction to the physical portion of the test began. President Mike explained how the test worked and how examinees could earn points by destroying robots. The only small hiccup came when an examinee expressed his confusion over how in the handout there were 4 robots listed by other 3 that had been verbally mentioned. President Mike explained that the 4th robot is a bit of a secret, and as it is not worth any points, most people stay away from it. With that, everyone got up and headed out of the auditorium and outside, where several buses were waiting to take them to their exam areas. Izuku looked at his card again and then headed to one of the buses that was marked to go to exam area B. He walked to the back of the bus, choosing not to notice everyone staring at his backpack. Izuku sat down in one of the seats and then placed his backpack on his legs. The wait for the bus to start moving wasn't long, and soon it was at exam area B. Izuku was one of the last off the bus, and without knowing when the test would begin, Izuku set about getting his equipment on. He walked over to a bench and sat down and pulled out his gauntlets. As Izuku connected all the wiring and tightened the screw, he sensed someone walking up to him. Izuku looked up and saw it was the same blue-haired student who was confused about the robots. "What's with all the equipment?" the blue-haired examinee asked. "It's to help direct my quirk. Made them myself," Izuku said as he tightened the last screw and flexed his finger. The repulsor hummed to life as Izuku felt his quirk get siphoned through his arc reactor and down to his palm. If your quirk requires so much equipment, perhaps it's not suitable for becoming a hero. Perhaps you would have better luck in the support course. What would you do if your equipment was broken in the middle of a fight? The blue-haired examinee asked, in a tone Izuku didn't like. He wasn't asking out of curiosity, but from the same location that all the other pro heroes went to when they realized how much Izuku relied on support equipment. "I could still hold my own," Izuku said, as he closed his backpack and set it after the bench. He stood up and began walking away from the blue-haired examinee. He dealt with that attitude from enough pro heroes. He didn't need it from someone who was trying to be a pro hero. Izuku forcefully closed his backpack and then leaned it against the tree. Izuku stood up and looked the blue-haired kid in the eyes, ready to rip him a new one. However, before Izuku could say anything, President Mike's voice yelled, "Begin." Izuku froze, just as everyone else did. No countdown, no notice, just start. Izuku was quicker to react than everyone else, as he got over the confusion faster by directing his quirk to his mind. With a clear thought forming in Izuku's mind, he took off to the big door that was not open a few seconds ago. Izuku dashed through the frozen exam and made it to the inside of the fake city. Hold on. The exam area was a whole fake city. How could UA possibly afford to build not just one fake city but 6 for each exam area? Not getting distracted by that, Izuku came across a one-pointer. Now it was time to see how his equipment held up against something that was built by someone who had years of experience and the funds to build anything. Izuku lifted his right arm and with a flex of his finger, power built up in the repulsor. After a second, the energy was unleashed into a blast that rocketed towards the one-pointer and hit it in its chest. The attack hit and then quickly burned a hole through the robot. Izuku's eyes went a little wide as he realized that was not 1 or 2%. He had instinctively increased his power to 5% to make sure he had destroyed the robot. Yet Izuku barely had time to make the change as 2 more one-pointers came around the corner as if spurred towards Izuku by the sounds of battle. Izuku raised both of his hands and unleashed too much attack. The energy burst hit the robots but did not burn as the first robot. Izuku quickly stepped forward, unleashed 2 more attacks and managed to hit the heads of the 2 one-pointers. As their heads melted away, the robots began to shake until they stopped and fell to the ground. That's 3, as Izuku began to keep track of points. The baseline of who was accepted and who was denied was unknown, but Izuku would like to know how close he was to ETH. Izuku then noticed that other people were starting to file into the city. They were beginning to attack the robots in the surrounding area. Izuku knew he needed to go to a new location to find more robots. So he began running down the street. Izuku ran down the street until he heard some noise coming from an alleyway. As that couldn't possibly be anything else besides robots, Izuku turned and headed into the alleyway. And just as he disappeared from the corner, a 3-pointer suddenly appeared and tried to punch him. On pure instinct, Izuku managed to dodge the attack. But as he raised his hand, the robot attacked again. The 3-pointer's speed was faster than the others, causing Izuku to panic. Izuku shifted his arm to block the attack. But the 3-pointer's speed wasn't the only improvement. As the robot's fist connected with Izuku's gauntlets, Izuku felt the wireframe quickly bend and deform. Then Izuku was sent flying down the alleyway. As Izuku hit the ground, he used his gauntlets the best he could to protect his arm. Once has stopped sliding, Izuku got to his knee and saw that luckily his gauntlets weren't fully broken. The left one had taken the most damage and probably only had a few shots left, while the right one was only slightly damaged. Yet this made Izuku wish he had added some kind of armor over the gauntlets, to provide some protection to himself and the repulsors. Yet he had been so focused on building the repulsors he hadn't worked on anything else from his father's blueprints. Izuku cursed himself as he got to his feet. Izuku's vision was still a little fuzzy, so he took a deep breath and the world came back into focus. He looked down the alleyway and saw the 3 pointers. It was staring back at him as if to taunt him. His vision went a little red as he looked at it. Without a second thought, Izuku yelled and rushed forward. Now knowing about its enhanced speed, Izuku easily dodged the robot's punches. He launched himself out of the way of the attack and landed on a dumpster. He used it to springboard over the 3 pointers. Izuku's plan was to land behind the 3-pointer and attack it from behind. But as Izuku landed, he was attacked again. Izuku raised his right arm to block and managed to keep his feet under him as he was pushed back. As he stopped, Izuku rolled his shoulder, then rushed forward. This time, instead of jumping away, Izuku slid under the 3-pointer's arm and slid under its stomach. Izuku stopped underneath the 3-pointer and laid both of his hands flat against its underbelly. Green lightning jumped across Izuku's body as his quirk poured into his arc reactor and shot down into his repulsor. 50%. Immediately, both repulsors gave a near-blinding light and a high-pitched whine before blasting the 3-pointer in its weak spot. The metal of the robot groaned for a few seconds, and then the robot melted in half and fell to the ground around Izuku. Izuku's shoulders hit the ground and it felt like they almost became dislocated. Izuku screamed out in pain as he fell to the ground. He struggled to catch his breath as the pain shot through his shoulders, along with the crash causing a massive headache to cloud Izuku's mind. He could only lay on the ground, breathing through the pain. He lay on the ground until the pause system turned on and said, 1 minute remaining. How long had Izuku been resting on the ground? He only had a minute left and he only had 6 points. Fighting through the pain, he got up and looked around. He needed to find some robots to destroy, but all the ones in his vicinity had been destroyed. Suddenly, he felt the ground begin to rumble. He looked down the street he was standing on, just in time to have a wave of examinees run past him, though they weren't enough to cause the ground to rumble. However, the giant robot behind them was enough to shake the ground. Izuku froze as he looked at the robot, its shadow covering most of the surrounding area. As several students ran past him, Izuku felt panic enter his mind, telling his body to move, to run away, to get to safety. Yet he was paralyzed with fear. He couldn't move and was going to be crushed by the giant robot. Izuku tried to move, but his body wasn't responding. And then a small voice reached his ears. "Someone, please help. I'm stuck." The voice called out. It was full of fear and terror and pain, the same of him. Izuku looked down the street and noticed a girl with brown hair and pink cheeks pinned to the ground by some debris. She appeared to be trying to grab it with her hand, but she couldn't fully reach it. Izuku looked back up at the 0-point robot. It was only a few meters away, while he was only a few feet away. He always wanted to be a hero, to protect and rescue others, to be a beacon of peace and hope. The people always talked about how the top heroes showed early signs of being amazing. They were always stronger than those around them, better than those around them. Izuku might never be that, but he wasn't going to give up because of that. Izuku couldn't think straight as he felt his body begin to move toward the girl. He weaved through some debris, then slid to a stop next to the girl. He gripped the debris the best he could with his broken gauntlets. However, without the whole exoskeleton, it was too heavy for him to lift it and free the girl. Suddenly, he felt himself standing in a large shadow. He looked up and saw the 0-pointed foot right about them, so he chuckled a nervous laugh. Izuku knew this was probably the end of it. He was going to get crushed, along with the girl. He had worked hard to get where he was. He worked so hard on his mission to become a hero, but now he was going to die. He would never become a hero. Everyone in his past was right. He and his useless quirk could never become a hero. He had wasted his life chasing an impossible dream. No, Izuku couldn't allow himself to think like he couldn't afford to doubt himself now. Too many times in the past he had denied himself his dream. If he stopped now and gave up, then he might never pick it back up again. He had been so close to doing it before, but now he had people supporting him. His mother, Mei, and her parents all wanted to see Izuku become a hero. It wasn't no longer just his dream, but the wish of those around him. Izuku couldn't give up now. This wasn't the end for him, just the new first step. Izuku let go of the debris and pointed both of his palms up. 100%. Both repulsors and arc reactor glow a bright green before a large energy blast is emitted from Izuku's hand. The attack shot up and connected with the 0-pointer's foot, disintegrating it almost instantly. Izuku let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, but took a sharp breath with the 0-pointer braced itself. The massive robot then began to reach down towards Izuku and the girl. The girl began trying to free herself, with even a pink aura forming around her before blinking out. While Izuku froze as he looked up, He tried to think of what to do, then his newest trick came to mind. It was a relatively new addition he had made to his arc reactor, allowing it to be sort of a last resort repulsor. With nothing else to do, Izuku dropped his hands and puffed out his chest. Unibeam, 100% green lightning traveled across Izuku's bone, highlighting his veins before condensing down into his arc reactor. The arc reactor glowed green before unleashing a large green beam, which had the sparking of lightning traveling down it. The beam shot through the zero-pointer's hand and green lightning arced over its entire body. All the lights on the 0 point turned green, while the lighting of the surrounding building flicked on and off, and then the beam reappeared coming out of the 0-pointer's head. Izuku stopped yelling and the light show stopped. Smoke rose off the crisp 0-pointer body as it crumbled into a black charred mess. Izuku took a breath and pain shot through his body, then quickly disappeared. Izuku collapsed to the ground, nearly empty. The Unibeam attack had taken more out of him than he was expecting. The physical portion of the entrance exam is over. You will receive your exam score in 2 weeks. If any of you are in need of medical attention, please wait as medical assistants are being deployed. Present, Mike said. A pair of robots arrived and lifted the rubble of the girl. She was lifted onto a stretcher and taken away to be healed. Izuku sat on the ground catching a breath with an elder pro hero Izuku recognized as Recovery Girl walked up to him. Are you alright, dear? An attack like this must have been quite exhausting. I'm fine, just need to rest, Izuku said, picking him off the ground and walking back towards the entrance. As he walked, he felt a cold feeling coming over his upper lip. Touching it, he drew his finger down and saw that they were covered in blood. He quickly wiped his fingers and nose, just as he noticed several students looking at him and the burnt hole in his shirt. How many of them had seen his final attack? How easily he had seemed to have taken down the 0-pointer. He paid no attention to them as he walked out of the fake city and over to the bench that hid his backpack. He walked over to the tree from before and slipped off his broken gauntlets and arc reactor. He slipped them into his backpack, then fished out a taser and held it against his chest. He didn't like it, but it had become a good way for him to replenish his body's electricity when he used too much. Pressing the button, Izuku felt the electricity jump from the metal prongs of the taser into his body. After a bit, Izuku fit normal and he tossed the taser back into the backpack. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked to a bus to take him back to the main area. As the bus traveled to the front of UAS campus, Izuku took a small power nap. After being dropped off, Izuku shouldered his backpack and began to work his way to the support department exam. As he walked, he realized how screwed he was. He had only scored 6 points as the 0-pointer robots gave him just that, 0 points. Sure, it had looked cool, but Present Mike had let everyone know that destroying it was only useful to show R1's quirk. He had wasted so much time recovering, and 6 points weren't going to be enough for the practical exam. So even if he had aced the written exam, which he wasn't 100% sure he had, he wasn't going to get into UA. Izuku cursed himself for failing so badly. He knew his only chance now was to go to a normal high school, then hope for Tokyo U. Izuku reached the waiting area for the support course and waited for Mei to return. As he waited, he sat down and leaned after the wall. After a bit, he pulled out a notebook and looked at the design he had for a full suit of armor. But now that seemed like a far-off dream, as at Tokyo U he won't be given any kind of grant to build his armor. At least not until he was in his 3rd year. He sighed as he pulled out a pencil and worked on the helmet. As he worked on the shape, a UA teacher walked up to him. Are you lost, little buddy? Izuku looked up and saw that it was Power Loader. If Izuku wasn't so depressed, he would have asked for a signature. Actually, I just came from the hero exam and now I'm waiting for my friend that's doing the support course entrance exam, Izuku explained, as he put the pencil on his ear and closed the notebook. Hero exam, how did it go? Power Loader asked. It was hard to see his face, but Izuku got the impression that Power Loader was smiling. Not good, sir. A robot broke my repulsors within the first few minutes. Then I exhausted myself until the 0-pointer. I had to use my unibeam to destroy it. Izuku shivered at the recent memories. He started rubbing his wrists, and they started to feel sore. He had trained tirelessly and worked on his equipment every day, and he used all of his quirks to fight. But in the end, it didn't matter, he had lost. Izuku wiped the tears that were starting to form on the edge of his eyes. Wait, you destroyed a 0-point robot. What for? It was rare for an examinee to destroy a 0-pointer. For 2 reasons, the first being that they generally run away from it. Second, Power Loader made the 0-pointers tough, meaning even if an examinee attacked it, they would have to be pretty strong to even dent it. A girl was stuck and was going to be crushed. Izuku explained, a small happy thought that he had managed to save someone. Maybe the hero course teachers would take pity on him and give him a second chance. Repulsor, Unibeam. Those don't exactly sound like ultimate moves. Power Loader had a curious look on his face. What exactly are they? Equipment I built to use my quirk. Izuku grabbed his backpack and pulled out his busted equipment. Just looking at them reminded Izuku how hard had tried but how easy he had failed. He handed them to Power Loader, who looked them over with a curious eye. These look familiar. Powerloader looked at the palms on the gauntlets, memories filling his head as he did so. Hey kid, if you can fix these within the next 10 minutes and show them to me, I'm willing to put your name down for the support course. Powerloader handed back the equipment. Izuku's face lit up. You really mean it? He had just failed the hero course, but if he could get into the support course, he would still be going to UA. Plus, he would be in the same class as Mei. And UA was a private school. The teacher could run their class any way they saw fit. If Izuku impressed Powerloader enough, then he could get the money and supplies to build his armor. Even with these busted, I can tell they're advanced engineering. Get them working and show me their power, and I'll consider it. You can use my room. It should have all the equipment you need, Powerloader said with a nod. Izuku held back his excitement as he slipped his stuff into his backpack, then pushed himself up and off the wall. He followed Powerloader down the halls to his main office. It was a standard workshop, though it was organized between mechanical, electrical, and bioengineering. Everything was put in its place, making it hard to lose anything. Everything was clean and perfectly reflected the overhead lights. Izuku figured it would take Mei less than 10 minutes to turn the place into a mess, maybe even less. Remember, 10 minutes. Try not to set anything on fire. I've already had to deal with 5 of those today, Powerloader said, closing the door behind him. Izuku sighed as he looked around, still working on his excitement, and as he had learned over the years, the best use of this kind of excitement was to direct it at something. Izuku might have failed the hero entrance exam, but he still had a chance to get into UA through the support department. Izuku looked down at his backpack. Either way, he would need to fix his equipment, might as well use his excitement to get it done quickly. Walking over to the table clearly meant for mechanical engineering. Izuku pulled out a small metal stool and sat down. He slipped his backpack off and set it down on the table. Quickly undoing the zipper, he reached inside and pulled out all his arc reactor, deciding to work on that first. Because if that didn't work, then he wouldn't be able to power his gauntlets. After struggling to pop the glass cover off, Izuku slipped on a pair of goggles that magnified everything. He began to take a look around inside his arc reactor. He sighed a breath of relief as his belief of the inner wiring being fried turned out to be false. A few that were connected to the focusing repulsor were a bit fried, but that didn't comprise the function of the arc reactor. Aside from that, the rest of the wire had been protected, as the focusing points of the small repulsor had done a good job of containing and directing all the energy into the attack. Satisfied that he won't have to completely rebuild the thing, Izuku replaced the glass cover and slipped off the goggles. Izuku flipped the arc reactor and took a look at the back. Twisting the base, the palladium core slid out, immediately hissing and letting out a small cloud of smoke. Izuku waved the smoke around and looked at the palladium core. It was completely useful, and if he planned on using his unibeam again, he would have to reconfigure it so it didn't fry the palladium code every time. Having made the mistake of grabbing a burnt core before, Izuku grabbed a pair of pliers and slowly pulled the palladium core out. From the hissing sound and the smoke, Izuku knew the core was fried, but now that he had a better look at it, it looked worse than ever. Izuku had waited too long to replace his arc reactor core before, in an attempt to see how long one could last. But he was surprised he hadn't overloaded the core, as it now looked like a marshmallow that had been caught on fire and not put out. Izuku then recalled the green lightning that had traveled along his unibeam. Maybe he had overloaded the core a bit. Keeping hold of the burnt core and the pliers, Izuku reached into his backpack and withdrew his water bottle. Placing it on the table, Izuku skillfully unscrewed the top with one hand and then dropped the burnt palladium core into the water bottle. The water within the bottle immediately began to boil and hiss. So Izuku just loosely put the lid back on. He had thought about just putting the lid back on, but that would probably result in the water bottle exploding from the pressure. Izuku laughed at how easily he could have just made a bomb. Refocusing back on the task at hand, Izuku reached into the side pocket of his backpack. He then pulled an old-fashioned Zippo lighter and popped the top open with a flicker of his thumb. Instead of a sparker and a wick, inside the lighter were 2 backup palladium cores. Sliding one out and injecting it into the arc reactor, Izuku waited for the core to be ready. Once the arc reactor stopped flashing green and held a steady blue light, Izuku pulled his shirt up and held the arc reactor against his chest until he felt the adhesion take hold. Immediately, the arc reactor began to siphon off of Izuku's electricity. After the familiar feeling filled his chest, Izuku relaxed a bit and then focused on his gauntlets. Pulling them out, Izuku thought they looked miserable, misshapen and broken. With a sigh, Izuku decided to start with the left one as it had received the most damage, slowly working the metal to its original shape. After a few minutes, the wireframe looked wearable. Well, at least it won't dig into Izuku's skin when he tries to slip them on. With that worked out, Izuku turned the gauntlet around and looked at the palm. There was some metal decay around the repulsor, which only required a quick scrubbing with some high-proof acetone. With that all finished, Izuku turned to the wire. Some of the wires had been cut, so Izuku disconnected them, and putting the goggles back on, he pulled some wiring from a spool that was on the edge of the table. He plugged the soldering gun in and heated up quickly. Izuku then expertly soldered new wiring within his gauntlets. Once all was said and done, Izuku unplugged the soldering gun and slipped it into its holder, allowing it to cool off without burning anything. Izuku sat up straight and looked down as his handing work. Everything seemed to be fixed, but there was only one way to truly test everything. Izuku connected his arc reactor to his gauntlets and crossed his fingers as everything took a bit to power on. As the palm of the gauntlets flickered to life, Izuku let out a sigh of relief, yet something still felt off. Izuku pulled out his phone and after turning it on saw he had gone over his 10 minutes by nearly an hour. In a panic, Izuku slipped on his gauntlets and then his backpack. After quickly tidying up his workspace, Izuku ran to the door. Getting through the door, Izuku nearly bumped into Power Loader. Power Loader managed to jump out of the way, and in surprise, Izuku forgot to turn or slow down, so he ran straight into the hall. As he fell to the ground, Power Loader began to laugh. Ha 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 ha, I guess that means you're still and forgot about your 10 minutes limit. Still, you paced that test. Test, sir? What test? Izuku asked, pulling out a second water bottle from his backpack and taking a small drink. Why would Power Loader be testing him? I don't get to give this test every often. Though you're not the first to arrive and have something wrong with their equipment. Most would just leave after their equipment fails. Those that don't, I give them 10 minutes to repair whatever is broken. Most just leave since they think 10 minutes isn't enough, or they work until they hit 10 minutes then leave. Even then, in a rush, they sometimes break their equipment even more. Very few get so lost in their work that they forget about the 10 minutes and work until their equipment is fixed. You are one of those. You stayed focused on the project, not worrying about the time limit or how broken your equipment was, meaning you passed the test. This was a test, Izuku said as Power Loader's explanation just made him even more confused. Not a graded one. I wanted to test the kind of person you were. You said your equipment was broken within the first few minutes of the hero exam. However, you didn't give up and continued to move forward. I wanted to see that for myself. Power Loader leaned forward and inspected the repulsors. It looks like you managed to get them into working order. Are they safe to fire? Izuku looked around the hallway and the room he just left. It was much smaller compared to the room he was used to training in, and with all the equipment and tables, the room was even smaller. If Power Loader wanted a demonstration, then Izuku would need this space. I think it might be best if we head outside, Izuku said, as got to his feet and brushed some dirt off his shoulder. Power Loader nodded and led Izuku down the hallway. As he followed Power Loader, Izuku used a screwdriver to tighten a few screws he had missed. One habit he wasn't sure to be thankful for picking up from Mei was always carrying around loose screwdrivers in his pocket. Once outside the support department, they found Mei Hatsum waiting for them. She was sitting on a bench across from the entrance. Upon the door's opening, Mei looked up and her eyes fell on Izuku. Anger immediately filled them but was quick to be replaced with a smile. Izuku decided he had been seeing things. I thought you had left without me, Mei said, walking up to the pair. Her overalls had black scorch marks, showing the invention she had shown may have or may not have exploded, along with the fact that Power Loader looked cautious when she got near. The hero exam got out an hour and a half ago, but I couldn't find you. Sorry, Hatsum. My gauntlets got damaged and I figured I could use the time while I waited to repair them. I guess I lost track of time. Sorry for making you wait, Izuku said, rubbing the back of his head while making sure the repulsor didn't go off. That doesn't explain what Power Loader is doing here, Mei said, looking over the pro hero. Power Loader smiled at Mei but remembered how her invention exploding had caused the biggest mess of the day. Power Loader slowly took a step back, not wanting to experience that again. He noticed my equipment and was curious about them, Izuku said. He didn't feel like telling Mei at the moment that he had failed the hero course entrance exam, and now getting into the support course was his only chance of getting into UA, and that Power Loader was generous enough to offer that. That would come at a later date. Those Izuku hoped that day would never come. Power Loader looked between the duo, wondering what kind of relationship they had. I was curious of how powerful they were. A flash of murder shot across Mei's face, causing Power Loader to take another step back. I don't plan to steal the plans. I can tell they don't run off a normal AA battery, and without a power source they would be useless. Izuku looked down at his shirt. As he was usually wearing the arc reactor most of his waking hours, he had learned that with a jacket the glow of the arc reactor wasn't noticeable. But with the hole in his shirt, it was easy to see the blue light. He could still feel something was wrong with the arc reactor, but Izuku didn't exactly have the time to find out what. Izuku looked at Power Loader and said, I think I'm ready to go whenever you're ready. Power Loader nodded. Normally I would test for different things, but seeing as how we don't have the time and I'm more interested in seeing a demonstration, we'll just move to that portion of the exam. Izuku nodded back, then walked away from the building, rolling his fingers a bit to warm back up. Standing in front of a large patch of grass, Izuku slowly raised his arms and held his hands out in front. We'll start with 5%. Izuku said, a warning Mei picked up on. As Izuku trained with the gauntlets, he had slowly gotten used to the recoil and could stand his ground up to 8%, though that might be nothing if he didn't have his feet planted. Izuku exhaled and a green light, starting at the arc reactor, traveled down to Izuku's palms. As this happened, Mei quickly jumped back and braced herself against the building. However, Power Loader, never having experienced the power of the repulsors, was confused about what Mei was doing. But then Izuku's attack was unleashed and he nearly fell over. The force pushing against him threatened to send him flying. Yet he managed to lean forward and dig his finger into the ground. With his fingers providing anchors, Power Loader was able to watch the dual energy blast rip apart the ground in front of them. The area in front of Izuku and Izuku himself disappeared into a cloud of dust. Luckily, there was a small breeze that slowly cleared the dust cloud as Izuku walked out of it, waving his hand in front of his face. Izuku coughed a bit and then said, "What do you think?" "That was only 5%, Power Loader asked. Looking at the torn ground that Izuku's equipment caused, it looked like a crater, and he couldn't believe that the blast was only 5%. He wanted to see what 100% looked like, but he also didn't want to cause more property damage. It was a few more seconds before Power Loader spoke again. He cleared his throat and said, "Well, thank you for that demonstration. You two will be receiving letters within a few weeks." Izuku and Mei both bow to Power Loader. "Now get home before your parents start to worry." With that, the duo turned and hightailed it off of UA campus. Power Loader smirked as he looked at the crater Izuku's repulsors had created in the ground. A name of an old colleague, and a promise he made to that colleague came to his mind. He knew what he had to do as he pulled out his phone and looked up Izuku's exam file. He looked it over as he walked to Principal Nezu's office. He knocked and Principal Nezu called out, "Ah, Power Loader, I suspected that the large explosion had come from the support department, though the exams were over 40 minutes ago." Principal Nezu, a little mouse bear hybrid, was sitting behind his desk, talking with the hero course teachers. When Power Loader walked in, "What can I do for you?" "I would like to talk about an examinee." "One Izuku Midoriya," Power Loader said, looking at his co-workers. He gave them time to find Izuku's file as it was towards the middle of all the examinees. Mr. Aizawa flipped a few papers before saying, "Izuku Midoriya." He tried out for the hero course. He got a 98% on the written exam, only missing the answer to arguably the hardest question. A good start. However, he failed the practical exam with only 6 villain points. Though with the girl he rescued from the zero-pointer, his score was bumped up to 26. Not enough to get into the hero course. Power Loader nodded. Mr. Aizawa had explained everything perfectly up to the point where Power Loader could easily take over. Power Loader then told everyone Izuku's perspective of his actions through the test and why it caused him to fail. As he spoke, Power Loader could feel his own heart beating within his chest. It was telling him that nothing was more important than getting Izuku into UA and more than just the support department. After which, he came to the support department. I talked with him and gave him the same test I've given others in the past. Yet he passed, as he worked until he was done, not once worrying about the time limit. Power Loader explained. He fixed his own equipment. Midnight said as she had no intention of paying attention. However, Power Loader's comment about Izuku fixing his equipment caught her attention. Most people focus on being a hero, a normal student, or a support course student. Very rarely did someone have feet in 2 worlds, as it often let them be behind in both worlds. Yes, a device he called repulsors, and I asked for a demonstration. May I? Power Loader pointed to the keyboard on Principal Nezu's desk. Principal Nezu slid it forward, allowing Power Loader to tap on the keyboard. He pulled up the security system. After failing the hero course and seeing his equipment, I offered him the chance to fix his equipment and have an opportunity to get into the support course. Power Loader pulled the point of them walking out of the building. Then fast forward a few seconds, this is the demonstration. The video showed Izuku explaining he would only be using 5%. The blast occurred and the video paused before showing Power Loader anchoring down. A few seconds last, Izuku walked out of the dust cloud, which disappeared moments later, revealing the damage Izuku had done. That was only 5%, All Might said. He compared the strength to his own and figured it was about the same as a flick of his finger. It might not sound that great, but when compared to All Might it was impressive. The other teachers had a similar thought and some feared how much damage could be caused if Izuku used 100%. Yes, and I suspect the power growth is exponential, not linear, Power Loader said, giving his educated guess to his co-workers. As he looked between them, he could see how impressed they were. Maybe they would accept his idea. That's all and good, but I suspect this has more than accepting a student into the support class, Principal Nezu said, accepting the keyboard back. Yes, a promise and favor I owe to an old colleague, an older teacher from UA exactly. I knew the repulsors looked familiar and I believe my old colleague is connected to them. I promised him before he died that if I ever came across a student that had these devices, I would do everything in my power to help them become a hero. Power Loader said, so I propose a deal. I will accept Midoriya into UAS support course. He's the best I've seen in a long time and he gives off the aura of wanting to learn more. From there I can better help him build the blueprints I suspect he has. If we play our cards right and with UAS resources, the final product should be ready by midterm exams, maybe earlier. But if he does well enough in the hero midterm exam, he gets transferred into 1A or 1B. Except students never get transferred from the support course to the hero course. Mr. Aizawa pointed. He had only been a little impressed by Izuku's demonstration, as to him it looked more like unleashing raw strength than a precise attack, making it seem that Izuku had little control over his equipment. And that was another thing. Izuku seemed to have to rely on his equipment a bit too much, as he had failed the entrance exam since his equipment was broken. Powerloader sighed. He knew Eraserhead was going to be the hardest to convince. Yet he wasn't deterred. That's because none of my students have had the drive to get into the hero course, but this kid, he has the spirit to become a hero. If nothing else, I can promise you that. Something I know you will learn yourself. Powerloader looked at Principal Nezu. That sounds all and good, but I'm not the one you have to convince, Principal Nezu said, nodding towards Mr. Aizawa. Powerloader faced his fellow pro hero. The UA Sports Festival, that will be his first milestone. He doesn't have to win, chances are he won't. He just has to get to the third round, meaning he'll provide himself on par with the hero course students, as they'll usually be the only ones left. Are you willing to bet your career on this kid? Mr. Aizawa asked. He wanted to know how serious Powerloader was about this kid. He had seen several students enrolled in the hero course, only to either fail out or resign from the course. If he was going to go along with Powerloader's plan, he needed to see that Izuku wasn't one of those students. Yes, if this kid doesn't impress you, I will leave UA as a teacher forever, Powerloader said, looking Mr. Aizawa in the eyes, and Mr. Aizawa looked back at him. Neither of them was willing to break first. Powerloader knew from the start how serious Mr. Aizawa was, and he wanted to prove he was just as serious, if not more. Principal Nezu coughed into his paw, getting everyone's attention. Well, that does sound like a fun bet. Powerloader, you are the best support teacher we have, and I would rather not lose you. How about this? If this Izuku Midoriya completes the hero midterm exam, he will be transferred to the hero course. However, if he fails to impress, UA will get half of all copyrights to any invention he creates while in school and after he graduates. Moreover, Eraserhead, if Izuku Midoriya gets transferred, you are not allowed to expel him for whatever reason. Aizawa didn't seem too annoyed by that, but his fellow teacher knew better. That will extend into his second and third years. However, Powerloader, if Izuku Midoriya fails the hero midterm, you will be responsible for creating the plan for Hell's Door. At the mentions of Hell's Door, Powerloader and All Might both flinched. They both understood why that plan was created and both hoped it would never have to be used. Yet Principal Nezu was someone who planned for any possible outcome, and as unlikely such an outcome would happen that Hell's Door was needed. Powerloader didn't hesitate to nod. He had promised on all grounds to his old colleague, being the one that had to live with being the one that created Hell's Door. It would give him less guilt than not allowing Izuku the chance to become a hero. I understand, sir. Wait, what's Hell's Door? President Mike asked. Then you may enroll Izuku Midoriya into UA. He will be watched closely, and every move of his will be judged. You hold your new student in high regard. We will do the same, Principal Nezu said. What is Hell's Door? President Mike repeated himself. I understand, sir, and if Midoriya is all that he said he was, then I'm sure Midoriya will rise to any challenge placed in front of him. Powerloader in a serious tone. His old friend had done many things in preparation for the day Izuku came to UA, and before he had died he had entrusted all of his secrets to Powerloader, though Powerloader had refused to look through them. As to him looking through them was admitting that his friend was really dead. Seriously? What is Hell's Door? President Mike asked for a third time, as he was not getting any response. It had been 2 weeks since UA entrance exam, and Izuku could be found at Hatsum Industries. He had been working on getting a working prototype of repulsor boots, with minimal success over the board. It was getting late in the evening, but Izuku didn't feel tired. He wanted to get a good baseline of his father's design before he was done with middle school. But from the yells alone it was easy to tell progress wasn't really happening. Come dummy, just because Mr. Hatsum nicknamed you dummy doesn't mean you can act like an idiot, Izuku said, nearly messing up on the placement of the wire in his hand. He never understood why Mr. Hatsum hadn't dismantled or programmed dummy yet. He never listened to orders and often did the opposite of what he was told to do. Izuku was simply trying to get him to hold a magnifying glass so he could use both hands to solder the wire in the boot. However, dummy never had the glass in the right spot. When he did, he kept on bumping Izuku's hand and making him mess up. Finally, Izuku had enough. All right, just get out of the way, or I'm going to sell you to charity, Izuku said, causing dummy to make a sad-sounding noise, and moved away. I wish I had Hatsum's zoom quirk. Then I won't have to deal with you. Suddenly something unexpected occurred. Dummy hit Izuku up alongside the head with the magnifying glass. Okay, that's it. You're getting dismantled, Izuku yelled, grabbing a wrench from his table. He brought it up as he turned around, ready to bring it down on Dummy's outer shell. However, in that moment the elevator door suddenly dinged. The Hatsums and Inko Midoriya walked in. Mrs. Hatsum quickly noticed the wrench in Izuku's hand, trying to dismantle Dummy again. She asked, "This time he hit me in the head," Izuku said, lowering the wrench. However, Dummy made a sound like a laugh and Izuku instantly had the wrench raised back in the air, which caused Dummy to shut up. "Good. Mom, what are you doing here?" "This came," Inko said as she held up a letter with a wax seal of UA. "It just arrived in the mail." Izuku smiled at the letter, but he had been hoping to read it by himself because he knew he wasn't getting into the hero course. He hadn't taught anyone about failing the entrance exam for the hero course, yet nevertheless, Izuku accepted the letter from his mother. "Can we start with May? The anticipation is killing me," Mr. Hatsum requested, pulling up another stool. Everyone followed suit and sat down at the table Izuku had been working on, as Izuku slid his project to the corner of the table. Before Inko or Izuku had a chance to nod or say yes, May ripped the letter open and a silver disc fell out on the table. It hummed for a bit before powering on. A hologram of Power Loader appeared. "Hello, Ms. May Hatsum. After your explosive demonstration of your hover shoes and much review, you have been accepted in the UAS support class." For some reason, Power Loader didn't seem too joyous about saying that. Yet he continued on, enclosed as the secondary letter will be your schedule and class information. "We are looking forwards to you joining us at UA." The hologram beeped and Power Loader disappeared. May slipped out the letter and read it out aloud. "Dear May Hatsum, you have been accepted in UAS support course and are placed with Class 1H. Mr. Hagari Majima, hero name, Power Loader, will be your homeroom teacher. The school year begins April 15th and classes begin at 7:30. Farewell and welcome to your hero academia." May began to bounce in her seat as she began to read the letter. The longer she reads, the bigger her smile got. Soon her bouncing was moving the whole table. "Good job, my little ball of energy." Mr. Hatsum, along with his wife, hugged May. Once May stopped bouncing, she looked at Izuku. "Now open yours, let's see what class you got into." Izuku sighed, then like ripping a bandage off, he ripped the end of the envelope and fished out the silver disc. He spun between his fingers for a bit, as he prepared himself for the inevitable. He just wasn't ready for what everyone was about to see. May was the only one that knew Izuku had demonstrated his gauntlets to Power Loader, but she was still under the impression that he hadn't failed the hero course entrance exam. He was just merely satisfying Power Loader's curiosity. Izuku sighed, then lightly tossed the silver disc into the middle of the table. It spun around on itself before settling down and turning on. Immediately a hologram of Power Loader appeared, confusing everyone. "Wait, I thought he was the teacher for the support course?" Inko asked as everyone looked at Izuku. He wanted to hide under the table, and before he had a chance to answer, Power Loader spoke. "Hello Izuku Midoriya. I know this isn't what exactly you were hoping for. I know you were hoping, as many do, for the hero course. Unfortunately, you only scored 26 points on the exam. 6 villain points and 20 rescue points. However, I don't know whether to call it fate or coincidence, but we had a chance to meet at the support department. Though you were not originally supposed to take part in the support exam, your demonstration of your repulsor technology has convinced me that you are needed at UA, whether it be as a hero or as a background support. Please, allow me to be the first to welcome you to UA High. I'm looking forward to working with you." Power Loader smirked as he bowed slightly. The message stopped quickly, followed by the projection disappearing. Izuku felt tears coming on. He won't be in the hero course, but he would still be going to UA. However, Inko had a skeptical look on her face. Clearly, her son had left some important detail out when he told her about the exam. She looked at Izuku and asked, "Izuku, what exactly happened?" Izuku flinched and then began rubbing the back of his head. It was a few moments before he answered with, "Well, during the entrance exam my gauntlets were damaged. After the exam was finished I headed over to the support department to wait for Hatsum. I came across Power Loader and one thing led to another. In the end, he asked me to give a demonstration of my equipment. He gave me the offer, if I failed the hero exam, I would be considered for the support class." Neither Inko nor Izuku spoke for a second. It was Mrs. Hatsum to break the silence. "Young Midoriya, while I know how badly you want to get into the hero course, I believe being in the support course will give you a chance to continue working on the blueprints left to you by your father. Besides, there have been incidents where a general studies student is transferred to the hero course. Never from the support course, but hey, you can be the first. But first, you need to perfect your creation," Mrs. Hatsum said as she grabbed the letter and held it out to Izuku. "Become the first support student to become a hero. Make this school your hero academia." And with that, Izuku and Inko hugged each other and cried. "Hey dummy, get me a mop," Mr. Hatsum whispered to the robot after a second of the son and mother crying together. The robot disappeared but never returned with the requested mop. Mr. Hatsum started to agree with Izuku that the dummy needed to be dismantled and rebuilt. Izuku and Inko cried for a bit before they finally stopped. They gave each other a long hug, almost crying again. Now that the waterworks are over, how about we treat these amazing kids to some dinner? Mr. Hatsum suggested, still curious about where Dummy had disappeared to. I think that would be lovely, dear. They have accomplished something great and I think they deserve a reward. Mrs. Hatsum looked over at Mei and Izuku, who had oil smudges and smelled like burnt metal. However, I think it would be best to freshen up before we head out. Inko was glad she wasn't the only sane parent in this group. While her husband might be a little crazy, Mrs. Hatsum always made sure her family was presentable in public. I agree. Izuku, it smells like you haven't showered in 4 days. Izuku lifted his arm a bit and sniffed. He didn't smell too bad, but he figured he had gone nose blind. I'll take your word for it. After showering and everyone getting ready, they met at the restaurant Mr. Hatsum had taken them to the first time they met. Their last few weeks of middle couldn't have gone any slower. But as Izuku's patience began to wear thin, Mei's patience had disappeared only a week after receiving the letter. Their first day at UA High had arrived. Together they ran through the front gate, feeling as ready as they could be for the day. And what challenges Power Loader had for their first day. They only had one little issue. They were late and class started 10 minutes ago. I thought you said you had everything ready, Izuku said, almost tripping over a loose brick, but managing to keep himself upright. He shouldered his backpack to make sure nothing fell out. If he had time, he would have slowed down and tightened the straps. I thought I did, but I couldn't find my 8/17 sprocket, Mei said, struggling to keep up with Izuku. She didn't have his kind of training and wasn't used to this kind of exercise. I didn't know my father had moved it while I was asleep. Oh my gosh, Hatsum. What would you do without your 8/17 sprocket? I mean, come on, how many times have you used the specific sprocket? Izuku said in an extremely sarcastic tone. He could list 2 inventions of hers that used that size of sprockets, and in his book that wasn't worth being late to the first day of school. 15 different babies used that size of sprockets. They countered like that number really meant anything. What out of over 1,000? Not worth it in my book, Izuku said. Mei threw a weak punch, and Izuku didn't even try to dodge, because Mei lost balance and missed. Luckily, she managed to stop herself from tripping. The duo continued bickering over which tools were worth leaving behind and which were worth being late for. Needless to say, Mei had a longer list for being late. They didn't realize they had reached the support department until Izuku had to scan his ID. If we're lucky, we can quietly sneak in and sit down. So Hatsum, keep your lips shut, Izuku said. Mei did the zipper motion over her lips, but Izuku knew that wasn't going to last long. They reached their classroom and Izuku looked through the glass window. Power Loader had his back turned to the class, so Izuku silently opened the door and signaled Mei to sneak in. Once Mei was past the door, Izuku quietly crept in behind her. So that being said, today we'll begin our class with a simple engineering problem, Power Loader called out as Izuku gently lowered his backpack onto the table he sat at. Young Midoriya and young Hatsum, so glad you could join us, even if you're 12 minutes late. Izuku looked up and Power Loader hadn't even turned around. It was like he had eyes on the back of his head. Now that you're here, class can truly begin. What I'm writing on the board is a complex issue in engineering. Using only the thrust-to-weight ratio, Newton's gravitational law, and Einstein's equation of relativity. Write an equation to show how much fuel-to-thrust conversion would be needed to lift an object of unknown weight. Power Loader wrote the different equations on the board for reference for his students. Sir, are you referring to the gravity elemental theory? A student asked, raising their hand. Power Loader turned around and faced his student. Yes, one day you will all come across this problem. Though a theory and equation have never been written and proven, your understanding of the problem will help you greatly solve any issue you come across. However, if you manage to solve the theory and write a proven equation, you will immediately graduate from UA and receive your PhD in engineering. To get an apprehension of your knowledge, you have the rest of class to work on the problem. Sir, what about orientation? A different student asked. UA isn't within the normal boundary of a school, so we teachers can take a unique approach to teaching. Remember, you have until the end of class, Power Loader said, sitting down at his desk and pulling out a textbook. Sir, what if we solve this theory outside of the time limit? They asked, voicing a question that many students had. You won't immediately graduate and you'll only receive your master's at graduation, Power Loader said without looking up from his book. Izuku felt a fire be lit in his soul. He had crossed the gravity elemental theory multiple times as he memorized his father's old textbook. It seemed that his father had also been working on it and had many thoughts of his own. Along with those notes were possible equations to solve the theory. However, it is clear from the notes the equations weren't 100% proven. Yet they had been the closest Izuku had ever seen. Izuku pulled out his notebook and wrote down the equation that seemed to be the closest. Well, at least his father believed it was the closest one to being proven right. Izuku went over the equation in his head. He knew there were just a few things wrong with the equation. It was like a big piece was missing from the puzzle, and when Izuku figured that out, everything else would fall into place. For the entire class, Izuku tried to figure out what the piece was. However, he ran out of time. Once the first period was done, it was time for the standard classes of Japanese, English, social studies, math, and history. The day went like it went by in a blink of an eye, and soon the first day of school was over. Izuku was thankful when the last bell rang, as it felt like his mind was going to melt by the time the last period was over. As he and Mei rode the train to their stop, Izuku rubbed his forehead, fighting back a pulsing headache. "I think I could fry an egg on my forehead," Izuku said, taking a drink of ice water. He swore he could hear the water begin to boil in his mouth. Mei had her head back, with her water bottle resting on her forehead. I knew UA was going to be difficult, but once Powerloader Sensei brought up the gravity elemental theory, I think I panicked for a bit. Well, at least it wasn't for a grade, Izuku said, taking another drink. But imagine if we managed to figure out the equation. I mean, it's one of the most difficult theories in engineering. If you solve it, you've basically set for life. Mei leaned forwards, tipping over her water bottle. It fell off her forehead. However, before it had a chance to hit the ground, Izuku's hand shot out and grabbed it. He flipped it around and then handed it back to Mei. "Yeah, my father had a lot of notes about the equation. I think he was trying to solve it for his repulsor boots," Izuku said, which confused Mei. "Really, that's an issue? I thought yours worked pretty well," Mei said as she had seen Izuku hover off the ground with his repulsor boot. It was completely different from her hover boot, and she would never admit it, but they worked better than hers. "Hey, they work, but they could be better. I can hover, but only for a little bit before the arc reactor is completely drained. My dad had plans for actual flight. However, if I push them past a few inches, they overheat or the arc reactor can't draw enough power for them," Izuku said, with the feeling that this was his father's last great creation and he would do anything to make it work. Anything short of selling his soul to the devil. "Come on, once we get home, let's just do our homework. Then we can work the boot," Mei offered. It had started to become like that after Izuku worked on Hatsum Industries for a bit. Together they worked through issues with each other's invention. After a day like they just had, it would feel good to do something like that. "No, once we're done with the homework, I'm going to bed," Izuku joked, then downed the rest of his water. Soon the train reached the stop for Hatsum Industries and together they walked up to the third floor. Throughout the afternoon and evening, they worked on the homework, and once they finished the last problem, Izuku collapsed to the floor. Mei checked the arc reactor to see if Izuku had overused his quirk. In the past, whenever Izuku used his quirk too much, he often passed. Moreover, Izuku had learned that he could direct his body's electricity to his mind, allowing his mind to work at double the speed and absorb information more quickly. And throughout the day, Mei had seen a few green sparks in Izuku's eyes, a clear sign that Izuku was doing just that. Mei connected the arc reactor to her phone and got a reading. 85% of normal electricity range. No immediate medical attention needed, Mei's phone stated. Mei sighed, then looked down at Izuku, tempted to slap him across the face for making her worry about him so much. As Mei looked at Izuku, she felt her heart rate increase a bit. She felt her cheeks go red. "Why are you such an idiot?" Mei had been having these thoughts for a bit, even since she had seen him manage to knock down Crimson Dynamo during one of his training sessions. She knew what it was, but she didn't want to admit it to herself. These feelings always came up when she was alone with Izuku, but had become more frequent as they prepared for UA. She couldn't tell if Izuku had the same feeling and was afraid if she admitted she did and he didn't. She didn't want her friendship with him to change. So until she knew for sure, which she knew was going to be a challenge, since Izuku was the most emotionally dense person she had met, and that was coming from her, she won't tell Izuku about her feelings. To distract herself, Mei pulled out her hover boots and worked on them until it was time to leave and go home. Izuku was so tired he had slept through dinner, and Mei was afraid to wake him up and tell him to go home. So before Mei went home, she brought him a pillow and a blanket. After making him comfortable, Mei watched him sleep a bit, then went home. That night she dreams about Izuku and her possible future with him. The next morning, Mei woke up with a bright blush on her face. She quickly ran to the bathroom and splashed her face with cold water in an attempt to make the dream go away. However, the image of Izuku wearing his exoskeleton, ready to take to the world, was burned into her memory. Mei didn't say much as she rode the train to UA with Izuku, and if Izuku noticed, he made no note of it. Though Mei was sure he didn't. As soon as he sat down on the bus, he gave a small hello and then was note deep in his notebook. As the bus drove along, Mei noticed that Izuku's uniform was freshly ironed, showing that her mother had stopped by the shop early. After finding Izuku asleep on the third floor, she had taken his jacket to iron it. At the end of the Mei is told by her mother how she had to kick Izuku out of the shop after almost being delayed again for apologizing. So as Izuku was nose deep in his notebook, Mei didn't say a word until the bus stopped in front of UA. Mei heard a noise and looked out the window and saw a massive crowd in front just outside the gate. Mei bumped Izuku with her elbow, and when Izuku looked at her, she pointed out the window. Izuku followed Mei's finger and his eyes landed on the crowd. News Channel 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and 11. Hero Channel News. Even with Yue being a hero student, they usually touch Yue until the sports festival. So what are they all doing here? Izuku and Mei got off the bus and walked towards the crowd. Izuku made the mistake of getting their attention. Excuse me? Instantly several reporters swarmed Izuku and Mei as they all held their microphones up. What's it like having All Might as a teacher? Is he as charismatic as he is on TV? Is he just as strong? Is he a good teacher? Izuku and Mei looked at each other. Neither of them knew that All Might was a teacher at UA. And if he was a teacher, he would be teaching heroics, not the support course. Yet that didn't matter to Izuku, as he was already making plans to track the #1 hero down and asking for his signature. Izuku then noticed all of the reporters were looking at him now. I haven't met All Might yet. We were unaware that he was teaching here. But he would be teaching the hero course. We're from the support course. We haven't had the chance to meet him. Izuku explained with quickened words, as he didn't like being the center of attention. After Izuku explained the situation, all of the reporters left him and Mei alone, apparently waiting for a hero course student. Izuku and Mei pushed their way through the crowd and towards the gate. One of the reports got nosy. Lairs, you might be in the support course, but that doesn't mean you haven't met All Might. What's he like? The reporter reached her hand forward to grab Izuku's jacket. However, a large gate shot up, blocking the duo from the media. Whoa, so that the UA gate. Izuku had read about UAS security systems when he got bored in history class. He couldn't explain how much he wanted to get inside and look at the mechanics. But he had a class to get to. He knew he couldn't afford to be late 2 days in a row. Turning away from the gate, Izuku and Mei were stopped by Mr. Aizawa. Oh, hello, sir, Izuku said, but Mr. Aizawa paid them no mind. So Izuku and Mei moved around them and continued heading towards the support department. As Izuku distanced himself from the front gate, his mind became more focused on how Power Loader would start this class. He had figuratively dropped a bomb on them last time. Izuku could only hope he didn't drop a literal one this time. Izuku and Mei were the first ones to arrive at class this time, and they found Power Loader sitting at his desk. He had a large thermos full of coffee. Izuku could tell by the smell, though it did nothing to hide the bags under Power Loader's eyes. Power Loader was looking at something on his computer. Hello, Sensei. Were you up late last night? Izuku asked, pulling out his notebook and putting it on the table. They had a few minutes before class started, and Izuku thought to fill it by reviewing some of his father's notes, getting things ready for some future classes, Power Loader said. Then took a long drink of the coffee from his thermos. He then set it back down and went back to looking at his computer. After a bit, he pushed his chair back a bit from his desk and looked at Izuku. Actually, Midoriya, are you available after school? There's a proposition I would like to talk to you about. A proposition, sir? Izuku asked. He had come to terms with being in the support department. However, Power Loader was talking as if he was being let go. Izuku tried not to panic at the thought that he wouldn't be allowed to continue school at UA. There's no need to worry about it. Once I've said my piece, you'll understand, Power Loader said, going back to his computer. Izuku watched Power Loader for a bit, trying to start a conversation about his proposition, but the way Power Loader was looking at his computer, it was a look Izuku recognized whenever Mei was focusing on a project. Power Loader wasn't listening anymore and didn't hear a word Izuku said. Izuku opened his notebook to the repulsor boot and began working on trying to solve the power problem to get enough lift. After testing late into the evening, Izuku figured out that by redirecting the electricity through a secondary pair of wires, it was possible to delay the secondary pulse to the repulsor and allow the repulsor a chance to cool enough between each electrical tick, thus solving the overheating issue, though that was still only theory as he hadn't had a chance to test it out. Now there was the power issue. No matter how much Izuku focused on directing his quirk's electricity to the boot, he couldn't get more than a few inches off the ground. He knew the palladium core of his arc reactor was the most effective of drawing out his electricity, yet it couldn't draw enough to power the boots. Izuku had spent the last 2 years trying to find an element that would work, and all he had learned was he wasn't even close. Izuku looked over his design, racking his brain for a solution. By the time the bell had rung, Izuku was lost in thought. Power Loader called attention and gave the lesson plan. Yet Izuku was still lost in thought. It took Power Loader walking up and dropping 2 large textbooks right next to Izuku to get his attention. Izuku leapt out of his chair, nearly hitting the roof. Welcome back to the land of the living, Mr. Midoriya. Now that you're back, would you mind solving the problem on the board? Power Loader said as Izuku landed on the ground. Izuku worked to lower his heart rate as he climbed back into his chair. Once he was seated again, he looked over at the board and looked over the equations. It was a simple engineering problem, based on the law of thermodynamics. His mind quickly worked to solve the issue and he gave his answer. He then looked at Power Loader, but Power Loader still shook his head. Thank you, Midoriya, that is correct. However, even if you are able to solve the problem, it does not mean you are allowed to not focus in class. My purpose is to show you what you know and teach you what you do not. There will be a point in each of your careers when you come across a problem that you cannot solve on your own. My job is to give the guidance to be able to move past that problem," Powerloader said as he grabbed the textbooks and moved back to the front of the room while taking the hint. Izuku sat down and listened to Powerloader for the rest of the class. Soon it was lunch. Izuku walked into the cafeteria and immediately spotted the blonde spiky hair of Katsuki Bakugo. Izuku immediately turned his back to Bakugo, as he prayed that his old childhood friend wouldn't notice him. Izuku continued moving along in the line, only taking small glances to see if Bakugo had noticed him. As soon as Izuku got his katsuden, he quickly walked over to where Mei was enjoying her lunch and sat down. She had a book opened and was reading through it as she ate, amazingly keeping his overstuffed sandwich from dripping on the book. "Do you even take a moment and just enjoy life?" Izuku asked as he sat down. As he recalled, ever since meeting Mei, it seemed she was always working on some kind of project or reading a book to help in one of her projects. At least now it seems this book was for fun and not preparing for a new invention. Izuku gave a quick thanks and then began eating his own lunch. "That's what sleep is for," Mei replied, then took a bite of her lunch. "Besides, this is a good book. It's from the time before quirks. It is about a scrawny kid during a war world that is given the chance to enlist in the army and has the promise to become a super soldier. It talks about all the different changes he goes through all at once and how he manages to stay mentally strong through it. Sounds like a good book," Izuku said. He wasn't really interested, but he was working on his small talk and Mei was a good helper. Not many people listened to him when he began to rumble and mumble his thoughts. With how little interaction he had with his old classmates, he was lacking in that skill set. Izuku brought some katsuden up to his mouth with his chopsticks, but he stopped when he heard footsteps walking up behind him. Izuku then froze as he smelled burnt caramel, a smell he was too familiar with and he wasn't too fond of the heat that followed it. "Oi Deku, what in the hell do you think you're doing here?" Izuku didn't even need to turn around to know who it was. Katsuki Bakugo was a proud teenager. He was the most powerful person in his middle school, and he made sure everyone knew it. If anyone said otherwise, he would prove them wrong through the use of his quirk. It was the thing that allowed him to get the highest villain score on the practical exam for UA. It had allowed him to get into Class 1A. It gave him the power to ultimately destroy the hero training yesterday. That floating bitch and glowing karate kid didn't stand a chance. His quirk was what allowed him to be the only kid from Aldera to get into UA, or so he thought. On the first day, Bakugo had made sure of that, scanning the crowd of the first years to see if he recognized anyone. He didn't recognize anyone in 1, and when he got the chance he checked out the extras in 1B and wasn't satisfied until he was 100% he didn't see anyone from Aldera. Once he was done checking, Bakugo walked home a pleased man. He had made good on his promise from middle school. However, as he sat down at lunch, trying to ignore shitty hair, tape dispenser and lighting bulb, Bakugo noticed a familiar touch of green hair. It was covered in oil grease and it wasn't as shaggy as he knew it to be. Yet it was undeniable what he thought it was. It was fluffy and as messy as ever. It would always be, no matter how much the person tried to change him. His quirk had allowed him to be the only kid from Aldrea to get into the UA hero course, but clearly not UA as a whole. Something Bakugo had made a promise to remind them of if he tried to get into UA. Bakugo watched the head of green hair as it moved down the lunch line and got its lunch. Bakugo watched as the person kept their back to him. However, as the person sat down, Bakugo saw their face. He recognized those freckles, that determined look that made Bakugo hate the person so much. The way the person held themselves, timid and reverse, but a spirit was willing to fight for their friends. Bakugo was looking at the weakest person he ever had the unfortunate chance to meet. How could Bakugo have missed him the previous day? Maybe Bakugo was just imagining him. However, when Bakugo reopened his eyes, he still saw him. He was looking at the powerless Deku, Izuku Midoriya, the person who had no reason to be at UA. The damn worthless, stupid nerd. A person with a useless quirk and should have stayed out of Bakugo's life. Bakugo felt his hand clenched, wanting to fire off an explosion. However, he was under close watch after sending 2 extras to the medical wing yesterday. And the stupid glow squid somehow learned about it before Mr. Aizawa had even announced. So Bakugo tried to calm himself. But when his eyes fell on Midoriya again, his heart rate increased. Bakugo suddenly stood up, nearly knocking over his chair. "Yo, Bakugo, what are you doing?" Shitty Hair asked, and that caught the attention of the glow squid. However, Bakugo didn't answer as he walked away. He noticed the glow squid was giving him a stare, but Bakugo ignored it as he didn't have any part in Bakugo hate towards Deku. As Bakugo walked over to the damn nerd, he felt his hands instinctively began to let off small explosions. Bakugo walked up to the green hair extra and said, "Oi Deku, what the hell are you doing here?" The nerd didn't have the respect to turn around and face him. So Bakugo grabbed his shoulder and said, "I asked you a question." Bakugo was loud enough to get the attention of some nearby students. The better-off quirkless extra started to turn around, looking at Bakugo. But before he could answer, the intercom turned on and stated, "Emergency code level 3. Emergency code level 3. Izuku had managed to calm his nerves enough to turn around and offer an explanation to Bakugo. Tell Bakugo that he was part of the support course and was working on becoming his own kind of hero. However, before he got a chance to explain, the intercom turned on and said, "Emergency code level 3. Emergency code level 3. Izuku was swept out of his chair as chaos broke out. As the wave of students trying to get out of the cafeteria picked him up, fear and panic overcame Izuku. He was carried towards and through the doors of the cafeteria as Izuku tried to look around and find Mei. However, it was impossible with the amount of students running around. It got worse when Izuku heard a third-year student explain a level 3 meant someone had broken it. Izuku tried to fight against the crowd, keeping his feet back under himself, anything to calm down. It wasn't until a minute later that a student floated above the crowd and cartwheeled over to the door. "Everyone, stop. It's the media. The teachers are currently handling it, so act like the UA student you are," the student yelled. After a few moments, the crowd began to calm down and Izuku dropped to the floor. Izuku felt his arc reactor begin to spark. No, that couldn't be happening. At a time like this in a packed hallway, why was his quirk reacting to his fear and panic? Izuku knew he needed to act quickly, or his quirk would harm everyone more than the panic was. Izuku quickly reached down his shirt and gripped his arc reactor. It was warm to the touch as Izuku twisted the base, and the main part of the arc reactor quickly came off from Izuku's chest. Izuku pulled out his arc reactor and let out a sigh of relief as it started to cool down, but then the pain began to shoot through Izuku's body. His muscles started spasming, and Izuku fell to the ground as he worked to keep his chest from locking and as it became harder to breathe. As Izuku lay on the ground, he felt his quirk racing through his body looking for the escape route he had just removed. Izuku then felt his muscles become weak from the overstimulation of his quirk's electricity. Yet it was better to contain the electricity than let it loose and allow it to harm the other students. As he lay on the ground, Izuku tried to calm himself down by taking deep breaths as it became harder and harder to do so, but being surrounded by a packed crowd was making it difficult. Izuku felt his quirk flare up again and he had to bite his tongue to keep himself quiet. Izuku felt his mind begin to race at 100 miles per hour. If he didn't calm down soon or get away from anyone else, then the panic was going to go from bad to worse. Izuku had to regain control of his quirk, but then Izuku ran a green lightning jump between his fingers. He was running out of time. His body was becoming overloaded and soon his quirk was going to start jumping over students. Izuku tried to stand up, but his legs wouldn't respond. He had to get away from everyone else. Izuku then suddenly felt hands grabbing his arm. Izuku tried to get them off of him, but Izuku noticed they were covered in rubber. The person then began to shovel their way through the crowd, dragging Izuku along with them. Izuku never had the confidence to push his way through. Neither did the person, they just didn't care about being rude or not. Izuku was dragged through the hallway and soon he was pulled outside the building. Though he had a dazed mind and hazy eyes, Izuku could tell he was being dragged to the support department. However, he felt himself blacking out as the person dragged him. He barely noticed them swiping their ID card and pulling him inside the building. Izuku's vision went black as the person dragging him opened a door to a secondary classroom room and pulled him in. "Ms. Hatsum, what are you doing here?" Izuku heard Powerloader ask. "I need the room." "It's Izuku," Mei said. Powerloader looked at Izuku and saw the green lightning jumping off his body to anything metal. He also noticed that Mei was wearing rubber gloves. "Grab anything that important and get out of the room. I have backup hard drives." "What's going on?" Powerloader asked as he watched green lightning shoot off Izuku's body and burn a table. Izuku's file mentioned he couldn't discharge electricity. Clearly something was wrong. Did it have to do anything with the sudden break-in? Had Izuku acted and could no longer control his control? "We need to get out of the room," Mei said, looking at the table. In the past, when Izuku's quirk became overloaded, it never released like that to instantly burn a metal table to ash. Powerloader quickly ran for the door, while Mei set Izuku on the floor. "Hold on for 5 more seconds." Mei quickly turned and ran for the door that Powerloader was holding open. Mei dove through the opening at the last second and Powerloader slammed the door shut. A second later, they heard Izuku scream and felt lightning being blasted against the door. Izuku's scream rang out for 10 seconds as a green light flashed under the door. As Mei lay on the floor, each second of Izuku's scream felt slower than the second before. Once it finally stopped, Mei ripped the door open and ran in. She slid to a stop next to Izuku and grabbed his chest. She lifted him and laid him in her lap as she checked for a pulse. As Mei began to feel Izuku's pulse, she felt his labored breath. This hadn't happened for a while and never this bad. As Mei looked around the room, Powerloader walked in right behind her. He was expecting the room to be lit on fire and the fire alarm to go off. That wasn't what he saw. There was no fire, no alarm, as there was nothing left in the classroom. All the desks, chairs, computers, and whiteboards had all been disintegrated. There wasn't even ash left to flow around. All four walls, along with the ceiling and floor, were black, making it look like one giant burn mark. Powerloader looked at Izuku with shock and a little bit of fear. He was passed out, cuddled in Mei's arm. His clothes were all burnt and Mei had to put out a small fire on his shirt. His pants were more shorts, his jacket was missing, and he had black marks over his arms and legs, but otherwise he was modest. Care to explain what just happened? Powerloader said as he continued to look around. He hadn't seen this level of pure destruction in a while. Even when powerful students brawl with each other or a student loses control over their quirk, UA was built to handle that kind of power. Yet Powerloader didn't think All Might could have efficiently destroyed the room. Mei looked up at Powerloader as his eyes fell on her. She could see he had questions. Please, Powerloader. We need him to be the medical officer of the school. He's beyond quirk overload. With his quirk, his muscles could be in spasm, brain overload. Anything that could happen when someone is struck by lightning just happened to Midoriya. Mei tried to pick Izuku up, but he was unconscious, and unconscious people were heavy. Powerloader walked over and helped her. Fine, but then you're explaining what I allowed into this school, Powerloader said. The level of destruction Izuku's quirk was capable of, Powerloader had never seen from the electricity-based quirk before. What new level was Izuku on? An answer that would have to come later. As Powerloader and Mei carried Izuku out into the hallway, Powerloader opened a closet and pulled out a stretch. Since Powerloader could remember, there was almost a stretcher in every closet in the support department. He couldn't remember the exact reason, but it was safe to assume that it was an order by Recovery Girl. She always complained that most of the injuries she had to deal with came from Powerloader's students. Powerloader and Mei loaded Izuku onto the stretch as he moaned a bit, and they then quickly made their way out of the support department. They raced across the main campus as the last of the media was being unforcibly removed from the grounds by Principal Nezu and many of the hero course teachers. At the main building, Powerloader swiped his card and they ran into the building. With most of the students having already returned to their classrooms, Mei and Powerloader didn't dump into anyone as they carried Izuku to the medical office, only passing Eraserhead in the hallway, who most have thought it was a new record for how quickly a student got injured at the start of a class period. Yet Eraserhead said nothing, only had a curious look on his face as he let them pass and then continued walking down the hallway. Once they arrived at the medical office, Powerloader knocked on the door with his foot and called out, "We need some help." "What is it this time?" "I just got done with the mess caused by the students," a voice yelled. It didn't sound too pleased to be disturbed, especially after having to deal with the injuries that students had given to each other during the panic. They were high schoolers, they should act like it. Powerloader continued to kick the door and called out again, "Recovery Girl, this student needs your help." "Powerloader, if any student of yours exploded their invention, I'm not helping. They need to learn from their mistakes. I told you so last year and accidentally went down by 200%. You students got smart and started wearing protective gear," Recovery Girl said. "I swear to you, this is not like that," Powerloader said. A few seconds later, the door opened. Standing in the way was an elderly woman with a large syringe that acted like a crane. Recovery Girl took one look at Izuku and sighed. "Well, most certainly looks like it. Unconscious, burnt hair, clothes and skin, and he has bruises forming. All typical signs that someone's invention blew up. I told you at the end of last year, I'm not healing any student that disregards safety so easily," Recovery Girl said, staring down Powerloader. "I promise it's not." Powerloader shoved his way past Recovery Girl, earning him a new nickname of Bolthead and a whack on his head. Ignoring Recovery Girl, Powerloader and Mei lifted Izuku onto a medical bed, then quickly stepped back as Izuku's body convulsed and a green bolt of lightning arc jumped from Izuku's chest to the IV stand. "Loss of quirk control," Recovery Girl said. "Quirk overload," Mei corrected. "Midoriya body generates a high amount of biostatic electricity, but when he becomes panicked his body generates too much. While he's here, I might as well heal him," Recovery Girl said with a sigh as she walked over to the bed and got ready to use her quirk. However, she was stopped before she had the chance. "Wait," Mei said. One thing she had picked up from Izuku was learning about different pro heroes' quirks. While Izuku was fascinated by them in all aspects, Mei looked at them in terms of what support equipment she could build for them. Nevertheless, she knew a bit more about heroes than the average person. Your quirk uses a person's energy and stamina to heal them. By that standard, Izuku is running on empty. Recovery Girl stopped and looked at Mei, surprised a young girl such as Mei was so informed of her quirk. She had been out of the limelight for years now and was only called from UA from a disaster struck and civilians and heroes needed heavy medical attention. "What do you mean?" "Izuku's quirk is static cell. Like I said, his body generates a high amount of biostatic electricity, which can be used to power devices. But he can't discharge like other quirks. But in situations when he becomes panicked, his body will overload itself with bioelectricity. that his quirk's his fight or flight response. But his body can't contain all the electricity and it is forcibly discharged. This caused him great pain through extreme muscle stimulation and drained all of his stamina. Mei explained as she thought back to the last time this happened. It wasn't as bad and Izuku was still out for a whole 24 hours, though the worst part was making sure Inko didn't have a panic attack herself. You're well informed about Midoriya's medical condition, Recovery Girl said. I build support equipment for Hero. I have to understand what can go wrong if the equipment harms someone. And Izuku is my best friend. He didn't fully understand or work on his quirk when he was a kid. So when he came to work for my parents, he and I spent many night tests on his quirk. Mei said, I thought Midoriya wasn't able to discharge his electricity. That's why he wore the device on his chest, Powloader said, tapping the middle of his chest. The light blue glow was noticeable when Izuku wasn't wearing a jacket and Powloader only knew the function of it from meeting Izuku during the entrance exams. Yes, normally that's true. He must have removed the arc reactor during the panic. While it had contained most of Midoriya's quirk, it becomes overloaded faster than Izuku's body, so he must have removed it to pay for time. Mei explained. During the panic, she felt her mouth start to taste like metal, something most of the other students probably didn't notice as they were focused on running from the villains. But similar to the real-life tail of lightning, Mei knew that metallic taste in her mouth was from Izuku's arc reactor about to overload. So when the feeling suddenly disappeared only to return a few seconds later, Mei knew precisely what Izuku had done and knew he needed to get out of the building. Now that Mei thought about it, she didn't remember seeing the arc reactor as she pulled Izuku out of the crowd. He must have accidentally dropped it, probably being hit out of his hand as Mei dragged him through the crowd. Mei would need to find it and see how recoverable it was. But what happened in the classroom? He disintegrated everything. He didn't leave ashes behind. Powloader asked, calling the state the classrooms had been in after Izuku's lost control over his quirk. When Midoriya's body can no longer hold the electricity in, it begins to discharge as lightning. Imagine an electric plant overloading. This causes Midoriya great pain and can easily kill him if he doesn't release the energy quickly enough. That's why Izuku discharged all that energy at once to save himself. Having explained the situation, Mei flopped down onto a chair next to the bed Izuku was lying on. My family. We've known about the issue for a year now and we've been trying to improve the arc reactor so Izuku doesn't have to worry about overloading it. However, we haven't figured out a better element than palladium. Palladium? Powloader asked as palladium was infamous among engineers. Very few had a chance to work with it as it was extremely rare and difficult to come by. Powloader himself only had worked with it a few times in the past. And with only little he had, there wasn't any project that seemed worth the price tag that came along with using palladium. Mei pulled her spare lighter and pulled out a core of palladium. She tossed it over to Powloader. Powloader caught the palladium and looked it over. It was the same size he had been given to work with. But the size and purity Powloader was holding it couldn't have cost anything less than 720,000 yen. How could Izuku be so freely using palladium at that cost? And who was Izuku's supplier and how were they getting so much? As Powloader continued to overlook the palladium core, he did a few quick calculations in his head. The numbers he was coming up with were impossible. No electricity-based quirk could be that powerful. He turned to Mei and said, palladium this size can easily withstand 10 gigajoules a second. How much electricity was Izuku producing to overload the core? Last time we checked, Midoriya can naturally produce well over 15 gigajoules per second. Mei said and saw Powloader was skeptical. As we've said, Midoriya's quirk is powerful, more than any other electricity-based quirk. I guess to balance the scales, he can't use his quirk in the conventional way. However, when in a state of panic his body will begin to produce 100 gigajoules. Mei said, then again that was 2 years ago. Chances were his quirk was much stronger now. I'm not an engineer, but isn't 1 gigajoule the equivalent of a single lightning bolt? Recovery Girl asked. While working at a prestigious high school, one could learn a lot through mild conversation in the hallway. But then a noise drew her attention. 1 second, the Powloader was standing. The next he felt his knees grow weak and then give out, causing Powloader to fall to the floor. When Izuku had demonstrated his repulsors after the exam, Powloader figured he was maybe producing 1,000,000 joules, but Mei's explanation just blew that number out of the water. Powloader looked at the palladium core in his hand. Guess that explains why Izuku was using it and not some other kind of metal. Powloader looked at Izuku, the student he had allowed into UA. He had allowed the equivalent of a freak lightning storm into UA. He couldn't imagine the power the kid had before him and he let the kid in because of a promise to an old friend. Well, this explains why the cameras in the support department are longer working, Principal Nezu said walking into the room. He looked at Izuku then over at Mei and gave a simple nod. Principal Nezu, Powloader and Recovery Girl both said, almost as if getting ready to stand at attention. Principal Nezu had a horrible habit of popping into a conversation and not telling how long he had been listening. By the sound of it, it seemed he had been listening for a while. If I'm not mistaken, Power Loader, this is the student you plan to transfer to the hero course, Principal Nezu said, magically producing a cup of tea and taking a small sip, then looked at Power Loader. Yes, Power Loader said. Power Loader wasn't afraid of Izuku being expelled. But if Mr. Aizawa knew what happened and feared it happening again, it could easily hurt Izuku's chances of getting transferred. Wait, transferred to the hero course? What do you mean? They asked, looking behind the principal and her homeroom teacher. Izuku's acceptance letter hadn't made any kind of reference to Izuku having the chance to transfer, something that can be explained at a later date. Principal Nezu then pulled something out from a hidden pocket. Oh, I believe this belongs to you. Principal Nezu held out Izuku's arc reactor to Mei. Mei got off her chair and grabbed the arc reactor. She looked it over. The glass was cracked, and using her quirk she saw the palladium core was fried. I had received the warning about a large electricity discard in the support department and managed to pull up the security camera, though only for a few seconds before Midoriya's quirk fried them. Impressive, yet destructive display of power. Remind me why this student failed the hero exam, Principal Nezu said, taking another small sip of tea. His quirk doesn't allow him to discharge his electricity, so he uses a device called an arc reactor to siphon the electricity out of his body and to power his equipment. He failed because said equipment got destroyed early in the exam, Power Loader said, and afterwards he came to the support department to fix them and give you a demonstration, Principal Nezu said, stirring his tea before taking another sip. I remember you wanted to enroll Midoriya because of a favor and promise you owed to an old colleague. What was his name? I don't think you ever shared his name in the meeting. Hisashi Sutaku, Power Loader said, and suddenly Mei bent the hospital bed rail guard she was holding. Principal Nezu noticed and was quite impressed at the feat of strength. Mei's face was narrow and looked like she was ready to kill something. The display of grip strength told Principal Nezu that whoever she felt like attacking should fear for their life. Are you familiar with the name? Principal Nezu asked. After taking a sip of tea, it was a small cup. How much tea could it hold? And why did it still look like it was full? I learned about him before I was supposed to. Hisashi Sutaku is Inko Midoriya's ex-husband. He abandoned Midoriya because of his quirk, even after making a promise to help him become a hero. The only good thing the man left behind was the blueprints to Midoriya's equipment. What kind of man makes a promise like that? How to disappear one day and not give a word until after he's dead? Mei didn't take her eyes off Izuku. His shallow breath was the only thing that told her he was still alive. Mei allowed her hand to drift to Izuku and try to rub his knuckles. However, when she got near, a small spark of static electricity jumped from his hand to her. Mei wanted to coil in pain, but the shock felt pleasant and seemed to provide her with comfort. Dearie, I need you to step back. His quirk is out of control and I don't want you to get hurt, Recovery Girl said. She had noticed the green spark, and if Mei's explanation was correct, Izuku could easily kill someone without even trying. With the green electricity that shot out of his chest only a few minutes ago, he had some electricity left in his body. Mei gave a small nod, not wanting to step away from Izuku. Yet she stepped back and sat down in a chair further from the bed, but still only a few steps away. She looked back at Power Load and Principal Nezu, noticing they were discussing something new. I assume you were not aware of the relationship when you made plans to hand over the information, Principal Nezu said, turning his attention to Power Loader. I knew he had a son, but I didn't remember his name. That was several years ago. And no, the information hasn't changed my mind. Hisashi was Midoriya's father, a father he thought had abandoned him. I think Midoriya would like to learn what his father was doing all those years after he left. We both know Hisashi had more plans than he ever told anyone, and if he left Midoriya the blueprints for his repulsors, then clearly he had more in store. Those plans now belong to Midoriya. Power Loader pulled out a flash drive and looked at it before shoving it back in his pocket. I was hoping to give it to him once school was over, but I might have to wait a bit longer. Unfortunate, but Midoriya will need to recover, Principal Nezu said, placing his cup of tea on the edge of Recovery Girl's main desk. She looked a bit annoyed, but simply flicked it, causing it to fall off the edge and into the trash bin. Principal Nezu made no move as if he didn't see it. If I remember correctly, Sutaku used Classroom 6G. Yes, he did, but it's all boarded up. It would take me half a day to pull all the wood off the door. Then there were whatever surprises he left on the other side of the doors, Power Loader said, not realizing what he was saying. Principal Nezu opened one of his vest pockets and pulled out a key of some kind. While I agree you should give Midoriya his father's notes, the information will help him become a great hero. However, information can only tell part of the story. If Midoriya is to learn what kind of man his father was, I believe it would be best to also give him this. Power Loader realized what Principal Nezu was insinuating as he looked over at the key Principal Nezu held out. Wait, that's the key to Hisashi's office. Why do you have it? As you said, Mr. Sutaku never told any one person everything. in his last months in this world, understood the knowledge he held and what was possible with it. He gave you his flash drive, yet he never believed one person should have all of his work, so he left me the key to his office. The only person he trusted with his full inventory was his own son, because the father knew his son was strong and would one day come to UA and become a hero. Principal Nezu said as he nodded to Izuku. It's now on him to decide who to tell. Wait, Izuku's father worked here at UA, Mei said, the piece clicking in her head. It made sense, Hisashi having the recourse to blueprint and build the repulsors. He won't have that at a normal job, and there was no indication he worked for another support company, or her parents would have heard about it. So working at UA within the support course was the only avenue left. He just didn't work here. He was one of the best engineering teachers. He challenged his students to build things only they could think of. He was always able to properly motivate his students, Powerloader said, reminiscing about some of the amazing things they had planned to create together. Well, this is great and all, however, Midoriya does not seem like he will be waking up for the rest of the day. Might I suggest as his homeroom teacher, you inform his mother about the situation? Recovery Girl said, always having to switch the IV bags. It seemed Izuku's body was greedily taking it all in, replacing all that he had lost in the break-in. Powerloader looked at Recovery Girl for a bit, before blinking and chuckling a bit. Yes, that sounds like something that needs to be done. Hatsum, thank you for your help, but I suggest you return to class, as the grace period will be over soon, Principal Nezu said, tapping his watch. Mei looked at Izuku. She wanted to spend the rest of the day by his side. She knew he would do the same. She also knew that he would say she shouldn't waste her time and focus on school. She hated how much of a hypocrite he was, but she knew that was the Izuku she had begun to fall in love with. Mei looked towards Principal Nezu as she stood up and nodded. She walked out of the office and headed towards her class. She tried to focus on her classes, but her mind would wander back to Izuku for the rest of the day. Luckily, it was only the second day there was much going on. Even less so with the break-in being on everyone's minds. Back in the nurse's office, Powerloader was still sitting on the floor, so Recovery Girl whacked on his head, stating, don't you have some stuff you need to do? Yeah, I'm going, Powerloader said, standing up. He brushed himself off and walked out of the room. His mind was still trying to wrap around all the information he had been given in less than an hour. Izuku Midoriya was Hisashi Sutaku's son, a man Powerloader had come to deeply respect in the field of engineering and being human. So as he walked to the support department, he had more than just a phone call plan. So Midoriya gets to learn who his father was, one of the greatest inventors of our times, able to solve any problem in front of him and make it look like simple addition and subtraction. Principal Nezu looked at Izuku with his hand behind his back. With his quirk, Principal Nezu rarely came across someone who could match his intelligence, and Hisashi was not the closest. Principal Nezu enjoyed making conversation with him. If there was one thing Principal Nezu would admit that Hisashi was the best at, it was making puzzles. Whether it is to give a hidden lesson to his student or give Principal Nezu something to think over for days. Hisashi always said it didn't matter whether a puzzle had one answer or multiple. It always changed depending on who answered. Gave a perspective on how to get the answer, something Hisashi said more engineers need when working on a project. Yes, Sutaku was extremely smart. I'm sad he was killed early in his career. The question is, when will you tell the boy about how his father died? Recovery Girl said, checking on the IV and making sure her patient was comfortable. Powerloader was a close friend of Midoriya's father and is Midoriya's teacher. I believe he should be the one to tell Midoriya the story of how Hisashi sacrificed himself to save the world. Principal Nezu continued to look at his student. It wasn't exactly a record for having a student in the recovery office so soon, yet it was a record for how quickly damage was done to school property. The previous one was 9 days, and Izuku was pushing the record for the amount of damage too. Principal Nezu recalled an old fight the support course used to have with All Might when he was a high schooler. All the third years tested their invention against the now #1 hero, and one fight resulted in the new record of 2 of the fake cities being destroyed. So while one classroom seems small, it only being on the second day, if Izuku kept his pace, he could easily beat the record. Principal Nezu looked down at the floor. He didn't think about pressing charges. He knew it was an occupational hazard when dealing with such a powerful quirk. Damage wasn't inevitable, just limited. And from what Mei said, Izuku's priority was minimizing damage. And in the end, it was the media's fault for breaking in. Something he still didn't understand the circumstances of it happening. Principal Nezu looked back at Midoriya. It was the media's fault and maybe somewhat the third year's fault for how poorly they handled the situation. He would leave that punishment to their teachers. Maybe he could give some suggestions. With that thought, Principal Nezu turned around and walked out of the room. With everything handled, Principal Nezu thought about tracking down Izuku's supplier. having that much palladium and using it freely. Either Hatsum Industries was a bigger company behind the scenes, or Izuku had an extremely wealthy relative that covered the expenses. Though Principal Nezu was not willing to rule our black market just yet, the supplier might just be fooling Izuku, and Izuku was none the wiser. This could be a fun process for Principal Nezu, and maybe in the end he could find out more about one of his close friends' son. As Powerloader walked into his office, he looked over at his desk, which held his laptop and school phone. With a sigh, Powerloader powered on his laptop and began looking through the register. He came upon Inko's phone number. He quickly punched it into his school phone, but then his finger hesitated over the call button. Calling the parents of one of his students wasn't a new thing. Accidents and injuries were common occurrences in the support course at UA High. He had several of his students' parents' numbers on speed dial. Some were even on a texting basis, as these students got injuries the most often. Yet he never had a student whose parent he knew about from a previous work relationship. Now he had never actually met Inko in person before, only hearing her voice over Hishashi's phone calls. Yet this was different from every phone call he had made in the past. Powerloader could feel his heartbeat as he looked at his phone. 5 minutes later, and his fingers still hovered over the button. A simple button that would most likely lead to a tearful conversation. Though Powerloader didn't know whether it would be from him or Inko. Powerloader closed his hand for a second, then opened it, before taking a deep breath and pressing the button. The moment the dial tone began, Powerloader swiped the receiver and held it up to his ear. With each beep, Powerloader felt his heartbeat begin to match the rhyme. After the 5th tone, the line connected and Powerloader heard Inko's voice again after 9 years. "Hello, this is Inko Midoriya. How may I help you?" Inko said. Her voice was sweeter and kind than Hisashi had ever described. Powerloader couldn't help but think, "My friend, I want to respect your life and know why you did what you did, but you really screwed up. Hello, are you there?" Inko's voice came again. Powerloader paused for a second. His mind was blank. He didn't know whether to ease into explaining everything or dive into the deep end. The first call with a parent was always the hardest, but Powerloader didn't feel like calling Inko was ever going to get easy. "Hello, Ms. Midoriya. This Powerloader, Izuku's homeroom teacher." Powerloader began. "Oh my god, is my son okay? What did my son blow up this time?" Inko asked, her voice taking on concern and worry. Powerloader clenched his teeth before saying, "Your son is okay." Making parents worry about their child was always Powerloader's least favorite part of the job. "I don't like how that sounds," Inko said. Her voice was no longer sweet, more like a police officer trying to force information out of someone. Powerloader felt like he was standing at gunpoint. "I can see where your comment about her being a mom bear came from, Hisashi." She went straight to it. Powerloader didn't know how to break it to Inko. He didn't want to make it seem like her son was in danger or that UA was the one that put him in danger. "Ms. Midoriya, are you familiar with the issue that your son's quirk causes him when he becomes panicked?" "Yes. His arc reactor becomes overloaded and begins to discharge energy in the form of lightning," Inko said, with such a knowledgeable voice. Powerloader thought he was talking to an actual engineer. He figured that happens when you marry one, you start to sound like one. "Understood. And are you aware of what happens if your son does not have his arc reactor within that state?" Powerloader asked. If he was lucky, he didn't have to explain everything. "No, I am not. Izuku always wears his arc reactor. He always has it on. Sometimes I think it's fused to his chest." Inko paused for a bit, then asked, "What happened?" "There was a panic at the school. Nothing to worry about. The issue was handled quickly. Yet the students in the lunch hall were caught unaware and it caused a bit of a panic. Your son's friend, Meihatsum, explained the situation better. Your son knew he was beginning to overload his arc reactor, but he was more afraid of hurting the student around him. He disconnected his arc reactor to prevent it from discharging itself, in turn forcing the static electricity to build up in his body. Your son managed to hold on long enough for Hatsum to get him out of the building into the support department. We locked him in an empty classroom, which allowed him to discharge over 1,000 gigajoules of electricity," Powerloader said, restating Mei's explanation from earlier. "You lost me a bit." Inko's voice still had concern, but now a tad bit of confusion lined in. Hatsum explained that when your son discharges electricity in such a way, it causes him great pain and exhaustion. He is currently being watched over by UAS Pro Hero Nurse, Recovery Girl. However, due to his extreme level of exhaustion, she is not able to use her quirk on him without causing him further pain. Powerloader figured Inko was sitting down at this point. However, a loud crash on wood told Powerloader she had just fallen. "Madam, are you okay?" Powerloader could hear her crying over the phone, "So that the waterworks, you were always talking about Hisashi." "Madam, I want you to understand that your son is fine and is being taken care of. He is currently asleep and recovering, and he's expected to wake up by tomorrow morning." Powerloader lied about that last part because he knew what Inko needed to hear. "Powerloader, is my son okay?" Inko said she had to know. At the moment it was the only thing she cared about. Yes. How long until school gets out? Inko asked, her voice still filled with worry, but now it was firm. All she cared about was protecting her son. Powerloader looked at the clock on his phone. School gets out in 3 hours. Good, I'll be there to see my son. With that, the phone call ended. Powerloader looked at his phone for a bit, trying to make sense of what just happened. His mind wandered to one of the first times they were able to get away from UA after Hisashi left Inko and Izuku. They had gone out late to drink and Hisashi began to talk about Inko. I can't think what story my wife will tell my son. In the beginning, I knew they were safe and I could love them. But now I'm in so deep, the only way I can protect them is to leave them behind. I still want to help my son become the hero I know he can become. Hisashi leaned on the top of the bar. His drink lazily rested in his hand. Hisashi, I think that when the time comes, you'll be able to return to your wife and kid and repay for the times you've lost to protect them, Powerloader said, trying to cheer up his friend. Honestly, at this point, I don't even care if the other teachers find out. I don't care if I have to do things outside of the law. I just want to protect my wife and son and make sure they have a bright future. Hisashi took a long drink of his drink. I'm just afraid when I do return whatever lie or story Inko told Izuku to make him forget about me. I just hope I'll be able to show him what kind of father I always wanted to be. Powerloader closed his phone. He didn't have any more classes for the day. He would have time to do this, and it was clear Principal Nezu had plans to do it within the next few days. Powerloader stood up and walked over to his workbench, a crowbar already waiting for him. Powerloader swiped the crowbar on the workbench and headed out of his office. As he walked down the hallway, all his attention turned to Class 6G, the most dangerous room in all of UA, and several of the rooms had reputations. Yet while other rooms could hurt harm or injury, the equipment and technology that rested in Classroom 6G were world-ending. To most teachers, it was a simple old classroom that belonged to an old teacher. The reason it was boarded up was different depending on which teacher was asking. But only Powerloader, Principal Nezu, and Recovery Girl knew the real reason. And the fact the boards were a facade, then real security was whatever Hayashi had built into the doors. A security program so advanced and complex, Powerloader couldn't dismantle it nor could Principal Nezu hack into it. And what was hidden behind the door? Technological advancements that could shift the world's control to anyone that could get their hands on it. Engineering advancement Hisashi had made in his quest to turn his son into a hero. Devices even nowadays could only exist in the wildest dreams of engineers. Well, that's at least what Powerloader thought, as not even he had seen the kind of work Hisashi set his free time on. Why less would the door be boarded up? As the door to Classroom 6G appeared, Powerloader brought his crowbar up and then rammed it into the first board. With some effort, Powerloader ripped the first board off and let fall to the ground. As Powerloader worked on the second board, he could only think, Hisashi, I'll make sure your son knows what you did and sacrificed for him. Over the next 2.5 hours, Powerloader worked to rip all the nails out of the barred door. Once the last nail came out and the last board fell in next to the floor, Powerloader stopped and took a deep breath. Ripping the nails out felt like reopening an old wound, something Powerloader wished he could forget about. Yet he knew if he didn't he would be disrespecting Hisashi's memory. Powerloader took a deep breath and then fell to his knees. I assume you've spoken with Ms. Midoriya then. Principal Nezu announced his presence with that statement. Yeah, she'll be arriving within the next 2 hours to see her son. Powerloader let go of the crowbar, allowing it to fall onto the wood it had just pulled off the wall. Hisashi always said Inko cared about her son more than we could ever understand. Principal Nezu said, I'll be at the front gate to greet her. No need to start another panic. Yeah, that's what got us into this mess. Powerloader grumbled a bit. Would you like that honor? Principal Nezu said, pulling out the key. He held it out, holding it by the metal key ring. Powerloader was tempted to take the key and open the door. However, everything in that room was left for Inko and Midori. I think they should be the ones to unlock the door and see for themselves what Hisashi has done for them. Principal Nezu flipped the key back into his paw. I'm glad you agree. Principal Nezu left Powerloader by himself at the door. Once Inko had ended the call with Powerloader, she wanted to walk into her boss's office and asked to leave early. Her boss owes her a million favors, as after she got hired as his accountant, the first matter of business she took care of was getting all of his company's finances in order. Her boss liked to joke she was the reason his business was still afloat, but she forced herself to refocus on work and not allow herself to get distracted. Izuku had been in dangerous situations before, whenever he tested one of Mei's less than safe inventions, and Powerloader reassured her that Izuku was fine and safe, if not a little banged up, but that was expected of teenage boys. But whenever she stepped away to take a breath, she found her mind wandering back to the call she had with Powerloader. She was looking over an order of advanced AI processed chips that had been created for a military project when a knock came on her doors. It's open, Inko said. The door opened, sliding across the smooth oak floor of her office, and in walked her boss. He was stroked his white beard, as it reflected the overhead light. How are you, Ms. Midoriya? I heard you fell not too long ago. I'm fine. I got a call from my son's school. He was a bit injured and I was a little concerned, Inko said. She tried her best not to sound panicky, but it appeared in her voice. A bit injured and little concerned don't usually result in someone falling to the floor, Inko's boss said, as he walked over and leaned over the chair that faced Inko's desk. Inko chuckled a bit. I guess not. There was a break-in and it caused some panic. My son lost a bit of control of his quirk and in the end, he injured himself to keep it from injuring the other students. Shows like he's quite the hero. He does go to UA if I'm not mistaken, Inko's boss said as he moved around the chair and sat down across from Inko. Yes, he was hoping to get into the hero course but was accepted into the support course. I will admit I was glad he would not be in direct danger as he would be in the hero course, but it seems like just being at the school will get him into danger. Inko would never say it out loud, but she was glad when Izuku wasn't accepted into the hero course. Her son won't be in direct danger, but clearly, fate had a twisted sense of humor. He's a strong kid, but if you would like to leave early, I'll understand, Inko's boss said with kind eyes and a gentle voice. No, I'm fine. I'll leave when his school gets out. Besides, this is a project you've spent the last 4 years working on. I'll be fine, Inko said as she reached forward to her keyboard to finish looking over the order. Inko's boss held his hand up defensively. I understand, and that's why I'm glad I hired you. You love your son so much. He stood up and began to walk out. Mr. Sutin, thanks for understanding, Inko said. My pleasure. But as you said, I've been working on this project for 4 years. If you need to leave, I'm sure the project can wait a few more hours, Mr. Sutin said, before walking out and closing the door. As he walked down the hallway, his cell phone went off. It was a blocked number, but he answered it and opened with, I heard the break-in was successful. It was. My apprentice handled the security system with ease and your authorization key allowed us to break into UAS more secure servers. The plan in a week, a cold voice said. Were you able to locate the file of the power source? Mr. Sutin asked. It seems UA was no closer to finding a power source than you were. We'll send you what we got. Hopefully, it will help you. Will your prototype be ready? The cold voice asked on the other side. You might work in biology, but engineering is an art form. It's more than trial and error. It took Hisashi Sutaku years to build his masterpiece. If you were able to copy the information I needed off of UAS server, then I can build it within days. Then Hisashi Sutaku will see what kind of power his creations could have given him. Mr. Sutin ended the call and dropped his phone into his pocket. Izuku slowly opened his eyes. The blind light of the room was harsh against his vision. Slowly the room came into focus and he saw it was a medical-style room. Where am I? Izuku said, then felt his extremely dry throat. You are my office, the medical section of UA. Good afternoon, Midoriya. You gave us quite the scare after you burned that room, an elderly voice said. Izuku thought about where he had released his quirk. He had passed out before he got a look at the room. Is everyone okay? Your friend Mei Hatsune got you to the support department where Powerloader used the advanced fire suppression system installed there. Izuku looked over and recognized the nurse as Recovery Girl. If he wasn't so tired and thirsty, he would have requested an autograph. Recovery Girl walked over and held a glass to his lip. I used 5 IV bags on you, but your body is still going to be sore. I went through 5 IV bags in just a few hours, Izuku asked after a few sips. The water felt going down, but it caused him to cough a bit. Few hours? You've been asleep a lot longer than a few hours, Recovery Girl said, lifting her cane and tapping it against a clock on the wall. Izuku looked at the clock. It read 3:58. But you said good afternoon. Izuku was extremely confused now. Of the next day. You were passed out for a little over 25 hours. You didn't miss much. It's still the first week of school. A knock came on the door. And your mother is here. My mother, Izuku nearly yelled, wanting to hide from the wrath of his mother. He knew her worry could easily become fury. Yet in his tired state, he could barely move a finger. Recovery Girl walked over to the door and opened it. Outside were Inko, Midoriya, Hatsune, Powerloader, and Principal Nezu. Inko locked eyes with her son before rushing into the room, nearly knocking Recovery Girl over. Once she got to her son, she wrapped him into a tight hug, causing Izuku to give out a small squeak of pain. Mom, still sore. However, Inko just tightened her hold on her son. Well, this is a lovely family reunion, Principal Nezu said, calming, walking into the room, with Powerloader and Mei behind him. Mei walked up and gave Izuku a small hug, then whispered in his ear, your mother agrees with me. The next time you do something like that, we'll kill you. Izuku flinched at the statement because he knew it was true, and the police would never find his body. Midoriya, while I'm glad you were able to assess the situation and choose the option that harmed the least amount of people, I hate to see you make those kinds of choices at the expense of yourself. You are my student, and it is not only my job to teach you, but to make sure you stay safe, Powerloader said, looking Izuku in the eyes. Izuku was confused at the last part of the Powerloader statement. What do you mean to stay safe? I'm in the support course, and the worst thing I experience is Mei's exploding inventions. Mei would have smacked Izuku, but then again she didn't attack poor defenseless things. After a few moments, Power Loader sighed, "You're going to need a wheelchair." "I can walk," Izuku said and began to lift himself off the bed. "No, you cannot." Inko, Mei and Recovery Girl all shouted. Izuku slowly lowered himself back into the bed, surrendering to them. "Midoriya, you have been unconscious for the last 25 hours. Your muscles are weak and you have no energy to burn. If you want to leave this room, it will be in a wheelchair," the Recovery Girl said. Izuku looked between the three women in the room, then sighed, admitting defeat. "Fine, I'll take the wheelchair." At that moment he would do anything to get out of this room. "Good, I'll send a message to Lunch Rush to prepare you something light to eat on the way," Principal Nezu said, then pulled out his phone. Recovery Girl disappeared, to return shortly with a wheelchair that had a foldable tray on its side. Recovery Girl and Mei helped Izuku into the wheelchair, and then Inko grabbed the handle on the back. While Inko pushed her son in the wheelchair, Mei, Power Loader, and Principal Nezu followed behind. As they passed the lunch room, Lunch Rush stepped out and gave Izuku a small tray of food. Izuku thanked Lunch Rush, who excused himself. As they continued through the school, Izuku slowly ate the food he had been given. When they got out to the front, Power Loader directed them over to the support department. Once they arrived, everyone waited for Power Loader to unlock the front door. However, Power Loader paused and looked at Inko and asked, "Ms. Midoriya, I mean no disrespect, but how exactly did you teach your son to view his father?" Inko froze at the question. She wasn't expecting to be interrogated. "Well, when my husband first left, he explained he was going to go look for a solution to Izuku's problem with his quirk. In the beginning, he would return every other day. Soon that was only twice a week. Then eventually once a month, then after a bit, he disappeared. He never texted, never called, and never came home. I thought he had abandoned our son because he saw Izuku as useless. A month before he died, he sent me a box full of his old college textbooks and some blueprints. I just shoved them into the closet and forgot about them," Inko explained. "Until I met Mei and you gave them to me," Izuku said, as he looked over his shoulder at his mom. "Yes," Inko nodded in agreement. Power Loader nodded and locked the door. "Thank you, Ms. Midoriya. You thought your husband had abandoned you, but you couldn't be further from the truth. You see, your husband was always working towards a solution for your son's quirk. It's just 2 years after he started working on the issue, he began to use less than savory means to get material to find the solution. He met with the wrong people. He did things he wasn't always proud of, but he kept working until he had a solution for his son. It was because of these people that he distanced himself from you. They were the kind of people that would use anything for leverage." Power Loader stopped in front of room 6G. "How do you know this?" Izuku asked. "Your father needed a safe place to work and someone that could help him build. We had crossed paths before and he came to UA to consult me. Principal Nezu met with him and offered him a safe place to work, as long as he acted as a teacher alongside me," Power Loader said. "You knew my father?" Izuku asked. He couldn't believe that his father had the chance to work alongside actual pro heroes. "Yes, we became great friends. I and Principal Nezu were the only two people he would talk to about you too. He always said he loved you, Izuku, and he always wanted you to know what kind of man he was. He was the kind of man that would do anything to help his son become a hero." Power Loader pulled out the key to the room and handed it to Izuku. "This was your father's classroom. In the last few months before he died, he spent most of his time there. We have no idea what he was building. All we knew was it was for you." Izuku nodded, then leaned forwards and slid the key into the lock. He looked at the lock. Everything he knew about his father was wrong. His father loved him and sacrificed his life to keep Inko and Izuku safe. He had left his life's work to his. Izuku took a deep breath and then twisted the key. After a few seconds, nothing happened. "Thanks, Dad. You left me with a broken and permanently locked door." Izuku sighed. "Handprint verification," a British-sounding voice said. What?" everyone said. None of them was expecting this. Power Loader and Principal Nezu looked at each other. "Did you know about this?" they asked at the same time. "Handprint verification," the voice asked again. Izuku looked around the door but didn't find any kind of scanner. Mei suddenly leaned forwards, her face getting close to one of the sections of the door. She suddenly grabbed Izuku's hand and held it across the door. "What are you doing?" Izuku asked, but he had no strength to pull his hand out of Mei's grip. Suddenly the piece of the door grew a light blue and hummed, "Handprint verified. Welcome, Izuku Midoriya. 2 more handprint verification needed." Everyone tilted their heads in confusion. "I'm guessing either myself, Principal, or Ms. Midoriya," Power Loader said. Izuku withdrew her hand and Inko pressed her hand against the door. "Handprint verified. Welcome, Ice Princess. 2 more handprint verification needed." "Ice Princess?" Izuku asked. He looked up and saw that Inko had a small grin on her face, as if she was thinking about distant memories. Your father used to call me that because he said my stare was cold as ice. I'm in the system but not authorized. Inko said. Your husband must have not thought you would be here at the open, Powerloader said, offering an explanation. Principal Nezu walked forwards and scanned his paw. Handprint verified. Welcome Tic-Tac. Nezu began to chuckle. That's what your father called me when we first met. He said I looked like a white Tic-Tac. One more handprint verification needed. Everyone looked at Powerloader. He was the only obvious person left. I guess that means me. Powerloader walked forwards and scanned his hand. Handprint verified. Welcome Point Break. Powerloader was fully ready to break down the door. He balled his fist and said, Damn you Sutaku. Inko started chuckling, while Powerloader had murder in his eyes. I always hated Hisashi's nicknames. Powerloader tapped his fingers against the screen, causing small cracking. He knew he was going to break something later, but for now, he was satisfied. The door hissed and began to split apart, sliding to allow access. Inko grabbed a hold of Izuku's wheelchair. However, he stopped her. He grabbed the bars on the wheels and rolled himself in. He rolled into a pitch-black, dusty room. Izuku felt like he was breathing in dirt, with all of the dust that was in the room. Izuku coughed, then waved in front of his face. It's dusty. Well, it has been boarded up for a while. Powerloader pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. It didn't matter too much, as the dust caught most of the light. Now we just have to find the light switch. Everyone else pulled out their phone and used the flashlight and began to look for the light switch. I can't even use my quirk here, the dust blocks everything. They complained, coughing on some dust. I believe I have some that may help with the dust situation. Principal Nezu pulled out his phone and began typing. After a few minutes, the sounds of air conditioning filled the room. Hold your breath and close your eyes, Powerloader said. Within a few seconds, it felt like a mini sandstorm had entered the room. The air conditioning pushed the dust around until it slowly flowed out of the open door. After a few minutes, the dust storm had disappeared and May was quick to find the light switch. She flicked it up and the ceiling light flickered to life. Some were burnt out, but enough light was provided by those that still worked. Everyone looked around and saw it was a regular classroom, with a few desks and chairs pushed up towards the front of the room. So this is what my father left me, an empty, dusty old classroom. I'm a little disappointed. Izuku sighed. He didn't know what he was expecting, but he was hoping for a bit more. Beginning, track 1. The voice said, and 4 hidden projectors came to life. They were pointed at the center of the room. When an image came into focus, Inko recognized it was Hisashi. Hisashi, Inko said, Hello, my dear. I'm afraid this is a mere recording that I have left behind in the chance that I am killed before I am able to explain anything. The hologram said, then turned and looked at Izuku, my son. I am proud that you were able to make it to UA, and no matter which course it was, whether it was hero and support, I am proud that you followed your dreams of becoming a hero. Izuku rubbed the back of his head in embarrassment. Thanks, Dad. I'm sure Powerloader and Principal Nezu have explained a bit of what I did here, the kind of people I met and the things I did. If they haven't, please locate track 68. But know that everything I did was in hopes of being able to help you. The hologram of Hisashi paused. Would you like to play track 68? The voice asked. No, continue with track 1, Izuku said, and the hologram resumed. You are currently standing within classroom 6G, my own room that I used to teach and invent. I used many means to get a hold of machinery to invent new things, but not all were through legal means. Principal Nezu and Powerloader were generous enough to keep their mouths shut, but as I continued my work, the HPSC began to poke their heads into my work, and if they learned what I invented or the means I got the material for them, I would have never got the chance to finish it. I did all I could to make sure they or anyone with ill intention could never find my work. The vault's doors were merely the first step of security. To find the rest, I have a simple question for you, Izuku. What is the greatest kind of weapon? Izuku thought for a moment, then remembered something he used to hear his father say. While most people would say the kind you never have to fire out, you disagree. You always prefer the weapon you only have to fire once. The hologram of Hisashi smiled. As walls and floor tiles began to shift, everything an inventor would ever need began appearing in the room. Let me be the first to welcome you to Candleland. Now become the hero I know you can be. Welcome to your hero academia. The hologram of Hisashi disappeared and May fell over to the floor. Oh my god, she muttered over and over again. I think her motherboard got fried, Izuku said, noticing the concerned look on his mother's face. Powerloader looked around the room. He had stars in his eyes. You're lucky you're dead, Hisashi. Can't believe you were hiding this from me. Holo tables, industrial 3D printers and scanners, artificial intelligence. Hello, my name is Jebisu. The voice introduced himself. I was created by Mr. Hisashi Sutaku to help handle the large amount of data generated from his many projects. My last instruction given to me by him was to help one Izuku Midoriya, the one he referred to as his son, Jebisu. What exactly was my father working on for me? Izuku asked. Accessing Project Hero armor, Jebisu said. And the holo table flickered. A model of suit armor similar to Crimson Dynamo floated above the holo table. It was slim and barely taller than the average teenager. Everyone looked over the design. Izuku noticed the armor head repulsor on the palms. What exactly was Project Hero armor? Created by Hisashi Sutaku. Project Hero armor was an advanced exoskeleton housing and multifunctional internal weapons system, more compact than anything military branches had, all protected by an external plated armor designed to be worn and act as a weapon and shield. Jebisu stated. Is this design manipulable? Izuku asked. Yes, Jebisu said. Izuku raised his finger and pinched the outer layer of the armor with his thumb and index. He moved his hand to the side and the armor followed it, leaving the weapons system and exoskeleton together. Izuku quickly separated those, leaving the three main components of the suit by themselves. The exoskeleton looked extremely familiar to Izuku. Hey Mei, what does that look like to you? Mei looked over the exoskeleton, then her eyes went wide. That looks like your boots and gauntlets. The repulsor technology is identical. Mei looked at the armor and weapon system. It seems like your father had more plans than we thought. The holograms were extremely detailed and Izuku almost felt he should call it a work of art. Jebisu, did my father have a working prototype of this suit? Records state Hisashi Sutaku constructed a working prototype. However, he ran into an issue of power source. Jebisu said as the center chest piece of the armor glowed a bit, indicating where the power source was supposed to go. What do you mean records state? Are you unable to locate the files? They asked. I have checked my databases and found mention of the files. However, the files were recently corrupted, Jebisu stated. How recent? Powerloader asked. He had a sick feeling in his gut. Files were corrupted 25 hours, 7 minutes and 45 seconds ago. Jebisu stated. Powerloader cursed under his breath then said, that's when the break-in happened. Someone used the chaos to break in and hack into our servers. Principal Nezu raised his hand. Jebisu, are you linked to the main UA servers? Yes. However, my main files are only accessible under Hisashi Sutaku's login. My senses registered his login being used 25 hours and 8 minutes ago. The UA staff computers located and copied files for Project Hero armor. After files were copied, a virus was released and corrupted most files relating to the project. Can you show us what is left of the corrupted files? Izuku asked. The three components moved to the side. Then the holo table was filled with broken images. Izuku recognized a bit of the repulsor in the hover boots. So what I have left of my father's work with several 1,000 gigabytes of corrupted data. I won't state that. Powerloader raised his hand and began sifting through the corrupted data. The history of the files are still recorded, meaning some reference to your father's work remains. If none did, then Jebisu wouldn't know about Project Hero armor. So you simply have to find what's left. Powerloader located a file that was barely corrupted. It was marked as Mark I, and work from there. Mark I looks like I'm starting from the beginning. Izuku said. Jebisu, delete all corrupted files, leaving only Mark I behind. Powerloader said the corrupted files disappeared, leaving only the file Mark I left. Open Mark I file. The file covered the holo tables, a bit corrupt and hard to examine. However, the main files of the exoskeleton and the armor were fine. The weapon system was hazy. Yes, you're starting from the beginning, the very beginning. Thank you, Powerloader, and you too, Principal Nezu. Thanks to you I can begin to understand what my father was doing. Izuku turned his chair and looked up at Powerloader. Now what did you mean by keeping me safe? Powerloader took a few moments before he spoke. Because of your actions during the hero exam. Your repulsors got damaged, causing you to lose your ability to gain points. However, your actions against the 0 point, the fact you were doing so to recuse a now hero student, impressed several teachers. Your score was still too low to be considered, so now you're in the support class. I talked with the hero teachers and they agreed that if you managed to impress them during the sports festival, and then passed the hero midterm exam, you could be transferred to the hero course. Izuku's eyes beamed at Powerloader's words. I wanted to give your father's notes in hopes that it could help you towards that goal. This flash drive doesn't hold as much as the servers did, but I wanted to help you as much as possible. Powerloader pulled out the flash drive and hung his head low. Izuku could see the sadness through Powerloader's mask. Izuku gripped the armrest of his wheelchair and hauled himself to his feet. Inko moved to help him, but Izuku raised a hand to stop her. My father worked to the end of his life to do all that he could to help me. Now most of his work is corrupted, so I'm willing to accept any form of help I can get. I don't care how little that flash drive holds. If it will help me, I'll use it to the best of my ability. Powerloader met Izuku and for a second saw the same confident smile that Hisashi always wore when he got something to work. My father built this by himself and it took him years. This time it should go by much more quickly with 3 people working together. Powerloader smiled then said, wait, 3 people? Who's the third? Izuku pointed over his shoulder at Mei. who had yet to take her eyes off the hero armor. She was studying the details of the exoskeleton. She won't forgive me if I don't allow her to help. Powerloader looked at the devilish look Mei had on her face. She looked ready to kill something. I think that would be for the best. Mr. Midoriya, I look forward to seeing you continue your father's work, Principal Nezu said. And while this room is no longer in use, it is still technically a classroom and can only be used after school hours with the proper authorization. How about we move this conversation to my office where we can fill out the proper docs to allow you to have access to this room? Not like anyone besides Midoriya will be able to get into this room. Powerloader mumbled under his breath. He hated that Principal Nezu made everything be done responsibly even when it was absolutely unnecessary. I'm sorry. What was that? Nothing, sir, Powerloader said. Principal Nezu nodded, then turned and headed towards the door. Oh, Mr. Midoriya, I believe you should withdraw Ms. Hatsume from the holo table. She seemed to be in a trance of some kind. Izuku looked over and saw Mei's eyes starting to glaze over. Izuku wheeled himself over and grabbed her hand. Hatsume. She made no movement. Izuku raised his hand and snapped his fingers in front of her eyes. Still no movement. Izuku sighed. He had done this a million times before. Whenever Mei got hyper-focused on something, the world around her disappeared and it was up to Izuku to basically turn her off and turn her back on. Izuku pinched Mei's nose close, then held a hand over her mouth. A few seconds went by, and then Mei's eyes bulged. She began to try to pry Izuku's hand off her face, but Izuku held for a few more seconds then finally let go. You nearly made me pass out this time, Mei yelled. Better to teach you then, Izuku said. Whatever. The group made their way to Principal Nezu's office where they signed the permission slip for Izuku to have access to Classroom 6G. Compared to where he was only a few months ago, Gaizan Hisahito could say being at UA was a massive improvement for him. He was finally going to a normal school, just not for a normal reason, and it had been easy to get in, despite what Gaizan had heard. The entrance exam was quite easy. It was made easier that Gaizan's quirks did help a bit so he didn't take damage from the robots and he was able to destroy most of them with only a few punches. And with all the training he had as a kid, he was able to handle himself and not get distracted as many examinees he passed did so. He didn't second-guess himself or his action. As soon as the bell sounded, he drove head first to find his first point. Then came the zero-pointer. It was easy to see why no one ever went after it. It was as tall as some of the buildings and looked powerful. Though Gizo always loved a challenge, he built up as much energy as he could falling as building, and while his punch didn't match the zero-pointers, the energy Gaizan gained but blocking it. Gaizan happily returned the favor and returned the force upon the zero-pointer, ripping its entire arm off. That along with all the villain and rescue points, Gaizan easily got the top spot in the ranking and generated that Gaizan could leave his old life in the dark. Though he wasn't the only one, he heard an examinee from a different group had also destroyed their zero-pointer. However, when Gaizan asked his fellow classmates of 1A and those of 1B, none claimed to be the student that had done so, which he found strange. He wasn't boasting he had been the second student to do so. He figured at least one student would claim to be the other one, even if they were lying. Then came Mr. Aizawa's quirk assessment, and Gaizan immediately knew that while the threat of expulsion was false, Mr. Aizawa was more than ready to make good on it. Though Gaizan couldn't figure out on what basis Mr. Aizawa was truly grading everyone. And along with that, Gaizan started to butt heads with two of his fellow students. The first was Minoru Mainta, and the fact he was ogling the girl every time he looked over at him. That was something Gaizan decided to put off for later. The second was Katsuki Bakugo, and it came after the throw ball. Gaizan was called out by Mr. Aizawa for holding back with his quirk, something that Bakugo didn't seem to like as Gaizan had nearly matched his score. Bakugo rushed Gaizan and looked ready to attack. And as Gaizan shifted to defend himself, Mr. Aizawa used his capture tool to restrain Bakugo. Seeing the yellow goggles under Mr. Aizawa's scarf, Gaizan recognized him as the pro-hero Eraserhead. Though he stayed silent about identifying his teacher for personal reasons, Mr. Aizawa threatened to give Bakugo detention if he acted, while Gaizan saw an opportunity to give Mr. Aizawa what he wanted. Gaizan turned to Mr. Aizawa and said, "Actually, I don't mind. It would help with my quirk." That got everyone's attention, confused about what Gaizan was getting at. Mr. Aizawa looked at Gaizan, who shrugged his shoulders and then nodded. Bakugo grinned as Mr. Aizawa released him. "You're even better than the damn nerd. You know your place. Just not in the face," Gaizan said as he stepped back from Bakugo. "I do whatever the hell I want," Bakugo said as he lifted his hand and unleashed an explosion right in Gaizan's face. Bakugo expected Gaizan to fall backwards onto the ground, but he just waved the smoke away. He then calmly held out a hand for a new ball that Mr. Aizawa tossed to him. Gaizan then returned around and shifted into a pitcher's stance, then took a small step forwards and threw the ball. It sailed through the air, and Gaizan knew it was going to go further than Bakugo threw. As though Bakugo's attack wasn't as strong as the one he used to throw the ball, Gaizan had a workaround and didn't even look when Mr. Aizawa showed off his score. Thanks for the assist, Gaizan said, then walked back to the rest of the class. He couldn't figure out why, but he could feel Bakugo glaring into his soul. He wasn't the only one to beat Bakugo's throw. Momoye Urazu blew all of their scores out of the water. Though as Gaizan stood there, he figured it out. Bakugo was like so many that Gaizan had met over his life. The only thing he cared for was his quirk. He only cared if it was powerful, and the most powerful, and what Gaizan had just done showed that Bakugo's quirk did nothing to him. Gaizan would have to get Bakugo out of that mindset, or it could lead to a dangerous path, one that Gaizan saw destroy lives. However, that is not to say it was going to be easy, as Bakugo returned the favor during All Might's first class. And while all of his classmates cheered at being able to meet the symbol of peace, Gaizan just gave a small clap. Even now Gaizan could still remember the power he had held for a split second. He had faced Bakugo by himself, leaving Ochako Uraraka to deal with Tenya Ilda. Gaizan held Bakugo in combat long enough that Bakugo was smart enough to know he had to switch from fighting Gaizan to try and get back to defending the bomb. That told Gaizan that Bakugo wasn't as far gone as he thought. However, Gaizan wanted to win the exercise and became like a brick wall and kept Bakugo from retreating too far. Within the last minute, Bakugo chose to retort to his grenade-shaped gauntlet. Not wanting to let the explosion damage the building too much, Gaizan got close and took the attack near point-blank range. He was thrown back and through several walls, before after catching his breath and pulling himself out of a hole in the wall, Gaizan landed on his foot with a thud that shook the entire building. Imbuing his quirk with all the energy he had absorbed, Gaizan pulled off his burning UA gym shirt and faced Bakugo. With his eyes glowing and a golden biblical light forming around him, Gaizan shifted his weight to launch himself back in Bakugo. With a yell, Gaizan pushed off the ground and was flying straight towards Bakugo. Yet that push was enough to put too much staring on Gaizan's body and mind. And just as he was about to throw the punch, Gaizan passed out and fell to the ground. When he woke, he had been informed his team had lost. Ochako explained from her perspective the entire building pulsed yellow, then the floor began to disintegrate. This caused everyone to lose their footing and fall to the ground floor, resulting in Ochako not reaching the bomb in time. Gaizan was ticked, of course, but soon that was in the back of his mind. But winning one hero class wasn't that important to his end goal, so his mind focused elsewhere, and soon the day was at the back of his mind. The next day started with the class voting for the class president and vice president. Many people had voted for him, bringing up how he had acted during All Might's class, his quick decision-making, and how it led to a heroic stand against a villain. He thanked them, but he quickly handed it over to Ilda, making Tenya Ilda class president and Momoye Urazu vice president. Gaizan was confident in his choice to hand over the responsibility to Ilda, even more so with how he handled the panic during lunch. The announcement of the break-in sent everyone into panic. Yet as Gaizan wasn't too concerned, he didn't get up from his chair and continued to eat his lunch. He listened as Ilda announced it was the media, and everyone slowly went to their classroom. He continued to eat his lunch until lunch was supposed to be over, and then went back to class WhatIf for heroic. In the classroom, he just nodded to Ilda and then headed over to his desk. And now a week later, class WhatIf was heading to an out-of-campus training faculty. As the class rode a bus, everyone talked about how they were excited about rescue training. However, Gaizan was still thinking about how the media could have gotten through the UA gate. The gate hadn't simply been destroyed. It looked like parts of it had been disintegrated. Your quirk is a lot like All Might, Tsuyu suddenly said, pulling Gaizan from his thoughts. It took a moment for Gaizan to realize she was talking to him. What are you talking about? My quirk is nothing like All Might's, Gaizan said as he looked down the middle aisle at Tsuyu. You both seem to have extreme super strength from seemingly nowhere, Tsuyu said as she stared back at Gaizan. The other WhatIf members stopped their conversation to listen to Gaizan's response. Tsuyu, Gaizan began. I told you to call Tsu, Tsuyu said, cutting Gaizan off. Gaizan sighed, then spoke with more conviction. Tsuyu, I can promise you All Might and my quirk are nothing alike. Though that would be cool, they are not. Though Gaizan was curious how close he could get to that statement. His quirk could hold a lot of energy, so maybe seeing how he compared to All Might might help with a personal matter. Yeah, you both have super strength, but All Might's quirk doesn't do that little light show or cause him to pass out from overuse. Though you're manly for withstanding Bakugo's attack last week, Kirishima said as Bakugo growled. Gaizan noticed Todoroki giving him a bit of a side eye, but he didn't give it much attention. What the son of the number 2 hero could be thinking, Gaizan wanted no part in. If Todoroki was anything like his father, Gaizan was fine with staying as classmates and nothing else. Still, you've got a flashy quirk that will help you become a popular pro hero. Along with Bakugo and Todoroki, you've 3 got pro hero material quirks. There's not much I can do with a simple hardening quirk, Kirishima said, holding up an arm and his forearm turning into rock. It earned you a spot in Japan's #1 hero school, so it got to be worth something. You can become the ultimate shield. Nothing will be able to get past you, Gaizan said as he looked over at Kirishima's arm. Quiet down, we're here, Mr. Aizawa said. After a minute the bus slowed down to a stop and everyone filed off the bus. Now Gaizan was standing in front of the unforeseen simulation joint. Ochako asked why he wasn't wearing his hero costume, something he hadn't also worn during training yesterday, despite everyone having chosen to wear their costumes. However, before he could answer them, 13 had walked out, causing Ochako to start bouncing. Gaizan had to place his hand on her shoulder to hold her down and make her stop jumping. I can't believe it's 13. She's my favorite hero. I can't believe she's going to teach us, Ochako said. She was still bouncing under Gaizan's hand, but not as much. Welcome Class 1 to the Unforeseen Simulation Joint, otherwise known as the USJ, 13 said, giving a small bow. Gaizan couldn't help but compare it to Universal Studios Japan and wonder if they had ever sued. Movie companies were quite protective of their image. Now before we begin there is a thing I would like to say. Okay, maybe 2 or 3. Actually 13 said, and Gaizan internally groaned as the number got bigger, but eventually 13 made her point about how quirks could be dangerous and heroes all have to know when they limit their quirks and manage control over it. Gaizan couldn't help as he had some personal experiences about losing control over his quirk and seeing it multiple times, people gaining quirks and having to struggle having to learn how to control them. Power was dangerous. Power left unchecked was disastrous. Power left uncontrolled was detrimental to the user. With her warning over, 13 continued with, I can't wait to show you what's inside. Follow me. The students of Class 1 followed the 2 pro heroes inside. Inside there were several different environments. Kirishima commented it looked like an amusement park. Inside the USJ you will find many different environments that can be caused by natural disasters or villain attacks. Shipwrecks, landslides, fire and deep caverns are just a few that can be found here. This facility was created to teach how to handle these environments during rescue operations. While many heroes focus on combat and fighting, recuse is just as important. Quirks can be used in many different ways, some you may never have thought of. Mr. Aizawa's assessment taught you where your current power level is. All Might Hero class will teach you how to fight against those who seek to harm others. Here in my class, you will learn how it feels to fight against Mother Nature. And here I thought it wasn't nice to mess with Mother Nature and her judgment, Gaizan said, earning a few chuckles from the students that heard him. Gaizan decided not to tell them about how he had crossed paths with a woman whose quirk gave her control over the earth and she was known as Mother Nature. Mr. Aizawa looked around the entrance and noticed that someone was missing. He turned to 13 and whispered, Where's All Might? I thought he was supposed to be here waiting for us. 13 turned to Mr. Aizawa and leaned in. With all of Class 1 still taking in the sights, she whispered, apparently he used up all of his time on the way to work this morning. It was all over the news, 20 different incidents within an hour. That man is the height of responsibility. Fine, so where is he right now? Mr. Aizawa knew the only reason All Might was supposed to be here was because Principal Nezu suspected a villain was behind last week's break-in. The official report was a person within the media, but as admitting to being the one that destroyed the gate would mean losing jobs and reputation, all of the new outlets said they were silent about it. But there was even worse news as Principal Nezu shared with the teacher that the break-in had been to steal information. The assailant had hacked into the server of an old teacher who had a hand in most of UA. Besides that, Mr. Aizawa didn't bother with details. He's resting in the teacher's lounge. 13 answered in a hushed tone. Good, Principal Nezu should be able to easily find him then. He deserves the long-winded lecture he has coming. Mr. Aizawa smiled a bit before. If there was one thing no one from UA wanted to deal with was sitting through a 2-hour lecture from the mouse. Mr. Aizawa heard from Present Mike in midnight that his lecture was boring enough they wanted to sleep but just interesting enough that they could. Mr. Aizawa was pulled from his thoughts as a cold shiver went down his spine and he began to look around for it. Mr. Aizawa's eyes darted over to his student, and he noticed Gaizan was stealthily looking around too. Had Gaizan noticed the feeling too? But he was only 15, how were his senses that attuned? Question for later as Mr. Aizawa found the source of the cold feeling. A purple swirling cloud formed in the middle of the main courtyard between the different environments. Class 1 finally noticed and a few of them took a step forward to get a better look, while Gaizan took a step back. Gaizan couldn't believe it. He couldn't have possibly found him. Gaizan had erased everything and did well to hide his track as he had done it before. Then again he owed the man a large debt and the man was patient and not the forgiving type. Gaizan looked over at his classmates. Why couldn't the man have just picked him off the street? Gaizan could easily lose him in the streets. But in the middle of a new building surrounded by people who had gotten to know Gaizan Hisahito, his disappearing act won't work too well. Wow, is the beginning of training. UA is so manly, they go all out for everything, Kirishima said as he and Mina looked down the stairs. This isn't by UA hands, Mr. Aizawa said. Principal Nezu had been right. The break-in had been caused by a villain. And it was more than just a one-time thing. Had it been a warning, a calling card? Yet why attack the USJ? To make a statement when the timing couldn't have been guessed? Mr. Aizawa realized what the true purpose of the break-in was. It had been a distraction to steal a class schedule, allowing the villains to plan around the best place and deal to sneak in and attack whoever was behind the operation. This was not their first time. Suddenly Gaizan stepped forward, with an aura that he knew what he had to do, and Mr. Aizawa saw the look in his eyes. He was acting because he had better judgment. Yet how could he know how serious the situation was? Yet Gaizan knew how serious the situation was, probably better than anyone else in the building. If that man had decided to come after Gaizan, then Gaizan had to keep his focus on him and stay one step ahead of him. Gaizan grabbed Kirishima's neck and Mina's collar and pulled them back. "Whoa, Hisahito, what are you doing? Those are just actors." Gaizan sighed. Of course, none of them would truly understand what was happening. Even if they were just actors, we would need to treat them like villains. Gaizan then let go of Mina and Kirishima and grabbed Shiro and Kaminari's shirt. If they're villains, then where is the alarm? Shiro asked as he looked up at Gaizan, who had a cold look in his eyes. Before Mr. Aizawa could explain the importance of a sneak attack not being interrupted by an alarm, Todoroki beat him to it. They must have picked this location and time because they knew a class would be here, Todoroki said. It was a smart play if they were looking to cause some damage. The only pro heroes were Eraserhead and 13. The villains wouldn't want to be interrupted by more teachers showing more. Real villains would have a way to deal with the alarm. Technology or quirk base, honestly it doesn't matter. They would want to make sure their arrival wasn't interrupted. If the alarm was tripped, then their whole plan would be over before it began. We're only 10 minutes from the main campus, and some of the UA hero teachers can move faster than a bus. If an alarm was tripped, this would all be over before they would do any damage, Gaizan said, now showing no fear as he exhaled a deep breath. Mr. Aizawa looked at Gaizan as if he wouldn't have been able to explain it any better. Gaizan was a smart student. The way he had acted during the first week of class told that much. He had a strong quirk and knew how to use it, but he was also quick to assess different situations and break them down. However, Gaizan wasn't speaking as if he read that somewhere in a textbook. No, he was speaking as if that was how he would plan something like this, as if he had first-hand experience. As if this was how he was planning an attack on the USJ. Mr. Aizawa shook that thought and refocused on the purple cloud. It quickly expanded and people began to walk out. None of them looked all too intimidating, just some low-level street thugs. Yet in the middle of the USJ were over 200 of these thugs, which could cause some issues. None of the WANA students had training against other people. Some know how to effectively use their quirks. But against test dummies and actual people was a big learning curve. Eventually, the purple cloud expanded even more and a large entity walked out. The first one was a large figure, muscles bulging all over its dark purple body. It had a large open beak mouth, with its brain exposed. It gave off a demonic and twisted aura that almost made Mr. Aizawa want to throw up. Mr. Aizawa always noticed despite not seeing them. Gaizan took a small step back. Before Mr. Aizawa could think about his student's action, a second large entity walked through the purple cloud. It was different from the beaked monster. The second creature looked like a giant metal suit of armor. It had a clear sign of an exoskeleton, making it clear it could easily move. The question was how fast. It stood nearly as tall as the other figure. It had glowing white eyes, and it scanned the group of students as if it were looking for something. Finally, a person covered in gray hands walked out of the cloud. As soon as the man stepped out, Gaizan took a small step back. He had seen the man before and seen what he was capable of, but Gaizan knew he needed to hold his ground. Once the man was clear, the purple cloud shrunk and morphed into the shape of a man wearing a standard butler attire. "Everyone has passed through, sir. We're ready to begin," the purple cloud said in a monotone voice that benefited its attire. "Good." The man covered in his hands spoke in a dry tone as he looked up at the group atop the stairs. "I don't see All Might. Master said he would have been put over these students after the break-in. My scanners aren't picking him up. Only 13 and Eraserhead," the giant metal man said, his voice booming over the crowd, making him sound like a villainous All Might, though the monster beside him seems to hold the power. The man began to scratch viciously at his throat. "This whole job was to kill the symbol of peace, and he isn't even here. We were supposed to be able to beat the game after the tutorial, but the final boss isn't even here. I didn't join your little band of thugs just to waste my time," the giant robot said, looking down at the man covered in hands. "You promised everything was going to go according to the plan. Your master said Nezu would add All Might to the roster, out of fear because of the break-in. Yet I don't see him anywhere. I'm putting a lot on the line for this. We aren't wasting our time. If we can't kill the symbol of peace, then we'll just stop the next generations of heroes." The man yelled, "Attack." All the thugs began to rush forward. "Kirigiri, time for you to do your job." "Yes, sir." The purple cloud of a man collapsed on himself, disappearing. "Class, you need to get out of here. This is no place for children," Mr. Aizawa said, pulling his goggles over his eyes. "You're only first years. This is not your fight. You against over 200 thugs, Gaizan said, out of everyone in Class 1A. He needed to prove himself the most. He wanted to prove he could be a hero despite what his father wanted. Mr. Aizawa, your quirk is best suited for sneak attacks, not prolonged battles. Rule number 1 about being a hero, you can't just have one trick. Mr. Aizawa took out and leapt down the flight of stairs. As he rushed towards the villain below, he began picking out his targets in the order in which it was most efficient to take them out. Gunners, aim and fire, one of the thugs said, raising their hand which had barrels of guns for fingers. He tried to activate his quirks, but nothing happened. My quirk. It's gone. What happened? Mr. Aizawa came crashing down on the thug, his knee pressing into the thug's head. The thug was instantly knocked out and Mr. Aizawa fell to the ground, but quickly hopped back on and landed on his face. He looked around, gauging which thugs were going to take the most time. Idiots that Eraser had. His quirk allows him to block quirks. The metal giant informed the group of thugs. Not that it could do them much good. Heroes were trained to fight with a disadvantage, as a smart villain would know a hero's quirk before fighting them. Interesting, but I bet your quirk doesn't work on a heteromorphic like me. A man whose skin was gray and black rock charged forwards. He had his fist drawn back and ready to attack the hero. You're right. Mr. Aizawa gripped his scarf and threw it out. One from the heteromorphic would easily do damage, and with all the other villains Sarutoing him, Mr. Aizawa didn't want to get jumped and kept down. As the scarf reached the villain, it wrapped itself around the heteromorphic's torso. Mr. Aizawa spun around, using the thug as a wrecking ball, before pulling him in close and ramming his elbow in the thug's nose, knocking him out. That's why I only allow people like you close when I want. All right, who's next? Mr. Aizawa looked over at the crowd of thugs in front of him. He was going to take a hard nap after this, not just for having to deal with all this, but to step up and cover All Might. If he wasn't exhausted from Principal Nezu's lecture, even if the number 1 hero was tired from the lecture, Mr. Aizawa would give him an earful and a lecture about how as a teacher his first responsibility was to his student, not to the media or his public image, but to his students, to teach them and to protect them.